This video is the third and final part of a story-focused retrospective on the Resident Evil franchise, where I will not only explain the story of these games so you know exactly what happened in them, but I'll also be analyzing and reviewing their stories along the way. If you haven't seen part 1 or part 2, I highly recommend you check it out. Today's video will focus on the latest era of the franchise, including the likes of Resident Evil 7, 8, and 9, as well as remakes 2, 3, and 4. Without wasting any time, let's get started. When we last left off, Resident Evil was going through a bit of an identity crisis. Coming off the feeling of stagnation present in Part 1, Resident Evil tried to expand its ability, reshaping what they used to be. That led to Resident Evil 4, and what followed was boundless prosperity as it raked in more sales and players than ever before. But over time, it started misremembering what it used to be. So much had changed since those early days. With the franchise focusing more on action, it was slowly but surely stripping away any sense of identity that it once held dear. A change was needed, as fans and critics alike were unhappy with the new direction. They reimagined its life back when it was just Resident Evil, with no numbers attached to that name, to see if they could bring back those glory days. And in doing so, Capcom brought the franchise back on track with its next title, Resident Evil 7. Resident Evil 7 is one of the most beloved games in the franchise, partially because of how it helped resuscitate the franchise, but also because it's just a genuinely great game in its own right. The franchise wanted to return to that terror and horror that once made the franchise great. Before the game was even released, they made a CG short film built on their initial concept, to give the team an idea as to what the final vision was supposed to look like. It shows a quick clip of a body hanging near a stairwell as well as a mysterious woman in the distance. Very PT inspired, I assume. But Capcom was going to need something tangible if they were going to make Resident Evil 7 terrifying and also convince fans that they were serious. So released for the game was a demo called The Beginning Hour. Resident Evil's done demos for a while, but look at the pitch. You play as Clancy, cameraman to a show called Sewer Gators. The host, Pete, explores abandoned sites to learn about their origins and play it up for TV. It's very much like Ghost Adventures. But a film crew? Abandoned manor? A villain who locks them in the estate and now they're forced to escape? Is this not the same plot as Sweet Home, the very same game that inspired Resident Evil over 20 years ago? They even made a callback to the original game by calling it Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. This opening alone has more terrifying elements in it than some of the games we featured in Part 2. The rest of the demo also provides enough of a gritty atmosphere to really sell the scene, but it's really the characters that bring it home. There is so much personality in them in just these few minutes that you can get a lock on how they feel. Pete is a prick. He immediately thinks Clancy's not up to snuff. He's the kind of guy that thinks he's the best and everyone else sucks at their job. He's saying all this because he's lashing out, as his life used to be better before all this. Andre, on the other hand, is simply doing his best to appease him so they could get this over with. It's not long after they start exploring, though, that Andre disappears, leaving Pete to wonder where the hell he went. He doesn't say it, but I think he started to believe the rumors of this place, and that feeling of terror is getting to him, because he tells Clancy that he's actually a pretty good cameraman, despite his insult earlier. As they search, it's then when they find Andre, who was killed by the family who still lives here, while Pete and Clancy were taken captive. And much of this is just a flashback played via VHS. Clancy broke out of his confines and tried to escape, but was taken back to the house again. He's in for quite the long night here at the Baker estate, as this will be the last time we see him. Resident Evil 7's demo is incredible. It served its purpose as both a short little narrative, but most importantly, it showed consumers that Resident Evil was not playing around anymore. The actual game itself continues this trend. Taking place in 2017, it stars new protagonist Ethan Winters. He got a message from his wife recently, a wife he once thought dead. She's in Dulve, Louisiana, and she wants him to come get her. After 3 years, Ethan finally has a chance to see his wife again, so he sets out in search of her. As he arrives at the Baker estate, he sees some pretty unsightly things, enough to make you question if he should continue to pursue this. He sees numerous dead animals and effigies. He walks inside the very same house that Clancy once journeyed through, showing us that Ethan was not the first to stumble in here, and he likely won't be the last. Mia is found later in a cell, but she claims that she never sent a message to him, leaving you to wonder who sent the message and if this was all a trap. But in having seen his wife, Ethan is more focused on getting out of here rather than mull over these strange inconsistencies. Realizing what this could mean though, his wife rushes to an exit, but Mia starts to get dizzy. She's overcome by something, causing her to attack Ethan. He's also forced to kill his own wife with an axe because of this. Not the reunion he expected, and also not really out of character either, since Ethan has already grieved and moved on. Even though he loved Mia, coming back after all these years just to kill him, it makes sense why he would fight back without hesitation. But her death was anything but, as she gets revenge on him by cutting his hand off with a chainsaw. The two face off once more before the man of the house comes by to knock Ethan out. Next we see him, his hand is stapled back together. As absurd as that sounds, there is a lore reason for this that will make sense later. It is then when he is given the proper family greeting. These are the Bakers, the owners of this house, and the ones Ethan will have to face off against if he has any hope of getting out of here alive. So already we're seeing quite a few changes in the storytelling department. We've once again returned to a smaller scale conflict. Prior games have focused on large outbreaks or had villains that with enough time would destroy the world. This seems contained, for the most part. The biggest change though is Ethan himself. Prior games have always given us new characters, but they were mainly side characters. Rare is it that we play a Resident Evil game these days and not play as one of the old guard. But this was a necessary step in creating that kind of atmosphere they were going for. Ethan is a blank slate kind of character, one-dimensional, little personality, and an everyday kind of guy. This has caused many to view Ethan unfavorably, but I think this is in large part due to being conditioned by the 20 years worth of history we have with the heroes we've been playing as. But Ethan was needed if Resident Evil was going to bring back what it lost so many years ago. He's not skilled in combat or even knowledgeable on BOWs. He's experiencing all of this for the first time. As such, the team could create an easily approachable horror game. Chris, Leon, they're too powerful to be in a horror game anymore. We need not look very far too. Resident Evil 6 had them dealing with countless BOWs and creatures beyond your wildest dreams, and they didn't even blink. Now that isn't to say that they didn't think of it. Concept art for Resident Evil 8 shows that Ada was at least considered for that game's cast. The only one who made it through was Chris, who's only playable for about an hour, if that, per game. Oddly enough, these sections perfectly illustrate the problem. Chris fights so many BOWs in his playable sections. It even lets him punch staggered foes with such a force it would make a boulder cry. That's why Chris only appears at the end of the game after it's all been wrapped up, because if you put him or Leon or really anyone from the old days in this game, it's over in 5 minutes flat. While mechanically you can absolutely create that tension through ammo management and inventory scarcity, such as what was done in Resident Evil 7's DLC, narratively there is an imbalance. It does not make sense for Chris to not be armed to the teeth here and rinsing through BOWs with plenty of time to still get breakfast on the way back. Having someone like Ethan is key to illustrating horror because Capcom more than anything wants you to be in the driver's seat. But of course that doesn't excuse his personality or lack thereof. Ethan expresses disinterest in much of what's going on, and that's about the extent we're given. All of this though is in an attempt by the game to make you become Ethan, to be a part of the Baker's home vicariously through the man with the stapled up hand. Now I've long since said that if you're going to make a self-insert character, go all the way. Last time we discussed this was Artyom of the Metro games, who has his own history, love life, and views on the world, yet stayed silent for that very reason. I love Artyom and I love Metro, but it felt odd to do this given how much he let his own thoughts out within the pages of his journal. Ethan is much the same. He's got his own personal goal, his own life, and the game only allows you to make one choice halfway through that isn't really even canon. There's no way to bend the game to your liking like you can in an RPG. So it's really strange that Capcom has continued to push Ethan as this self-insert character. That's also why they've refused to show Ethan's face in these games, as it would remove the tether between you two and thus no longer feel like you're playing as yourself. Not even in Resident Evil 8 do we get to see him, and that one's actually absurd because it's not even believable. They deliberately pan the camera away from him all the time. Here, this is the man behind the hand. I can respect the decision to design Ethan this way, but it comes off as incredibly odd, and makes me wonder if they had just leaned into this more, would we have gotten more out of him? Still, none of this has ever made me hate Ethan or anything. I still consider him one of the best protagonists in the franchise despite all of that. I just think people have certain expectations when it comes to Resident Evil, and thus many people were put off when this change was made. To me though, this was right up my alley. I mentioned this quite a bit in this multi-part series that I am a big fan of Silent Hill. Something that drew me to the series was that every character was a sort of everyday person, someone who's never experienced the horrors of the world and is forced to survive against the odds. This allows for new characters to be introduced and thus new stories, such as the case with Resident Evil 7. Ethan's plan to save his wife and the Baker's own motivation behind the scenes are very different compared to the money and power days of the past. That's why I do really have to respect the restraint to not go all in on this game and its cast. While I would like to see what everyone was doing post Resident Evil 6, I think Capcom has really focused on just getting their foot in first. You can't climb the mountain without having a good foundation. That's why RE7 is so divorced from the rest of the franchise, with Resident Evil 8 only having a small connection back to the franchise's origins at the end. So it can at least connect this new duology to the rest of the series while still retaining its identity and not falling into the same traps that the other games used to. But more than just Ethan, the environments, antagonists, setting, and plot, it's all been changed and overhauled for the better. As I said earlier, the team scaled down the conflict to just one house in the middle of the Louisiana bayou. This makes the stakes more personal, coupled with the personal quest of rescuing Ethan's wife. This also lets the environment, for the first time in a long time, take center stage. You can learn a lot about a person for just looking at their home, the way it's arranged, the cleanliness, or the lack thereof. The Baker's household is actually quite huge. It's got this farm section on the side, an older house that's no longer in use in the back, and a comfy trailer set right in the middle. It's got a strangely homey vibe to the whole thing, even though now it's just a large escape room being patrolled by murderers. Interestingly, you could actually see the progression of the family in real time from just the home itself. The main house has got everything you could think of: bedrooms, laundry, all that stuff. It's not really anything out of the ordinary, but there's also grubs and decay all over the place, even in the food they eat. There's also mold that further seeps into the house as you progress through the game. Mold is thicker than blood, as they say, and the family's always delighted to see new folks join them at the dinner table. Although not in a loving, caring way, more so in a twisted Resident Evil way. Notes around the game tell us that 20 people have gone missing in the area over the past 2 years. Alyssa Ashcroft was actually the writer on this piece, although she makes no appearance in-game. So we're not exactly sure how personal of a story this is to her, or if this is just her reporting the news. Regardless, down where Mia was is driver's licenses and posters of all the people they've taken, as well as detailed records of who they are and what their status is. It's assumed that they're getting rid of evidence, as Mia's bag was being burned outside. Other notes are messages passed from the family between themselves about the people they've taken. Once inside the house, though, it's not long before they turn. These creatures known as molded are the regular enemy type of RE7, former humans who've now been inflicted with the mold parasite. Many of them are found in the basement next to many a torture device and hacksaw. The Bakers are looking to expand their family, and they're not exactly picky about who, given they all turn into black moldy creatures in the end. These moldy monsters can be seen in just about every part of the estate, but even the estate itself tells its own story. In the back of the map is the old house. It's got some of the stuff the main house has: kids' room, bedroom, etc. Given its name, it's very likely their original house before they built one, but it shows almost a physical timeline through the environment. The old house is more rickety, with floorboards creaking beneath you at every step. It's even got a crank that's used to extend a small bridge to other parts of the house. It's unclear if this was always a part of the design or a necessary repair due to decay, but the new house doesn't have this. Next door is also a barn where they tended and raised animals, the carcasses of which can be found in the basement or outside. I have to be honest, one of my favorite parts of covering games like this is getting a chance to walk around the environment and take in the scenery. I love just looking through each room and scanning each wall, not for items or ammo, but for a story. A story merely told through the atmosphere and environment. You can learn so much about a game's world by just taking a careful look around. The trailer out in the backyard is assumed to be Zoe's based on her clothes being present within the closet. Little things like this get you to wonder why. Did Zoe not fit in with the rest of the family? Did she just need a place to call her own? We can see that she's spruced up the place with her own personal tastes. There's artwork, lights, and tons of paperwork, but there's also plenty of books, suggesting she's an avid reader, and the ashtrays both in and outside imply that she also smokes too. In fact, Zoe in one of the DLCs already has a lighter in her inventory, one that is her personal favorite, further reinforcing the connection. As games have gotten more advanced, it's allowed developers to add all kinds of trash or miscellaneous objects to a scene. It's tedious, often unacknowledged work, but it's all to dress the set. Nowhere does it acknowledge that Zoe is a smoker, nor does it matter, but by placing the lighter in her inventory, the ashtray near the trailer, and her clothes in that trailer, you start to connect the dots. It's a story within a story, purely told through the environment. Resident Evil's always done environmental storytelling, but each tells a different tale. To the destruction of Raccoon City, to the police station and its officers' many tastes, to the Oswald Spencer mansion. But this time it's about a singular family, and the environment portrays how they lived and what their living situation is like now. It's simple stuff, but there is something beautiful in seeing how it all comes together. The Bakers had a farm and animals. This not only explains where they got some of their food, but this also means that the devs needed to add those animals and find a purpose for them in the map. Same goes for Zoe and her smoking habits. Everything has a purpose in this house, and in realizing that, the team was able to mix these different realities, the pre- and post-infection days, into one terrifyingly complex home. But not everything can be conveyed through objects or environments. Sometimes you just have to be direct about it. Resident Evil 7's story really does come through in the notes. Evidence shows that something had overtaken the family. In a letter written to Marguerite, who was checked into a hospital recently, it states that her x-rays showed fungal growths on her brain. The doctors assume that this was a result of a fungal parasite that had snuck its way into her body. The two parents also journal frequently, and these entries are implied to have been written pre-infection. The Bakers are unfortunately victims of a much greater conspiracy, infected by a type of mold that has utterly consumed them and their house. As they're forced to play the role of a family again, but under much different circumstances. This will make sense a lot later, but the family is being forced into this by a little girl named Evelyn. Evelyn's the major antagonist of the game, and it's her desire for a family that's turned the Bakers into who they are now. As for the family themselves, Jack is the first major boss within the game. He's the stalker-type enemy that can't be killed and is merely slowed down by your intervention. What's interesting about Jack is that this is more than just a gimmick. On the surface, Jack is no different than, say, the Nemesis or the Ustanak. The difference is that he actually acknowledges this. In your very first proper encounter with him, Jack attacks you in the garage. You have to drive his car over and over into him to put him down. If you do, he'll hop into the driver's seat and drive straight into a steel beam with the intent of taking you both out. Jack absolutely crushes his own skull, but not even a minute later he gets out of the car and grabs Ethan's gun to finish himself off again. Later you'll even get into a chainsaw duel with him, and yet despite the injuries he suffered before this and the ones he'll have soon, he still survives. Jack's turned very nihilistic, a stark contrast to the kind of personality he's had prior to this. He's become someone who simply does not care about what will happen anymore. With the context of Evelyn in mind, it's likely that Jack has now assumed the role as the father or the man of the house. As such, he is the protector and leader of the family. That's why he's always looking out for wrongdoers and killing anyone who gets near the property. It could also explain why he can't die easily, as without him, the family would be at risk. This is all to protect the sanctity of the house and the family. However, his nihilism may stem from Evelyn's own imprint. She is the controller of all this mold, as such she is the grand architect. She doesn't exactly have them completely under her spell in the sense that every action they take is from her directly, but her influence almost compels them to listen to her demand. Part of me wonders if this nihilism is a result of Evelyn's own feelings more than it is Jack's. A way for her to lash out at the world for what it's done to her. Marguerite's role in the family is similar in that regard to her husband as she reestablishes herself as the mother. Like with Jack, these feelings are amplified and even her design has been changed to reflect this. Marguerite makes food for anyone who comes into the house, seeing them as her children in a sense, although she becomes incredibly pissed if they don't like it. Her stomach has been enlarged to that of a pregnant belly. Her domain is the old house and it's covered in bugs, which she calls her pretties. As you can see, Resident Evil 7 is all about taking what is familiar and twisting it. Marguerite is a mother, but they twist that meaning to squeeze as much horror as they can out of that word, thus why she takes care of bugs instead of children. Lucas is probably the most interesting member of the family, because he's revealed to not actually be infected, merely pretending to be. He's got a lot of backstory revealed in the notes in the environment. According to Pete in the demo, Lucas was a bad seed. Lucas, since he was a kid, has had some mental issues. It's not clear what, but he was bullied for it by some of the kids. A classmate of his, Oliver, called him a crazy head. This was enough for Lucas to invite him over to his home for his birthday party, only to lock him in the attic until he died. Lucas's room is rather childish in a sense, with toys and such despite being at least over 20. The family claims this is his old room, but I cannot find a new room in this house at all, and it seems like he has a great attachment to the room anyway, as seen in a DLC. Part of his troubling attitude may have also come from the family. There is sports equipment everywhere in his room, but a helmet in the house claims that it's Jack's hobby, and forgive me, Lucas doesn't look like much of a football player. Also, side note, I thought this was funny. You know this is made by a non-American team of devs because they felt the need to clarify that it's American football, even though this game is in Louisiana. Case in point, I wonder if sports was something he was pressured into pursuing. No matter the case, sports seemed unlikely for the boy, as trophies around the room showed that he preferred the pursuit of engineering. Like the other members of the family, Lucas's area of the map reflects this. This place is a maze of traps and hazards. Explosives are strung up on thin wire that is incredibly hard to see unless you're close. Crates that always contain ammo and supplies are now booby-trapped with bombs as well. I refuse to comment on the amount of times I shot a box incorrectly, only to knife the trapped one. Lucas further uses his skills in engineering to create an escape room for Ethan. Like any escape room, there is limited space, but lots of interactable objects. The issue is that if you don't pay attention, you pay with your life. The goal is to get the candle on the birthday cake, but in doing so, you end up removing a winding key from a barrel containing oil. When the cake explodes, it catches the oil and burns you alive. You'll need to figure out the puzzle without using it, but that's easier said than done. The game gives you a lifeline, though, by handing you a VHS tape of Clancy's time through the puzzle. His unfortunate death gives the player and Ethan a safe way to survey the puzzle before going in yourself. Foiling Lucas's plans, though, causes him to run off and disappear for the remainder of the game. The only thing left is Jack. Despite the many wounds he's received, he's still alive and as moldy as ever, but this fight does mark the end of Jack Baker, at least for Ethan. The Baker family are some of the best villains within this series. By shrinking the vision down to a single home, it allowed the story to be more personal. Everything we've discussed so far has contributed to that vision. To the mold infection, the notes around the home, the family themselves, and other personal effects. It's all a part of the Baker family story. This is a great example of what can be done with storytelling in a video game. A problem I discussed in part 2 is that some of the games relied heavily on notes to even tell the basics of their stories. Many of these games couldn't also use the environments to tell a story in such a way as this because many of the places were just cities or labs. It was usually, at most, a place that experiments took place in or where an outbreak occurred. The Baker estate has history seen in every single inch of the house. The environment and the house are just as important to the storytelling of the game as the game's own script, and as I've already illustrated, you can uncover a story within a story just by looking at its walls. As a result, you feel a deeper connection to the Baker house because you've seen who they are in all their aspects. Pre-infection, post-infection, the family history is all here, so it's hard not to come out feeling something for them. More often that feeling is hatred. They are the antagonists after all. But then there is a deep feeling of sorrow that comes not long after. Late in the game, Ethan talks to Jack through some sort of telepathic communication thanks to the mold. He goes on to explain that none of them are killers. They aren't themselves, and they're doing things that they would never have dreamed of. It makes you feel sympathetic for them, that like Ethan, they're just victims in all this too, being forced to fight each other for someone's amusement. Ethan even has the strength to almost forgive them. Rather than berate Jack for what he did, he converses with him like normal, recognizing that they aren't that different. Jack telling Ethan to free his family from all this creates such a whiplash of emotions. This whole game you've been fighting tooth and nail against them, but now you've gone from their adversary to their savior. You feel different after this conversation. Seeing Jack lower himself like this with his soft-spoken tone, it makes you want to help the Bakers, now that you've seen them for who they really are. But in a way, you've already made good on that promise. You've been doing so since the start. The odd one out of this group is Zoe. She is the daughter of this family, but her mind has not been overtaken by the mold quite yet. She's got just enough humanity still left in her to ask Ethan for his help. Ethan and Zoe have been working together this whole game to make a cure for the mold so they can get out of here. During this, you also run into Mia, who is frequently taken away as quickly as she came. Problems arise during the final fight with Jack as you need to use the serum on him to put him down. So now Ethan's only got one left, and 2 women who need it. The game gives you a choice here, and it's always been kind of a strange choice. There is no world in which Ethan actually chooses Zoe. He came here for his wife, and he's leaving with her. So while the choice was obvious, I think the point was to give the player a knowledge check to see if they remember what the goal was. Because if you don't choose correctly, it ends with Zoe and Mia dying, leaving Ethan as the only survivor. However, in making that choice, we do come to Resident Evil 7's most infamous section. Many players groan over the mere thought of playing through this section again. From here on, what was an excellent and well-crafted horror game turns into an action-filled shooting gallery. There is much more ammo and many more enemies than ever before. Conservation of supplies is still applied here, but not by much. You'll rarely run out of ammo past this point. To many, this is a problem because it feels like the game is jumping out of its lane and going back to those old action days. For me personally, I've never really cared about this. Now, not that the take is wrong, it's definitely got more shooting, but I think it's because of how well put together the rest of the game has been so far, I can't really bring myself to hate this section. To me, it does little to blemish what has been so far an amazing horror game. I think it also helps that this section is where our questions turn into answers. All game long, there's been talk of a girl named Evelyn, a young girl who's the other mysterious member of the family, one who's been largely absent from Ethan's view. Evelyn is a BOW created by a group called the Connections, a group that Ethan's own wife is a part of without his knowledge. The Connections started making moves around the year 2000. The group was interested in making bioweapons effective at neutralizing combatants. They worked with the HCF, the company Wesker was a part of back during the Code Veronica days. They switched projects over time though and started looking into how they could turn enemies into allies. This would cut major costs of handling prisoners of war, and even war itself, as you could just drop one of these puppies in a base and now you got a small army on your side with little to no effort. The project came about after discovering something called the mutamycete, a fungus hidden deep below the earth. The Connections then took some of this mutamycete and implanted it in a human embryo. It's unclear how this mutamycete mold would change the host, but the Connections were consistently making these candidate specimens they had as small girls. The idea was that so they could operate as BOWs and be unsuspecting to a general populace. Evelyn was the very first perfected E-Series BOW. Researchers note that Evelyn's mold imposes a profound sense of control over the body. This seems to suggest that the mold does not instinctually do this, but rather Evelyn's control over it is what gives the mold these possessive properties. The start of this process begins as hallucinations. Test subjects have reported seeing and hearing Evelyn despite her not being present. She starts out simply asking for companionship, but as time progresses, her demands get more and more extreme. We can see this more clearly in a later DLC where Jack is seen carving wounds into himself. These extreme demands cause a major shock to the psyche of the individual, which in turn makes it harder for them to resist Evelyn's demands. The mold allows those afflicted to also exhibit certain healing properties. They can lose their limbs but then magically grow them back. It's once it reaches the brain that the mind control starts. That's why Lucas can grow his hand back despite not being controlled by Evelyn. But that still leaves Evelyn herself as the only mystery. The concept of family is unique to her, and the researchers are equally dumbfounded as to where this came from. One has a theory that it's because she could play her role as a little girl easier so that she could affect people when they let their guard down. But, and I think this is the real answer, it's likely because she received a lack of love here in the labs and thus is searching for that. Evelyn was an embryo, born and raised to be a bioweapon. Right from birth, her life was decided, and so I think anyone in that state would lash out and want something better than these white walls, single bed, and a blinding light. To keep Evelyn in check though, people were assigned different roles, with Mia being her caretaker. Mia was seen as her mother for much of her life, which explains why Mia and Evelyn are inseparable, and why despite being captive for over 3 years, Mia has never turned into a molded, because Evelyn did not want to harm her mom. It seems though the connections were trying to hide Evelyn, as Mia and another staff member, Alan, were taking her aboard a cargo ship. The crew is unaware of the group and who Evelyn is, so they're all innocents in this. But due to the harsh weather and Evelyn herself, she lashed out and killed the entire crew. The ship would also wash ashore in Louisiana, not far away from the Baker estate. Talks of flooding had the Bakers worried, especially as they had found Evelyn and Mia in their swamps. It was then that her desire for a family grew as she took control of the Bakers, and soon forced them to take others, like Clancy. All of this was done because all the girl ever wanted was a family. Now this story is part of a larger whole, one that's expanded upon in Resident Evil 8, but just from what we've seen, it's clear that tragedy in family is a major part of the writing here. Evelyn's story is not that different from Lisa Trevor in a way, just two girls who were experimented on against their will, continually wishing for a better life or to end it all. That's what makes this dinner scene so iconic. It's an introduction to the villains, yes, but it's also a glimpse into her desired world. Evelyn is soon revealed to be the old woman in the wheelchair. Her body had aged rapidly since her time here, although she is still able to project herself as a young girl to those that she targets. There is nothing more warm and comforting than sitting down at the family table and eating some dinner. Sure, it's rotten and Lucas got his hand cut off, but to her this feels like home. For a girl who sees violence and death as the answer, this is right where she wants to be. Frankly, you can't help but place the blame squarely on the connections. Evelyn or the Bakers, despite what they've done, are no more victims in this game than Ethan. Especially since his wife is a part of them, and yet she's never given him a straight answer. Ethan continually asks Mia what's going on, but she refuses to answer. Part of this is due to amnesia, but I also believe that part of it is because she doesn't want to reveal the truth and fear what comes after. But as much as it may pain you to do it, Evelyn has killed many people and plans to add Ethan to her list next. So he takes a neurotoxin serum and stabs it into her, as she mutates into her final form. Ethan is flung out of the house only for a chopper to come by with a loaded firearm. Evidence suggests that these guys were monitoring the situation here as a radio and other equipment was found near the mines, along with some kind of plans being produced. So it seems though Evelyn's kidnapping eventually caught up to her. But it would be Ethan who takes her down, as by using these special rounds in the pistol, he's able to halt Evelyn's advances for good. The soldier boy is then rappelled down here with one kneeling, calling himself Redfield. Yeah, we'll talk about that. But for now, this is where our tale ends as Ethan and Mia go home. But when Ethan is in the chopper, he says that while he gets to go off to safety, these guys, Chris and the boys, are here to clean up the mess. But look whose name is on the chopper. The story continues into RE7's post-launch DLC. Resident Evil 7 was a smash hit, and so Capcom was not content on letting this one go. It's got a ton of extra content to play through, most of it reminiscent of the old arcade modes, but there is some narrative-focused content here too. A batch of DLC called Banned Footage is basically the devs trying to drag Clancy through the mud again. Nightmares, 21, and Bedroom all star Clancy as he tries to escape Jack, Marguerite, and Lucas. He is first locked in a basement against a horde of infected and has to use the tools he has down here to survive. Clancy will have to survive until dawn, or 5 AM, with it getting harder as each hour passes. 21 requires him to play a few rounds of blackjack against another victim of the Bakers named Hoffman. But in Resident Evil fashion, you're not betting money, you're betting your life. At first it's fingers. Loser loses the pinky. But then it ups the ante to 2, then 3, and so on, until someone's fingers are all going off. After that, it's shocks that increase in voltage until you die. The cool thing about 21 is there's actually a significant amount of skill that goes into this. There is only one deck, numbered 1 through 11, and you share the same deck with Hoffman. So if he has an 11, you can never get one. You also each start with a blue card face down. You cannot see your opponents, leaving it up to chance what that card could be. In a more simple example, Hoffman drew a 10 and 11. That's a blackjack. But he has a third card, so no matter what it is, even if it's a 1, he's bust. So I don't even bother hitting. I won right away. Due to this, it creates the same feeling you get when you play the real blackjack. Now, I would not be caught dead giving my money to a real casino. But in a video game, I'll bet the house and more. I got really into this, like pacing around the room doing math in my head to see what my odds were into this. To throw in some curveballs, the game has some trump cards, modifiers that could turn a game around in your favor. Hoffman had an 18 plus whatever card he had. I had a 2, 4, and a 9, giving me 15. He could have a 3 and be exactly a 21, but what are the odds of that? I didn't want to take that risk, so I hit. I got a 1, giving me 16. Great. I hit again and got a 6. Not great. But I have a trump card that removes the last card I picked up, so I got a retry. And what do you know? 21. Oddly enough, I was right. Hoffman did have 21, so we tied. That means we both got shocked, but because his meter hit the end, I won. The whole point of this game is to keep going until one of you dies. Although Lucas cheats and forces Clancy to play again despite killing Hoffman. In what is such a very cool ending for this game, Lucas rigs the final round. He draws 21 immediately, ups the odds to 100, meaning any loss would kill me, and also forbids me from drawing any cards. However, when trump cards were introduced into the playing field, you got one that let your opponent draw the best card from the deck. Lucas already has 21, so his perfect card would put him over. This turns the game in your favor, giving you the win. It's a really cool ending, and the game pays no attention to the card itself. It's given to you at the very beginning as if it is a normal draw. You have to keep it throughout the entire game and not use it just to save it for this moment. Clancy then finds himself in Marguerite's room. As she is the mother of the house, she wants all her kids to have full bellies before bed. Clancy won't be eating that and will try to escape instead. The bedroom is basically another small escape room. There are a lot of hidden objects like a knife behind the dresser or a note under the bed. There are lots of things you can also mess around with, but there's a catch. Sometimes, certain things attract the attention of Marguerite. When done, you have a minute to get back to bed before she catches you. You have to place everything back to where it was. The lamp, the paintings, everything. If she finds any evidence of wrongdoing, she will be pissed. You get one mistake, after that you're dead. No amount of words can explain the horror of checking every single thing in that room, only to sit down and forget one small thing, knowing that you've already sealed your fate and you cannot do anything about it. For those who like puzzles, this will be a very fun little room to escape from. It all ends with Clancy then finding a key and stabbing Marguerite, allowing him to escape. But of course, Clancy's journey is far from over. He still has the happy birthday tape to get through, which is where he will meet his end. Honestly, I actually really like Clancy. I think he's a great character. He doesn't talk much, in fact his personality is the same as Ethan's, but you create a bond through your time together. Making Clancy the protagonist not only deepens your appreciation for him, but also makes his death sadder. Had Clancy died in the first 5 minutes during the demo, it wouldn't have meant much. But knowing that he went through all of this, that he was given no chance of survival and still did, all to die like this, kinda heartbreaking. This is the perfect example of a phenomenon I discussed in previous parts, creating bonds through gameplay. Narratively, very little happens here, but the story of Clancy and these constant games he had to play just to survive create a miniature story in themselves, one that dialogue nor files could ever convey. Dare I say, Clancy has more character in him than some of those featured in Part 2, like Parker or Raymond. Through Clancy, we get to see just how bad being a victim of the Bakers is. You really do start to root for Clancy after a while, which is why it sucks to know that he never made it in the end, becoming nothing more than a corpse with a note on it. The story of Clancy, while short, shows just how much the narrative has changed for Resident Evil. We have a story within the story within the story, following a random character no different than any of the victims we've seen so far. It is still able to elicit the same feelings of sorrow that you would have experienced seeing a main character die. In a previous world, Resident Evil's characters could barely invoke an emotion out of me, and now here I am caring about a side character. Just goes to show how much the team has evolved since those days, and how much care was put into this entry from all aspects. The other DLCs return focus back to the main story, with Daughters, Not a Hero, and End of Zoe wrapping up any loose ends that the game left. Not a Hero starts not long after the main game ended. Lucas is still alive, so Chris is here to deal with him personally. But as we saw earlier, Chris is working with Umbrella. According to the files, Umbrella was reformed as a private military company. While many of its members are ex-Umbrella staff, which isn't exactly a great start, Umbrella is working to atone for their crimes by now fighting against the bioweapons. They kept the Umbrella name though to show just how serious their atonement is. They use it to not hide from the fact that the company did some pretty horrible shit. They are well aware of that fact and now are just looking to help. Chris is not a part of Umbrella, he is still BSAA, but they requested Chris's help with Evelyn. He's not exactly happy with the partnership, given, its umbrella, but it's a partnership nonetheless, and they have bigger things to deal with than bringing up a decades-old beef. Like, more pressingly, who the hell Chris's plastic surgeon is. Capcom had went through some new facial technology for this installment. They noted how previous games are all made by hand and very exaggerated. They wanted to make a more realistic-looking Chris this time around, one who doesn't look like he's 90% muscle. So they scanned a real person's face for the game. Lots of people dislike this new direction for Chris, and I agree. He's extremely out of place even when compared to literally any version of him. This seems to have actually stemmed from Capcom and not the mocap actor, because they used the same one for Village, and he looks much closer to the Chris we remember. Still, it does make for a bit of a shock when he says that he's Redfield at the end. The most common theory seems to be that Capcom was intending on essentially rebooting the franchise, which is why Resident Evil 7 has no connection to the rest of the games. So this Chris was basically meant to be a newer, different looking Chris, but if that was true, it was scrapped by Village, as this is most definitely the same Chris, and RE7 is not a reboot. But no matter his face, his personality still remains. He's still the same Chris from Resident Evil 6, the same one dealing with the pain of his men, pain that will resurface once more. Lucas is a trickster, and he does not make this easy for Chris, as over the course of the game, all of the 3 men that went missing down here in the salt mines are killed, and it's in pretty brutal ways too. Yet again, another squad of his gone, all men who he led. They often say the captain goes down with the ship, but it seems like time and again Chris is the only one on that ship. The rest of the DLC also clarifies some details present in the main game. As we saw earlier, Lucas was not actually infected, and that's thanks to his work with the connections. The DLC reinforces this partnership, down in the Mind's Day classic-looking lab, a lab that even seems to have housed Evelyn for a time. Lucas worked with the connections to analyze Evelyn as she continued to grow more accustomed to her new surroundings at the Baker household. He was promoted to head researcher immediately, much to the anger of many of the staff, who not only felt that their experience far outweighed his own, but that his maniacal personality was causing more disruptions than progress. Over time, though, Lucas started feeling as though the connections could not see the potential he saw in Evelyn. While he was willing to send them info on her status, he was actually working behind the scenes to compile the data and send it to a third party. Who this mysterious benefactor is unclear, but the download was ultimately stopped by Chris. As while going through the mines, he'll come across Lucas. Assuming he died to one of his traps, Chris gets the drop on Lucas, but he would later mutate right before his death. Chris puts him down like all the BOWs he's killed so far and destroys the computer uploading the data on the Mold and E-Series BOWs, preventing this third party from ever getting access to Evelyn. The next DLC, Daughters, turns back the clock and lets us see the Baker household before it all went awry. Returning to our conversation with Jack, it's very weird seeing the Bakers as an actual amicable family. They're all discussing the floods happening recently and the people they find washed ashore. They actually found Mia earlier after the ship ran aground, and they've been taking care of her ever since. The story starts when they find Evelyn. Jack and Marguerite immediately go into parent mode. They set her up in Lucas's old room. Jack carries her to bed, Marguerite makes some soup, while Zoe, who we play as, gets her some fresh clothes. The Bakers always did have a warm, inviting atmosphere to them. The way they both joke about running a bed and breakfast together, they're portrayed as the kind of family that would have taken you in and given you a bite to eat, no matter the time of day. It gives them more humanity, but also makes their eventual infected states all the more sad. They were such a happy family here. Not perfect, but a happy one nonetheless. Evelyn's arrival was the thing that disrupted this happiness. As Zoe gets her fresh clothes, Evelyn wakes up and claims that the family is hers. She starts to infect the whole family after this. Marguerite's thrown up bugs, Jack is carving wounds into himself, and Lucas was knocked out and dragged away by Jack. Zoe has no choice but to escape her own family, who is out to give her the same gift Evelyn gave them. There's actually a bad ending here, which is using the car to drive out of the house. Like most of this game's DLC, there is a game within a game here. There's a whole scavenger hunt here, which involves you doing many different steps before you find yourself in the trailer outside. But this is only a good ending within the DLC's context, as Zoe will find Mia before Evelyn catches up and infects her too. She survived her family's attack, but she still has many more years of hiding to go, and as we know, her one chance left on a boat with his wife. But while mold is thicker than blood, out here in the bayou, that blood is certainly thicker than the swamp. End of Zoe may be one of the most absurd DLCs Resident Evil has ever released. It takes place 2 weeks after the events of Resident Evil 7 and stars Joe Baker, who is just as much of a backwoodsman as his brother Jack. He eats crawfish and worms for dinner, makes spears out of tree bark and scrap metal, and best of all, can throw a mean hook. The entire DLC is centered around Joe Baker as he tries to rescue his niece Zoe, whose infection has progressed substantially since we last saw her. To do so, Joe will have to fistfight the mold as he wades through the swamp waters of Louisiana, waters that are also filled with gators, and of course, a nasty swamp monster, who was revealed to be Jack Baker. I have played this DLC 3 times through over the past few years, and I'm still utterly amazed that this was the pitch. And trust me, it's absurd as it looks. This is definitely an example of Capcom going too far with Resident Evil 7. What was such a good horror game has now become a punching gallery of absurd proportions. However, I've noticed that lots of games do get a little bit weird with the DLC while keeping the base game consistent. It's a nice way to try something new and experiment while also giving the devs less constraints, as they no longer have to abide by that survival horror system present with Ethan. It's also Resident Evil. This franchise has been weird for 20 years. We certainly hit a peak at comboing molded and power-bombing swamp monsters, but I'd hardly say this is out of character. Like its WWE SummerSlam back in 2005, the rest of the DLC revolves around Joe and Jack Baker as they fight for custody over Zoe. Interestingly, you could have inferred that this was Jack from the beginning. Not just because of his obsession with getting Zoe back, but when talking with Jack back as Ethan, the only ones in the room were Zoe and Jack. Marguerite was dead, Lucas was no longer infected, and Zoe was still alive, implying that Jack was also out there alive even after the amount of times Ethan killed him. Outside of the many bouts he'll have with the Molded, his championship match is against Jack back at the Baker house. Joe managed to find himself an upgraded gauntlet, which gives him a super powerful punch he will use to deliver the killing blow. Well, hopefully. Joe goes to save Zoe by giving her a full dose of the serum that Ethan didn't give her back then, but Chris and the boys show up guns cocked. Chris gives Joe the rundown, and after enough time, Zoe is cured. The DLC ends with a call from Ethan, who was the one who got her the help she needed. Payment for all the help that she gave him when he first arrived. I assume he means Chris, but sometimes I like to imagine that he called the family for this one. Nevertheless, with Ethan and Mia saved, Chris and co quarantining the area, all the Baker family dead, and Zoe now cured, we have cleaned up every loose end tying us to the Baker estate, meaning we can now close the book on Resident Evil 7. Resident Evil 7 is still today my favorite game in the series. It's so incredibly well made from start to finish, from gameplay to story to everything in between. If I had to describe the game in one word, it would be refreshing. After having played so many Resident Evil games at this point, it feels great to not only return to that survival horror atmosphere that made me fall in love with the series in the first place, but also play something that doesn't often fall to the same bad tropes that plagued the previous era. A personal story, not a world-ending calamity, one that is not about money and power this time, but about family. All wrapped up in a story with an incredible cast of well-made characters. Characters I felt emotions for, and characters that I desperately want to see more of. Resident Evil 7, like Resident Evil 4, put the franchise back on track. Resident Evil is more relevant than it's ever been, and 7 was the one leading that charge. But if I've learned anything from playing as Joe Baker this long, it's that oftentimes one punch is not enough. Sometimes 2 or 3 is necessary to bring it all home. To continue off the hype that re-established Resident Evil as the premier survival horror experience, Capcom got to work making 2 back-to-back games and released them 1 year after the other. These were the remakes of Resident Evil 2 and 3, released in 2019 and 2020 respectively. Both games are worked on at the same time but by different teams within Capcom. 2 Remake had been considered for quite a while thanks to the success of the first game's remake back in 2002, but it wouldn't be officially greenlit until 2015. The idea to remake the third came shortly after, with the intent of making sure the original Raccoon City trilogy all received remakes. But 2 Remake would release first, so that's the one we'll discuss. The first thing you'll immediately notice is what 20 years of technology can do. 2 Remake starts exactly like the original, with Claire and Leon meeting before arriving in Raccoon City, although this time you actually get to play the introduction segment. Once that's done, you head back into more familiar territory, but not everything is how it was 20 years ago. 2 Remake has taken quite a lot of creative liberties in the first game's remake. That was more about polishing the design and fine-tuning the edges. 2 Remake was made to be a complete modernization from the ground up. That's why we have similar systems from previous games like the over-the-shoulder camera and gunpowder crafting, features not in the original. They also brought back the horror as well and seem to take into account many of the successes and failures learned over the past few years. The police station is now much darker, requiring Leon and Claire to use a flashlight at all times. One of the struggles the team faced was how to make the zombies threatening again. To achieve this, they tweaked lots of things, everything from lighting and smoke effects to how the zombies move. They take more hits than you expect to go down, which creates this tension and anxiety as your resources continue to dwindle. Gore was also a huge part of the remake's many touch-ups. We couldn't really see this in the first game on account of the mold, but now that we're facing beings with actual limbs and organs, you start to see the visual impact of your aggression. Like a murderous Pablo Picasso, each bullet carves a piece out of the zombie, creating a unique art piece of flesh and blood exclusive to each one. The G creature has also been overhauled to be a much more dangerous affair. They only appear in the sewers where they've been left to grow and fester, but they look a lot more menacing in this game than in the original. The same also goes for the plant creatures in the lab. Coupled with the aforementioned lighting, effects, and sound, the police station is easily one of the scariest places we visited in the series. But as you recall, the zombies aren't the only thing chasing you in this place. Mr. X now continually stalks the player the moment he's introduced. Knocking him down does nothing more than stop his assault momentarily, giving you a brief bit of time to put some distance between you, but he always comes back. There are some places Mr. X can't go, but he'll be chasing you down throughout most of your time in the precinct. This was a much better change. Mr. X in the original only appeared in the B playthrough and only during select moments. The moment you left those rooms, he would leave as well, so you only had to survive for a few seconds. In 2 Remake, he appears in both playthroughs for both characters, so escape is only temporary. He is genuinely terrifying, and part of that terror stems from his constant surveillance. You never truly know how close he is until you see him, and you feel like any sort of noise you make is going to tip him off to your location. So even when he's not in focus, he's still the main threat. It's a feeling that you can really only get when you're playing, when you're walking down a narrow hallway and you hear his boots in the distance, not knowing how close he actually is. It's something that still makes me anxious even after so many runs through this precinct. For the most part, the remake is loaded with these kinds of changes, alterations or additions that are largely to its benefit and do outclass the original. This also applies to the narrative. Claire was looking for her brother Chris, but Leon was supposed to start last week, but he got a call to stay away from the police department, a slight change over his initial drunken stupor. A few minor characters have also had some touch-ups. Marvin has been given a lot more screen time, which is likely done to make his death more emotional. Marvin first appeared at the beginning of the game, and then turned the second time you met him. In 2 Remake, Marvin's condition slowly gets worse as you progress. Even those that didn't play the original know what's coming, so it's just a matter of when. But that's what makes his heroism all the more inspiring, that he's using his last moments to save our protagonists. Both Ben and Chief Irons reprise their roles as they are largely the same. However, Ben gets killed by Mr. X in a pretty brutal way. While it's not too different from the chest burster, I do like this take on Ben's death. As Mr. X was designed to destroy evidence and retrieve a sample of G, this is just a part of his job. And with Mr. X having a much more commanding force, it makes him feel like the unkillable machine that he always was. Chief Irons has become a genuine asshole, more than before, which is a remarkable feat in and of itself. Rather than start him as a grieving friend before pulling the rug out from under the player, they start his mean streak right away. When meeting him for the first time, he forces Sherry to arrest Claire so that he could take Sherry away instead. He constantly talks down to both Sherry and Claire, further reinforcing his disregard for women. The note about his arrest in college is gone from the remake, but he does keep a taxidermy log. And his mention of a possible orgasm, coupled with the last entry of a pig, which I don't actually think is describing a pig, is flat out disgusting. They made him an absolutely awful person in this game, and I think it's the best version by far. He was already a completely irredeemable person, and in knowing that the remake goes as far as it can, knowing that anything else is just adding more atop the pile. The Ada and Sherry sections return as well and have been greatly expanded. Ada confronts Annette like before, but Sherry's actually taken to an orphanage and tries to escape. Ada's been given a few more gadgets than before, such as her trusty grapple hook, a staple of hers since RE4, as well as the EMF visualizer. This lets her transfer energy currents to certain power boxes, letting her open and close doors that she would otherwise not be able to. It's just another instance of the remake leaning into that spy aesthetic that she's always had, and it's once again a great change. Sherry's section involves hiding and solving puzzles while avoiding the watchful gaze of Chief Irons. It also adds some extra story beats like diaries that belong to the kids that used to be here. These, without question, are a net positive all around. The original sections were quite short and pretty irrelevant for the most part. 2 Remake's expansion, even if it doesn't add much narratively, was at least much more mechanically engaging. Focusing purely on the main cast, I found the dynamics between each character and the supporting cast to be much better in this game than in the original. Leon is much more green than before, which Ada uses to her advantage. Rather than her be a woman looking for her boyfriend, Remake drops the act and makes her an FBI agent. She's still a mercenary working for that super secret agency, but giving her this fake role of an agent makes much more sense. It makes her role a bit more consistent and believable than in the original. It also allows her to exert more of that personality of hers that we've come to know. She acts a lot more like her future iterations in the timeline, a sneaky woman who only reveals what's necessary when it's necessary. She exerts her authority as FBI over Leon, which makes her backstory feel more believable to him as well, that this is something way above his pay grade and that anything she knows is classified. It makes the betrayal make more sense as well since she's still an agent, just not one for the FBI. A slight alteration perhaps, but one that fits her role more. The relationship between the two has also seen some overhaul. There's a lot more playful banter between them, again a lot like we've seen in other games. Ada saves Leon twice, one from the dogs and the other Mr. X. She playfully comments that this is twice she owes him, to which Leon says,
"I didn't realize you were keeping score."
Later during Ada's news section, she gets injured, forcing Leon to help her out, in which she says the same line back to him.
Didn't realize we were keeping score.
This slight acknowledgement of each other's words shows that they care enough to remember their conversations. It's clear that they are growing closer to each other, even sharing a kiss at one point just like in the original, although much earlier this time. On the way to the sewers, they also have to pass Kendo's gun shop. They need to go through a store to reach the sewers, but Kendo catches them and puts his gun up. During their confrontation, Kendo's daughter Emma appears, who is noticeably infected. Ada immediately tries to kill her, but Leon suggests they just leave them be.
You're a cop. You're supposed to know something. How did this happen? Huh?
Kendo is a father just like any other. Confused at the state of the world and the fate that said world bestowed upon his family, he looked to someone with authority for answers, but he's just as clueless. He's already put down his wife, and now he has to do the same to his daughter. Even thinking of doing such a thing requires monumental strength, so it's no wonder he took his own life after they leave. The scene with Kendo really highlights the cost of the bioweapons, what happens to the ordinary people who are caught up in this greedy bid for power by larger companies and governments. But it also further solidifies their personalities. Leon wants to help people like Kendo, that's why he became a police officer in the first place. While Ada, despite knowing the answers to all the questions Kendo seeks, refuses to tell either of them as she's focused on her mission. But her humanity does shine through as she does tell Leon not long after who's at fault and why. I think back to the original RE2, where Ada said that she is incapable of caring for anyone, but that she does not want to lose Leon. Ada has a pretty tough outer shell, but Leon has always been one to chip away at that, if only for a little bit. The dev team then brings it all home in the scene we all knew was coming. After Leon gets the G-Virus, Ada betrays him. This is basically the same as the original, from Ada threatening to shoot him to Leon calling her bluff. Although the added scenes from earlier do make the betrayal hurt all the more. It feels like something is brewing between them, two people who have relied on each other all throughout their journey, only to have their friendship betrayed at the last minute. Letting you now fill your mind with questions such as if any of this was even real to begin with. Claire and Sherry's bond is also deepened significantly. Claire once again assumes her role as the parental guardian of Sherry. Like Leon though, slight additions really add more meaning to their relationship. To distract Sherry from the monster she saw, who ends up actually being her father, Claire starts to ask her about her parents. The two of them are revealed to be bound by their parents, as Claire's parents had died not long ago, a detail I believe is unique to the remake. Having now shared this bond, Sherry feels more comfortable around Claire. A few minutes later, Sherry is then taken by Chief Irons. It's only been a few minutes since she's talked with her, but she's already assumed her guardian role, and I like that the remake is actually forcing Claire to uphold that role by creating an actual antagonistic force. Chief Irons never did such a thing in the original. Sherry's biggest threat was Mr. X during one scene, and that's about it. Sherry was usually off on her own and never really in any danger. Creating an actual danger that threatens to take Sherry away is a much better angle, one that I really hoped was in Revelations 2, but at least it's in this remake. Because this adds more drama and tension than anything the original cooked up, and this change is definitely for the better. But of course, Claire's story is not complete without Annette. After William eviscerates Mr. X, a scene exclusive to Claire's, her and Sherry fall down an elevator shaft. Claire wakes up to Annette examining her to see if she's infected. Annette is much more analytical and dedicated to her work than ever before. Claire cannot get her to pay any attention as she's too focused on stopping William and examining the effects of the G-Virus. Annette will even get into an argument over Sherry about her leaving the house. This, as a bit of a side note, was also a slight tweak, as she was initially told to come to the police station, whereas in the remake she was just told to stay home. Doesn't change much, but figured I'd mention it. Regardless, Annette starts to get agitated over Sherry's presence as she now has to focus on her and William, and, well, we know what she's going to devote her time to. Sherry is a great example of how a change in voice talent and script can significantly change a scene, even if it's the exact same. There is much more desperation in her voice than ever before, and she seems a lot happier when she's around Claire. Sherry's just a scared little girl that needs help, but she doesn't have any parents that are willing to do so. It's why she sees Claire as her role model and her guardian. The upgraded visuals also make her infection much more noticeable, really highlighting its invasive presence. Annette's change in attitude comes down at the end though, but here in the middle of the tale, before she makes it to the lab. Annette is still focused on William despite her own daughter being infected. She even has the gall to say that she can't be cured, yet not only is she the one who helped make the damn thing, she didn't even try to find a solution. Claire refuses to accept that as an answer and goes off to find a cure herself, which is what makes Annette sort of realize her wrongs. Like before, Claire gets to the end and fights William while Annette is injured. But rather than use her dying breath to teach Claire the formula, she does the job herself and cures her daughter before she succumbs to the pain. It's a much more fulfilling moment than in the original, as instead of passing off the duty to someone else, aka using her last moments to put more burdens on people, she redeems herself of her past sins and finally takes on that burden herself, knowing it's the last thing she'll do. Like with Leon's campaign, the remake takes an already well-made story and enhances it. I've always loved the dynamic of Claire and Sherry, which is apparently something Capcom doesn't share, as despite existing in this franchise for so long, as you've likely noticed, none of them appear together. It's kind of crazy how we still have not gotten a game or really any kind of media with these two together despite how much is set up in this game. But this remake was a nice reminder of what could be if Capcom ever decides to finally greenlight that idea. On top of this, 2 Remake also adds in new lore outside the campaigns to further expand the outbreak and its lasting effects. The note that Chris leaves behind before heading to Europe was altered. The note is so very dude bro of him. Claire immediately clocks that something is wrong, as this doesn't sound like Chris at all. Rather than leave a heartfelt goodbye like in the original, it seems like Chris was intentionally deceiving everyone so they wouldn't be worried about his safety. The game also hilariously tries to explain why the police station is partially an art museum, something the original never explained. I found that original stray-faced nature to be incredibly funny, but I do have to respect the desire to at least explain things, like why the locks are playing card suits or why the chess pieces are plugs, but I think never explaining this stuff is just as entertaining. However, on the flip side, if you don't, then you don't get stuff like this, like Knight Construction Co., a real company that works in sewer management that happens to design their keys like chess pieces. What an incredibly specific niche. The CEO of the company also received numerous chess accolades and also named himself honorary director of his own chess guild. I mean, even the original tried to ground this in reality by stating that one of the men just liked playing chess and designed the keys that way. But as we've seen time and again, absurdity is often Resident Evil's strong suit, for better or worse. But Resident Evil is also a game of careful balance, as it is not afraid to get serious with its writing. Leon's welcome note has also been slightly altered. It's now part of a puzzle where they play a prank on Leon by locking his desk, which can only be unlocked by using the initials of his fellow officers' names. It gives you a helpful reward and makes you directly interact with the environment by actually looking at their desks. The final line is also a completely unique addition, where they tell Leon that they are glad he is not here. This line, being smudged with blood, tells us all we need to know. There was also an email in the nest that clarifies that Birkin tried to sell the G-Virus to the military before Umbrella could get their hands on it, which is what led to his assassination. The diaries from the kids at the orphanage also imply that they were test subjects for Umbrella, which could explain why Umbrella has a stake in the orphanage. Overall, it's high marks across the board. It keeps the original feel of the game intact, but expands on elements to make them much more impactful. The original game already did a great job of fleshing out these characters and their relationships. The remake just takes it a step further. It's just a shame that the original's most impressive feature is also the remake's most poorly implemented. The A and B scenarios of RE2 are gone. Claire and Leon's first runs not only contradict each other, but their second runs are just the same as the first, minus the first hour. The first and second run, like the original, change how the character enters the RPD. This of course also changes the flow of progression and how you go from room to room. Then the last 5 minutes is basically who gets to fight Birkin's final form. Like in Resident Evil 2, whoever is on the second run gets the honor of killing him, but outside of this, it's basically the exact same. To be completely honest with you, its implementation in the remake is horrible. Even simple things like Marvin staying alive or not isn't even taken into account. Regardless of if you fill the poor guy with holes, he'll come back in the beginning of the second run. The most egregious offense, though, is all the content in between. After the RPD, our characters have a fight with Birkin, but then climb into the parking lot and meet with the supporting cast. They then work to get their respective locks open, which is the same puzzle, although one of the pieces is in a different location. They then use that keycard to escape the RPD. Leon then goes through Kendo's gun shop and into the sewers, while Claire goes to the orphanage to save Sherry, and then it's on to the sewers. The sewer section is pretty much the exact same. They then take the cable car to the nest, navigate the lab to find higher access cards, which involves doing the same exact puzzles. Then they find the G-Virus, then both fight and kill William. Annette then reveals that Ada is a spy to Leon, or helps Claire save Sherry from the infection before shortly dying in both playthroughs. Then the playthrough split for the remainder of the game as Leon fights a souped-up Mr. X, while Claire fights Birkin again. The second character then also fights Birkin in his final form to close out the game. Now, I understand I'm being really pedantic here, going over all of it with a fine-tooth comb looking for any issues I may have. To its credit, there are at least a few unique alterations. Mr. X gets killed by Birkin prior to entering the sewers when playing as Claire. This doesn't happen as Leon, so after getting Tier 3 access, he's ambushed by Mr. X, whereas Claire is not. Still, it's such a shame that the story plays out this way. And I'd like to state for the record that the second run is no different other than the very beginning and the very end. Everything discussed in the middle happens in both runs, and the story plays out the exact same way for each character. The reason this was made was due to an attempt to streamline the content and then use those extra resources to expand the existing story. In an interview with fan site Rely on Horror, producer for the second remake Yoshiaki Hirabayashi, when asked about these scenarios and asked if they would return, he said, quote, "We still want to replicate that feeling of seeing two sides of the story through both characters' perspectives in their own way. So for that reason, we have a Leon campaign and a Claire campaign. They're separate, and you can choose which one you want to play first. We did simplify it a bit and make it more elegant by eliminating the A and B distinction, and sort of meshing together what would happen in both A and B scenarios into one story. I think players today, they want a sort of deep, intense experience with the story, and by stretching it across 4 scenarios, the story gets spread a little thin, and create a sense of repetition by going through the game multiple times to see everything. So for that reason, we went with 2 campaigns that still show all the events of each character's story, rather than have it all split up. In a way, I respect this. As I said back in part 1 when discussing Resident Evil 2, having to do 4 playthroughs can be exhausting, so simplifying things makes sense. On top of the fact that lots of Resident Evil material has been released since then and has sort of canonized this story. So rather than waste time creating a what-if scenario, they wanted to flesh out an actual undisputed canonical story. I still would have preferred to see a proper return to the old style, but I get it. What bothers me is that they streamlined the story, and yet it still has more contradictions than the original. If Leon and Claire both fight Birkin, then who actually killed him? If these playthroughs happen at the same time, then how does Mr. X die in Claire's playthrough, only to come back unharmed in Leon's? If Annette both helped Sherry get cured and talk to Leon, how did she die in 2 places at once? The game seems to have went down the path of Resident Evil 1. Because of the presence of Mr. X, lots of fans wondered if there was more than one tyrant chasing down the duo. One of the developers in an interview with PC Gamer stated that there is only one tyrant, and that whoever is chosen for the scenario is the main story arc. Further saying that each scenario is like a parallel world, one where Leon had more involvement and the other where Claire did. But I'd hardly say that was a good approach, even for Resident Evil 1. It just sort of messes up the story when it doesn't need to, which is especially strange since RE2 already solved this problem over 20 years ago. You need a B playthrough to counteract the A. The problem is that this is a retelling of both Claire and Leon's A playthroughs with a few B elements mixed in, which can't be possible. When Ada betrays Leon, Annette is there to kill her, which explains why Sherry is near the bridge looking over her mother. Yet the remake continually claims differently. Ultimately, 2 Remake is still fantastic. The story changes, the voice acting, the gameplay, and the reimagining of the police station are amazing. It's just the scenarios that bother me. I hold remakes to a much higher degree of scrutiny than their originals, because the remakes have the benefit of hindsight. They know what worked and what didn't, so to not only remove a core feature of RE2, but then create a problem with your narrative that could have been solved with that core feature is unbelievable. Frankly, unless you really enjoy the game, there is no need to play a 3rd or 4th run. Just do a first playthrough for each character and call it a night. So is the game great? Absolutely. No question about it. It's a fine game and an even finer remake. The expansion of the in-game lore to the overhauled characters and gameplay are fantastic. The relationships between the cast like Ada and Leon and Claire and Sherry are some of the best, and connect well when put next to future titles they'll appear in. It's just a shame that the remake removed the original scenario style, as it tends to make a mess out of a central narrative that was already well established and well thought out. But with another game right around the corner, it's hard to care about any shortcomings. 3 Remake released a year later in 2020. The game starts in a rather ironic fashion, given the year it was released. The T-Virus has swept Raccoon City hard enough to put the city on lockdown. The pandemic has caused riots and protests as people demand answers and reassurance. Can't tell if this is real life or the game. But we then return to more Resident Evil-centric story beats, as we see Umbrella reassure everyone of their goals and values, while footage is being played of researchers analyzing Nemesis, even prepping him in a box to be shipped out to Raccoon City. All hell is about to break loose, but when is the real question. In what was only conveyed through text, 3 Remake shows us Jill's months-long deep dive into Umbrella, as alluded to back in her journal in the original. There is an entire map of Raccoon City with pictures in yarn denoting the connections that she's pieced together. A few notes on the wall provide us with some other details. Jill has supposedly been suspended from stars, likely due to her criticism of Umbrella. There was an old cut image that was initially meant to play in the intro of Resident Evil 3 that shows the stars coming back from the Spencer mansion and confronting Chief Irons over their findings. Given he was in Umbrella's pocket, it makes sense why he suspended her. Due to this, she had to essentially hide from Umbrella. Brad had to use a pizza delivery to sneak a note to her. It's also clear that spending months on this has started to take a toll on her. The game initially begins with Jill having a nightmare while sleeping at her desk after a long day's work. She dreams of herself becoming infected. The horrors of the Spencer mansion still weigh heavy on her mind, it seems. As was mentioned in her journal, Jill was going to look into Umbrella and then flee the city. Her calendar marked "worst month of my life" is close to finished. In the meantime, she's neglected much of her living space and likely her own personal health. Sleeping at your desk overnight is already a sign of exhaustion, but the dirty plates, unfinished food, and piled out dishes suggest that she's put all of her time into this. But she seems close to cracking this thing wide open, she just needs more time. Time she will not get. I always love searching rooms like this in games. We are reflections of our environment after all. We decorate our personal living spaces to be an extension of ourselves. We already saw this with the Bakers, but it's cool to see this with a main character now. This one room has more personality and storytelling than arguably most of the original game, and we've only just begun. As she awakes from her nightmare, she washes up and gets a phone call from Brad. Just like her talk in the diner back then, Brad is here to tell her that something big is coming for them. While in the original, the game operated on your time as it was willing to wait until you got to the RPD, now the game acts on its time. It wants to turn at the wheel for once, so without warning, before you can even get your bearings down, the Nemesis busts right through the wall. Thanks to the advancements in technology, the game opts for a scripted set piece when introducing the Nemesis. I think this has its benefits. Relinquishing control lets the team do exactly what they want. While giving the player their freedom means less bombastic action, but it makes their experience completely unique. I think it's about striking a careful balance, and 3 Remake gives you a bit of both. The cutscenes are often used to introduce the Nemesis before they hand you back the controller mid-fight and say, "Alright, you figure it out." The intro to the Nemesis is also in tandem with the Raccoon City downfall. Just like the original did in 1998, 3 Remake does an excellent job of recreating the city and then subsequently destroying it minutes later. Rather than have Jill fight her way through though, she's forced to run through much of the destruction. It conveys much more devastation as you helplessly try to fight back. Both interpretations of the outbreak work well with these games. The original wanted you to start shooting right from the start, but it also feel like the city was crumbling around you. In its own way, having Jill mostly go through back alleys was their way of showing Jill outrunning the hordes by sticking to the side paths away from all the zombies. The remake wants you to feel the crumbling of the city, to be on those main streets as you maneuver through the hordes, not around them, as you're helpless to stop its advances. Both works, much like Jill's room, are products of their environment, a showcase of how games as a medium have changed over the years, with stories and cutscenes becoming more pronounced as the years went on. Simple things like Jill being ambushed by zombies or kicking them as she tries to get into an elevator, this would just be gameplay, not a cutscene. But the medium has changed in the past 22 years since these releases, and games have different expectations now. Part of this change in expectation is how the player exchanges blows with the Nemesis. Much has been said about 3 Remake's Nemesis. Not much of it good. Nemesis is functionally not much different from his original counterpart. Like in the original, he will ambush Jill throughout the game, forcing you into an encounter with it, but they removed the ability to kill him outside of scripted events. You can down him and get some parts like in the original, but it's only a couple of times. He does also follow you across the screen, so to speak, like in the original, but he eventually gives up the chase after a while like before. While this is fine on its own, 2 Remake had set a precedent, arguably an expectation, and it doesn't fulfill that. Mr. X following the player throughout the precinct was a welcome change, that likely got fans excited to see where they could take the Nemesis. With more tools and resources, it was expected that the remake would expand upon the Nemesis, but it doesn't. The Nemesis hasn't changed at all, minus a visual touch-up. Credit where it's due, the Nemesis is still pretty threatening when he appears, no question about that, especially with his numerous armaments that seem to get more ridiculous as the games continue, emphasizing the original vision and making him a constant threat that you can never hope to overcome. His kit was also utilized quite well. He punches you a lot more than Mr. X does, the latter just sitting there for a few seconds so that you can run away. Nemesis wants you near him at all times. He constantly drags you back to him with his tentacles, closing the distance for a lethal punch. Jill too even starts to introduce her own ridiculous moves, such as trying to ram the thing with a car, something you could not pull off in the original unless it was an FMV. Here it's just a cutscene, a natural continuation of the story. A daring escape in the beginning, the freedom to explore during the middle, and the climactic fight at the end. Although it would be short-lived as there will be many fights soon to come. Now there are certainly some video gamey elements in these fights, such as how Nemesis gets caught by the mine grenade and yet even after 3 or 4 hits, never considers that maybe he's the one doing something wrong here. but the actual moment-to-moment street fights with the guy are great, and I think his abilities as a pursuer are good too. I just think that he could have been far more threatening and could have been a much more constant threat throughout the city. Fan website Crimson Heads had interviewed Kazuhiro Oyama, who you remember from our discussion on RE3, was the director of the original game. The fan site had asked him about the remake's changes and how some of the fans were left disappointed, and he said, quote, "The fact that the game is a remake and yet they dared to remove an iconic setting for the game makes me think that they made changes related to the setting and story, but I don't feel those changes when I play it. I think the fact that it's a change of setting is what makes people dissatisfied with the game. I was expecting Nemesis to give a much more deeper gameplay experience than I had with Tyrant and Resident Evil 2. I would have liked to see Nemesis play a much more active role in the remake, not in the cutscenes, but in the game." That is, surprisingly honest, but I do think it also brings up a good point. He is much less of a threat in this game due to how the player has little say in what happens during most encounters with him. While they serve as nice introductions, the on-rail sections where the Nemesis is chasing you arguably have a better chance of killing your enthusiasm than the Nemesis does Jill. In keeping with the spirit of the previous remake, they've also removed a core tenet of the game for the sake of streamlining. Live selection QuickTime events have been removed to tell a more consistent story. Thing is, it's not even like a big change this time around. I still don't like its removal in 2 Remake, but I can at least understand why that many playthroughs would be confusing and exhausting to play through. RE3 isn't even that long of a game, the remake especially. Adding these extra scenes to give some agency to the player was a great way of pushing back against the Nemesis, on top of adding replayability just to see how things played out. Small details like who kills Murphy or how Tyrell dies were changed because of these live selections, and I think this added more inherent replay value to the game, especially since it was, again, a core part of the original experience. This is also coupled with a lot of lingering resentment people have for the cut content of the remake in general. The park and everything inside it, like the graveyard and the other sections, was removed. Same goes for the gas station minus a small cameo, the clock tower, and the Dead Factory. Although in defense of the game, while it's not the Dead Factory exactly, the whole point of the location was that it was an Umbrella lab, and there is one at the end of this remake, it's just not the Dead Factory's lab. But this also means that the boss fights like the Worm were cut, and the puzzles involved in those sections were also gone. Resident Evil 3 was a rather thin game compared to the originals, so cutting out the fat of that game for the remake, suffice to say we hit the bone a long time ago. While the sections were short, I did like the clock tower and the park. They weren't very story-heavy sections, minus some environmental storytelling, but it was a part of Resident Evil 3 and I think it should have remained. Instead, we got a semi-decent sewer section, likely using the same assets that 2 Remake used. Seeing this stuff removed when it was promised to be a remake of the original material does hurt. It's a sentiment many who played the original have shared, leaving many people to believe that Resident Evil Resistance was partially at fault. In an interview with US Gamer, one of the producers, when asked about the multiple endings and choices, said, quote, "With this one, we knew we wanted to tell a consistent story. The director wanted to tell a consistent story. So it made sense to just make it that way and flesh that out and make it real tight. And we knew that we had some replayability with the Resistance game. As mentioned in Part 2, Resident Evil Resistance was bundled with 3 Remake to give it more replay value. Now some have taken this as the remake being gutted to make room for the game, but I don't think that's true. Resistance was made by NeoBard and started development back in 2018. Looking through interviews for both games, it seems though the game was bundled with RE3 because of the lack of content, not that RE3 was cut down to make room for it. So I don't really think it's worth pointing fingers at this game for what it did to Resident Evil 3, although it is worth questioning why Capcom thought this would serve as a nice bonus. But it did chap a lot of people's asses to know that Mercenaries was cut in favor of Resistance, the one thing that game's development did actually have an effect on. Now look, I'm not even a Mercenaries fan on like the best of days. I play these games for the stories and the single-player experiences. But as we've discussed before, Capcom has a pretty poor track record with these multiplayer games, so seeing the game that initially started Mercenaries not get one in favor of this, man, even I have to admit that sucks. Getting to the point though, yet again, it seems like we have a problem created from cutting a specific piece of content that could have been solved with that thing's inclusion. If you wanted more replay value, then maybe live selection should have returned. Complicated story be damned. But with this in mind, what did Capcom do with these live selections? What is this consistent story they talk so much about? The original and the remake have very similar stories and do end the same way to keep continuity, but lots of things in the middle have changed. Like before, Jill is trying to escape Raccoon City with her life. Along the way, she'll meet with the Nemesis and the UBCS. Unfortunately, Brad isn't killed by the Nemesis, which I think is a bit of an odd change, as he just gets bit by a zombie instead. That initial cutscene with the Nemesis, never mind all the promo material with him and Brad, really hammered home just how much Jill was going to lose when up against this guy. So having Brad die to a zombie is strange. It's not long after this when she meets with Carlos and the rest of the UBCS. Jill's attitude towards the UBCS is more direct than in the original. She still has the same apprehension towards them, but she makes her point known this time, continually commenting on their failures and being rather reluctant to join them.
I'm alive is more than I can manage.
Well, you can thank your corporate overlords for that.
Yes. Well, we are doing all we can.
But I am on their side, not yours.
Oh, hey. It's cool. We all want the same thing.
Thank you, Jill.
All right, Super Cop. Here you go. We can use this to stay in contact.
I know what a radio is.
As you can see, she's kind of an asshole to the UBCS, but it's hard not to see why given everything Umbrella has done. Like in the original, her experience with Umbrella has hardened her, making her less willing to trust those that don their logo, so giving Jill some sly remarks like this is a great change. Most of the cast has also gotten some degree of change as well, and if they haven't, the context is different. For example, Mihail still dies to the Nemesis. However, he takes on a much more senior role within the group. I don't believe the original ever expanded upon this, but the remake makes it clear that he is the leader of this platoon. It makes Nikolai not seem like a leader, but more like a separate entity within the group. Mihail is also quite familiar with the stars and even Jill herself, adding a unique dynamic to this interpretation, even if it doesn't go anywhere. Further, as stated in the original, the UBCS was here to rescue civilians and bring them to safety. The remake actually shows the civilians they rescued. It's meant to add some skepticism to the player given that they're Umbrella, but it also makes the scene that you know is coming hit even harder. The Nemesis is bound to show up here, but rather than just ruin the squad's day, Nemesis killed all the civilians on board. Carlos and Tyrell have also seen the most overhaul here in the remake. Let's start with the fact that Tyrell actually exists. Prior to this, Tyrell would be killed by Nikolai or maybe try to take Nikolai out depending on a previous choice. Tyrell here actually serves a purpose. After getting the subway online, Mihail, Nikolai, and Jill are going to ride it to safety. In the meantime, Carlos and Tyrell are going to look into a Nathaniel Bard as he may know a vaccine for the T-virus. To start, they head to the RPD, which explains why Jill never got the honor of going there unlike her original counterpart. Tyrell doesn't say much, but I like that he's at least present. He provides a nice back and forth so Carlos isn't alone. The contrast in how Tyrell and Carlos work compared to Jill is rather striking too. Brad managed to find his way here even while zombified. He also bit Marvin, which explains how he was infected, a slight twist on the original interpretation established by Outbreak. If this was Jill, there'd be drama and tension here, but since Carlos doesn't know Brad, he just puts him down like any other zombie. Both these guys are calculated and efficient, and these sections show that quite well. But that doesn't mean they don't have heart, Carlos especially. He quickly learns that this rescue mission is less about a rescue and more of a snatch and grab. Nathaniel Bard is a doctor at the Spencer Memorial Hospital that you visit in Carlos's chapter. Given its name, it's no secret he has connections with Umbrella. Bard knows all of Umbrella's dirty secrets, so he's a liability. So they were probably sent to find him under the guise of a rescue before Umbrella silences him. Carlos doesn't want to turn him over to Umbrella just yet though because of his knowledge of the vaccine. He has little time to think about what to do though, as when Jill fights the Nemesis, she gets infected. This transitions to Carlos's hospital chapter, which has also been given more time in the script than in the original. Narratively, it's when Carlos learns of Umbrella's true goal, which is then followed by his own anger as he realized that Jill was telling the truth all this time, and yet she still trusted them. You can read some of the notes in here, and like in the original game, they get more grim as they continue, as more patients come in seeking treatment, eventually leading to the staff having to barricade themselves in a room that is now covered in blood and corpses. A new story beat exclusive to the remake also comes during this hospital scene with Carlos. Rather than escape the incoming missile strike from the army, Carlos wonders if they can use the vaccine he made for Jill to buy time. It clearly works, so this could actually save everyone in the city without needing to blow it sky high. Tyrell then becomes their liaison as he tries to ring the government. They're willing to parlay, but they need to get the vaccine before the missile strike. They cannot delay it any longer. So rather than it being a race to escape, it's a race to save the city. A similar idea, but a different context, one that heightens the overall intensity of this mission. But of course, this is a story of Jill and Carlos, so Tyrell isn't going to last long. He gets taken out by Nemesis shortly after, but his presence in the script was an unexpected but welcome change. While he was more of a here for a good time, not a long time kind of character, I was glad to see that he and the other UBCS got their time to shine. But as more things change, the more they stay the same. Murphy is still the first to die of the group and only gets 1 or 2 lines beforehand, but that's because this is mainly to introduce Nikolai. It wasn't too long before the original Jill became wary of Nikolai and his schemes, so this is Remake's attempt at doing this. I think having him kill Murphy right away without warning though, kinda leaves little room for doubt as to his attitude or role in this story. Again, live selections would have changed this, since Carlos could have been the one to reluctantly put him down, and even then Nikolai was slightly less obvious about his villainy in the original. His killing of Murphy was off-screen so that the player couldn't really deduce what happened. That's not to say he didn't come off as a villain, but by having his first interaction be more standoffish, followed up by a scene you may not have found, it's a bit different than him just playing executioner right away. Ultimately, Nikolai is still the guy who's looking out for himself, and this is evident by his next appearance when he leaves Mikhail and Jill to fight the Nemesis while he escapes, rather than not even appearing in the cable car. But as he is the main antagonist, his schemes are intertwined with the narrative. Nikolai cares very little for the vaccine. He steals it from Jill and threatens her with a deal. She fights the Nemesis while he records the combat data. Then, maybe, he'll think about giving her the vaccine. He's lying, of course, as by the end he shoots the vial, eliminating the only chance they had to save the city. I love this new take, as it makes Nikolai out to be utterly evil and only in this for the money, regardless of who dies in the process. It also makes Jill and the player angrier than before, as now Nikolai is directly to blame for the people's suffering. As payment, Nikolai is left to burn along with the rest of the city, although he does not die off-screen, so it's possible that he survived the missile. Hey, look, we're about to assemble a child together like they're a Lego in the next game. There's been worse fates that people have come back from in this series, believe me. Part of the reason Nikolai even did any of this in the first place, though, is because of his employer. The remake uses the powers of hindsight to establish connections the previous game could not. I never mentioned this back in Part 1, but in Umbrella Chronicles, Nikolai was learned to have come in contact with Sergei Vladimir. Prior to this, it was assumed that he was with Umbrella and looking to get ahead. This time, rather than take all the glory for himself, the remake uses that older context to make Nikolai out as a double agent. He's not actually working with Umbrella and is in fact here to sabotage their entire operation so that his people can reap the rewards. Now, whether this is actually Sergei or someone else, we don't know, but it's a nice change and keeps continuity with later entries. Although keeping in spirit with this game's ability to give and take in equal measure, the remake neglects to mention the existence of the UBCS, as no documents or dialogue in-game actually explain who they are, which is incredibly strange, especially since these guys are meant to be mercs and criminals. The only acknowledgement of this comes from Murphy, who was prior to this serving time in jail, but one could just assume that was specific to him. Given the amount of time you talk with Carlos, I was wondering if he was ever going to bring that up. Those who haven't played the original are really missing some key context here. The remake, however, does at least give back by elaborating or adding a few new details to spice up the underlying lore in this new remade timeline. New enemies like the Paleheads and Nemesis zombies have been introduced. Narratively, there isn't much to go on rather than simply being a mutation of the original experiment. The Hunter Gammas have also returned. And notes in-game detail how Umbrella planned to shut the whole program down, but some staff members smuggled them into the sewers, which is how they ended up here. This new lab is also meant to serve as an extension of the Nest from Remake 2, this one called Nest 2. This lab focuses on T-virus research, specifically vaccines for T-virus exposure, and weaponry capable of stopping bioweapons. It was also stated in some of the files that Nemesis was a creation of the European branch of Umbrella, not the American one. This flows more neatly into Code Veronica when Chris vows to take them down, although he never does, and even surprisingly connects to Resident Evil 4 Remake, because as we'll soon see, Luis was a part of the team behind Nemesis back in Europe. But another note also expresses concern about the precedent set by using parasites in their testing and not viruses, something not initially made in the Umbrella policy. It provides a nice flow from the viruses of this early era to the parasites seen in Resident Evils 4 and 5. Overall, Resident Evil 3 Remake is about as hard to evaluate as the original was for me. There are lots of things this remake did really well. I like some of the new changes to the cast and some of the pre-made fights with the Nemesis. But not capitalizing on the success in Mr. X and evolving what the Nemesis could have been in this new era was a missed opportunity. The cut content is also quite a shame for a game claiming to be a remake, but in doing so, it's created a remix of sorts while still retaining much of the core identity. Both games serve as a nice shot and chaser combo, and I think that's what Remake 3 serves to do best, be a nice follow-up to the original. One that doesn't replace the original, one that can sit alongside it as a different experience. But it was only a matter of time until we got the next proper Resident Evil release, and with the franchise having more wind in its sails than ever before, it was only right to pick up where we left off. Resident Evil 8 once again stars Ethan Winters. The game takes place 2 years after the original, and since then Ethan and Mia have moved into a new home somewhere in Europe, and have also welcomed their daughter Rose to the world as well. Well, this seems like quite the leap. Bundled with Resident Evil 8 was the Baker Incident Report. It's a compiled list of documents, interviews, social media posts, and personal thoughts on everything related to the events of RE7, written from Zoe Baker's perspective. According to the notes, the official story is that there was a gas leak at the Baker's house which caused all the deaths. Zoe Baker is also counted among the dead despite being alive. In a rare showing from this franchise, we actually get to see some outside views on the incident. People on social media were questioning the gas leak, wondering if it was really true. Interestingly, someone called them out claiming that they were responsible for spreading conspiracy theories about Raccoon City. So it seems like even now many people are still left in the dark as to what happened back then. Zoe then goes to add that she was taken into custody by the BSAA. She was also given a new name and identity, likely so her ties to the attack could be removed. She also tried to find where Ethan and Mia were because she wanted to thank them for helping her, but apparently the connections are trying to find them too, so any info about their location is classified. The BSAA for their part are still looking into the connections. They know they used to be in Europe and that some people were headed to the US. This line refers to Alan and Mia who were taking Evelyn aboard that ship before it crashed. We also learned that the connections were started by a Brandon Bailey who was actually Oswald Spencer's right-hand man, who we know of course was the founder of Umbrella. The two broke off their relationship due to differing visions, and Bailey used his connections that he gained from his time at Umbrella to create the connections. Unlike Oswald Spencer, it seems though the connections were simply doing this for the sake of money. On top of looking into the connections, the BSAA had to deal with the Winters. Now as we know, Mia was a part of the connections too. She still hasn't told Ethan about this, but the BSAA were willing to keep it a secret thanks to her cooperation and figuring all this stuff out with the mold and such. The Winters were then told to pack their bags, as like with Zoe, they were given a new life and name. They now live in a remote village deep in Eastern Europe, possibly Romania. The two then settled into their new life and started a family. Chris also trained Ethan in combat and defensive tactics, something that oddly enough can be seen in-game now based on how Ethan reloads his weapons. That would be the end of this little recap, but there was one last note at the end. It's a letter from the BSAA HQ to Chris. Chris has seemingly without permission taken control of the BSAA's Hound Wolf squad, taken a series of classified documents, and seemingly went rogue. He's also brought the squad to Eastern Europe where Ethan and Mia are. The BSAA demands answers from him, especially as he's grown more critical of command recently, but Chris has refused to comment. As we start the game, Ethan and Mia are reading Rose a bedtime story. Afterwards, Ethan takes her to bed while Mia prepares dinner. Piggybacking off RE7, instead of exploring the Baker's home, we can now explore the Winters. It's got less detail than the Baker estate, given you'll be here for a total of 20 minutes, but there's still enough to glean from its walls. As Ethan said back in Resident Evil 7, he and Mia were going to restart their life together, and having a baby was a way of solidifying their continued love. We can find a photo album of the two, from their marriage to when Rose was born. They are over the moon to be parents. Rose seems to be the only thing they ever talk about. It's clear that having a child was one of the best things for them. They seem much happier now that Rose is in their lives.
Well, hi there, little Rose.
Not everything has been great over at Casa de Winter, though. The two have gotten in quite a few arguments, mostly revolving around the incident. Ethan still wants to talk about it. He feels as though part of him is still stuck in Louisiana, but Mia has been unwilling to. Whether she is simply trying to remove it from her mind or hide her involvement with the connections is unclear, although I'd wager it's both. Like our discussions involving Resident Evil 7 and RE Remake, Capcom has really started leaning into this more unique style of storytelling, and I find that the games have been better off for it. Environmental storytelling continues to be one of my favorite methods of storytelling because it's an avenue that's not often taken, as dialogue is often simpler and more direct. But you do have to appreciate the level of detail in a place that's only going to last 20 minutes. It's the same thing I praised Resident Evil 2 for all the way back in Part 1, showing us that it's a style that Resident Evil has never lost touch with, merely evolved as time has gone on. Too bad it's all going to come crashing down, as while the Winters won't have to worry about a nemesis ruining their deposit, Ethan will soon have a nemesis of his own, this time an old friend.
Mia! Mia. Oh, God. Chris? What the hell?
Sorry, Ethan.
No! What? Why?
Much has been said about Chris Redfield in relation to Resident Evil 8, mostly about this section right here, although not for the right reasons. So yeah, Chris did just shoot Mia and will now be running off with his daughter. Not a great look for Mr. Resident Evil. But he's Chris Redfield. He's always got a reason for things. It's learned at the end of the game that Mia was actually replaced by a woman named Mother Miranda. We'll learn about her as we continue, but she has unique powers that allow her to change her appearance. She captured Mia some time ago, experimented on her, and has been playing the role of Ethan's wife. Case in point, Chris has a reason for doing all this. It was a surprise attack so that he could catch Mother Miranda off guard. The problem that a lot of people have with this scene is the fact that Chris never tells Ethan about this until about 7 or so hours into the game. This whole time, Ethan is running around assuming Chris killed his wife on top of kidnapping his daughter, and yet for most of the game, somehow Chris did not find the time to tell him. Personally, I see it both ways. At the end of the game, Chris's crew even grills him for doing this. He claims that there was just simply not enough time. I don't know, I feel as though it probably would have taken longer to reload the gun he mag-dumped into his wife than it would have been to explain what happened. Especially since, he decided to aura farm a little afterwards. However, in Chris's defense, he said that he was worried that Mother Miranda had gotten to him too, so they couldn't take the risk. That's why Ethan and Rose were later put inside a transport truck. Further, Chris confesses that he didn't want Ethan involved, saying that his job is hard enough without civilians getting in the way. Chris's past is directly responsible for this outcome. Back in Resident Evil 5, he grew wary of the BSAA. He also thought that he lost his partner for years. In Resident Evil 6, he lost all of his men twice. He lost more in Resident Evil 7, and in just about every single incident he's been involved in, innocent people have had their lives taken by people with no morals, and he's been powerless to stop them before they act. All of this has led to him going rogue, as he no longer answers to anyone but himself. Chris could not sit idly by as more info kept piling up on his desk with no attempt at closing the book. And most important of all, he couldn't stand to see yet another person die because of him. He knew that if Ethan had known the truth, he would come after Mother Miranda. That's why he had hoped that by not telling him, Ethan would stay put and let Chris handle it. Chris has changed a lot since Resident Evil 6. I didn't get a chance to mention this in part 2, but the guy started smoking again. Resident Evil 1 had Chris smoking too, but because of how cheesy that whole game was, you could assume that it was just trying to make him cool. Resident Evil 6's Chris smokes to cope, no different than Leon's excessive drinking. Chris is tired. He's at least 40 and still dealing with pain he suffered from 20 years ago. Chris has never lost his way. He's always done what's best to save the people of this world and work to create a better tomorrow. But little by little, incidents have started chipping away at his armor. Not enough to break it, but just enough to be a little irrational. Should he have told Ethan? Absolutely, but I can also see why he didn't want Ethan involved, especially when we get to the final scene at the end of the game. His feelings there perfectly illustrate why he didn't want Ethan involved in all this. Still, I could see the other side of the argument, as even after Ethan shows Chris that he's serious, he continues to make no mention of that night, simply saying that Ethan is out of his depth and has to stay away from here. By this point, Ethan had already killed 2 of the 4 lords that we'll talk about soon, so the guy's clearly demonstrated his stance on his quest for his daughter and his skills in dealing with BOWs. So we probably should have at least clued him in on what's going on, not wait another 2 hours to do so. But as I said in part 1, rather than lament on what could have been, we ought to look at what was. The game continues from this point back at the house with Ethan being taken into a truck along with Rose, but as the bus crashes, he wakes up on the cold snow. Chris is gone, all the others are dead, and Rose is missing. Making his way through the forest, he'll arrive at a village. The village is such an interesting addition to the game. Initially, it serves as this calm before the storm. A place where all those occasional jump scares and loud noises come from, where you're walking around wondering when it's all about to kick off. The village is covered in prayer offerings. The people of this place worship that Mother Miranda figure we talked about earlier. They pray to her for good fortune and prosperity. Like Resident Evil 4 though, there's also a significant change in tone and design from the ornate castle in the distance to the downtrodden village outside. It suggests a village whose prayers are many, but whose answers are few. And yet there are also no bodies, almost like everyone's disappeared one night. But rather than leaving us guessing, Village is a bit more direct in its approach. Ethan is greeted by a pack of Lycans, the perpetrators of this attack. When entering the home of a man, Ethan is almost blown to bits. He's saved by sheer luck, but the sound attracted them to the house. They then snatch the man up to the rafters as Ethan is pulled downward. It's down here where we find the answers we seek. This is where the townspeople were, hidden under the house while the Lycans make their own nests born from the villagers' flesh. As the attacks progressed, a villager named Louisa made her home a sanctuary. Ethan meets with the other survivors, likely the only ones left. Without many options, some choose to pray. They pray to Mother Miranda for aid, but as the ritual progresses, one of the men who has been earlier turns into a Lycan and kills everyone in the home, a perfect representation of their faith. The village is such a wonderful but also integral part of the game's story and its gameplay. Later, after you're introduced to the 4 lords, the place becomes a kind of hub that connects to the other lords' domains. It's expected that you return to previous areas as you may find keys or other items that unlock more paths. Valuables also appear at certain intervals that are ripe for the taking, and new enemies appear every so often. As we've seen throughout the series, Resident Evil has tried evolving the backtracking open world formula. Ever since the first game, backtracking was a core design feature, bundled with the zombie shooting experience. It feels different here in Village, as while you do backtrack, it's less about returning to a place until it's used up its value, and more so a living part of the world that moves with you, always present and always relevant. It's a unique approach, and I think that's what makes the Village come alive. It's one of my favorite settings in the franchise because of how you continually unravel its layers as you progress. Narratively, it's also a great showcase of the townspeople, their faith, their living conditions, and how this contrasts to everything we're about to see. Not long into his journey, Ethan runs into a lord of the village, Heisenberg. He's then taken to an altar room where he meets with the rest of the crew, Alcina Dimitrescu, Donna Beneviento and her doll Angie, Moreau, and of course, Mother Miranda. As Ethan learns later, Rose has been killed. Sort of. As part of some ritual, Mother Miranda split Rose into pieces, each one being given to a lord of the village. While Ethan thinks it's already over, he is told that if he finds all the flasks, he can reassemble her. So while RE7 is about saving your wife, Resident Evil 8 is about saving your daughter. We've already seen what Ethan is capable of, but Resident Evil 8 Ethan is even more of a monster, in more ways than one, as we'll soon see. In the past 2 years, he's gone under some combat training, but his personality has changed over that same time as well. Likely realizing that Ethan is now his own person, Capcom leaned into his personality more. Most of it centers around his daughter. As a father who's on a quest to save her, he has little time for anything else other than the mission. He scoffs at Heisenberg when they first meet and cares little for the Duke's presence at first. You can also hear just the visceral anger in his voice anytime his daughter is mentioned. The Duke here talks about his daughter's current condition, and you can tell he's both distraught at the revelation and annoyed that the Duke won't give him any helpful advice.
Go and seek out the man who lives there. Then we can continue our conversation.
Quit holding out and get to the damn point.
Hearing your daughter is dead would cause anyone to be angry, especially at those who caused it, though it's understandable why he's pissed off. There is a hint of sadness in him too that is expertly oozed out of him throughout this opening. He saw his wife get killed in the opening and was powerless to stop Chris. He'll then see the villagers die one after the other as he continues to fail. Elena, one of the last remaining survivors, will burn in the house along with everything else, and it really starts to take a toll on him.
Why is everyone dying on me? Why the fuck is this happening again?
Ethan survived the Baker's onslaught 3 years ago, and he had hoped that this was it, that he could put all this behind him and finally live his life again. But his past has continued to bring him back to that day, as if he had never left. All he wanted was a peaceful life, but it seems like the world is trying its hardest to take that fantasy away from him. But that once again makes his heroism so inspiring, that he would go through hell again just to save another person he cares about. It's not the hand he wanted, but it was the one he was dealt. But as Clancy has taught us, even if the game's rigged against you, you can still find a way to win. The First Lord is one many people, even those who have never played Resident Evil before, know all too well. Alcina Dimitrescu. Lady D, as she's often called, is the owner of this castle along with her daughters, who rule over not just the people of the castle, but those of the village as well. Lady D was the talk of the town in her time, and I'm not just talking about the village. Ever since her reveal trailer and the demo leading up to the release of Resident Evil 8, fans old and new were obsessed. You could not go a few minutes before seeing another piece of fan art of her, or someone just thirsting over her in a tweet. She was the highlight of Resident Evil 8, and likely one of the reasons many people picked up the game. Frankly, the writing was on the wall from the beginning. She's a 9-foot-tall vampire with a dominant personality and curves to match. That's already hitting a ton of people's interest, never mind the scene where she seductively takes Ethan's blood. The thing is, this level of interest in her from the community is incredibly ironic, because that's the entire point. Alcina knows who she is and the power she wields over people. She uses her seduction and charm to coax you into coming into her castle, hoping that you let your guard down just long enough for her to kill you. As a vampire, she needs a fresh supply of blood, and so what better way to get that than playing up the bit? A little seduction here, some teasing there, next thing you know, you're in the cellar getting tortured. But I think that's why her reception fascinates me. It's one of the rare times Resident Evil has used sex appeal in a way that actually works, not just a costume design, but an actual core part of the character, one that works so well. Hell, even Lady D herself would be impressed with the amount of suitors she's made just from this game. But life wasn't always like this for her. According to some notes, Lady D was a noble descendant back in the old days. She actually used to be a singer. A CD in Ethan's home is labeled Miss D and the Paul Boys. She's got nothing on Billie Holiday as far as I'm concerned, but I'm sure her catalog was quite the romp back in the day. At some point in time, she would run into Mother Miranda, and from there her life changed. Mother Miranda has this thing called a Kadao. She would use this to infect Lady D and turn her into who she is today. It's not entirely clear how she feels about it, although judging by her reaction, she seems quite pleased. A diary entry mentions how she is grateful to have been given all that Miranda has bestowed upon her, which is her eternal life, the castle, and even her daughters. Mother Miranda presumably infected 3 girls of her Kadao, which caused them to be made up entirely of flies. What started as a simple fly exiting their body later led to those flies eating the bodies of the girls. The flies then later coalesced to take on a human form, which is what gave rise to the 3 sisters. They later exhibited traits similar to that of Lady D, such as vampirism, but they're also susceptible to cold temperatures, which is why the windows are closed at all times. As for Lady D herself, she has a hereditary blood disease, something that she's had even before becoming who she is now. But because of the Kadao, it's now forced her to ingest human flesh and blood on a regular basis if she wants to continue using her regenerative abilities. Not keeping this in check would not only make her immortal, but also cause her to transform. Something interesting about Lady D though is the castle itself. A maid here at the castle notes how all the staff are women. Given her frequent use of the word man-thing, it seems that she's not too fond of men in her establishment. This would explain the numerous scarecrows, who according to the devs are actually men who've been drained of their blood, although her possible hatred for men is not elaborated on. Especially as there seems to be a few photos of men in the castle, so it's not entirely clear. Whatever the case may be, it seems though men are often taken and drained of their blood. Down here in the wine cellars though are tortured individuals, presumably the staff that disobeyed her, showing us that even the women of the castle feared her. Other notes make mention of her lipstick going missing, something that the staff must remedy, or when they yelled at one of the girls to close the window because of the cold, or when a servant was taken to the cellars because she spilled some soup. They run a tight ship around here, and so I suspect that she has an equal lack of respect for both men and women alike, although it's clear she tolerates one more than the other. Honestly, Lady D does really stand out as one of the better antagonists, not just in Village, but in Resident Evil in general. Personality is a huge reason for why she became so likable. Not just her seductive nature, but the anger she expresses over Ethan killing her daughter, or the posh attitude she has when talking to Heisenberg. Everything from her castle to her outfit to her personality all plays into this archetype of a noble woman who sees everyone as beneath her, one who will always get her way. And what's great about the storytelling here is that much of that is conveyed simply through her actions and the environment. You don't need notes or dialogue to directly tell you, you've likely figured that out from the moment you entered her domain. She's also a bit of a twist on Dracula, but instead of Dracula and his 3 brides, we have Lady D and her 3 daughters. Her overprotective nature as a result of her daughters also plays to the themes of Village as well. Lots of this game is built on the idea of family, actually. Mother Miranda calls her 4 lords her children, never mind her ultimate goal, which we'll get to soon. Lady D didn't have children prior to this, but now that she does, she's willing to do whatever it takes to protect them. That's why she expresses anger over Ethan killing her daughters during her segment. All of this led to Lady D being one of the most fondly remembered characters in the franchise. Back in part 2 when we discussed Resident Evil 6, I mentioned how the team had a particular goal in mind for each campaign. Resident Evil 8 had something similar in mind for its villains. Each one is a combination of a callback to older Resident Evil staples as well as a creature of gothic horror. Lady D is a vampire, so we can check that off the list, but her castle is very much like the Spencer Mansion or the Baker Estate. Her environment was meant to return to the classic style of horror that the series started with. Leon's campaign in Resident Evil 6 was supposed to be the same, and I think now when compared side by side, we can clearly see how one succeeded where the other didn't. Leon's campaign threw lots of old ideas out, but never in a way that made sense. The spike traps in the crypt were horrifying elements, not horrifying design. Resident Evil 8, on the other hand, created a cohesive environment that felt believable within the setting, and then used that as a framework to create the horror. Lady D's wine cellar has more terror than anything mentioned in that campaign, because the notes about the wine being a bestseller, the frequent mention of the staff being punished down here, and her vampiric nature conveys all you need to know. Castle Dimitrescu is easily one of the best parts of Resident Evil 8, but it ain't the very best. That comes after. Donna Beneviento's house is an iconic part of Resident Evil 8's progression, a wonderful example that shows that even 25 years later, Resident Evil still hasn't lost its edge. The walk there already sets the tone for what to expect. On the way there, Ethan runs into Mia. It's clearly an illusion, but how? Why? Entering the house, you're stripped of your gear immediately. The entire basement then becomes a large escape room. Much of the beauty of the Beneviento house comes from how well designed it is, because it's a house that manages to horrify the player and Ethan. For Ethan, this is a personal hellscape. To actually enter her establishment, Ethan must give up his memories, aka using the family photo he's been carrying and put that through the mail slot. He also has to disassemble a mannequin that looks just like Mia in order to find a way out of here. The bandage over the doll and the bloodstains are likely a reminder of what Chris did not too long ago. There was also a painting of a pregnant woman who thinks the string it's attached to looks like it's hanging, a cruder alteration of the pregnant photo of Mia that is within the Winter's home. For the player though, this is standard horror, and it's often considered one of the scariest moments in Resident Evil 8. Part of this is due to how it continually teases you, and yet never follows through. The Beneviento house is all about the fear of the unknown, the sinking feeling that you think something is there only to be continually let down afterwards, giving you a constant feeling of mixed emotions, relief that it wasn't there, but nervousness in knowing that it's just over the horizon. Relinquishing weapons is also an easy way to add horror for a game like this because the player feels naked without their armor there to protect them. But all level long you're waiting for it to happen, ready for the inevitable reveal, only to get nothing. You climb down a creepy unending staircase that would easily flash back a player to Mia's encounter with Ethan last game. You climb down a creepy well with your back to the center, and yet as you slowly turn around, nothing. The reveal that there is literally no enemies in this entire basement is what makes this so effective. It's not about the number of monsters, it's about whether you think there is one. If the team can actively convince you that your life is in danger, then they've succeeded, and they did that without even putting the player in any actual danger. After a while, you start to think that nothing really is down here, and then that's when they get you. The one enemy within this basement is a giant mutated baby who is so large that it takes up the entire hallway, and with no guns to fight back with, it's all about running and hiding. It's such an incredible reveal, and one that is sure to be ingrained in many players' minds. It does end in a rather strange way though. After narrowly escaping the baby, you have to play hide and seek with Angie, Donna's doll. Donna's tale is rather tragic. Mother Miranda took her in at some point, and many of her house were delighted, because Donna was always shy and quiet because of the scar on her face. Her parents' death further pushed her into the realms of depression, sinking even further after the death of her presumed daughter, now only using Angie as a way to communicate. Those of her house loved her, so they didn't question it, although they do worry for her, because it does feel like Angie is taking over Donna in a sense. The Cadao that Miranda gave her was split across the dolls, allowing her to control them from a distance. The design of Donna herself is rather interesting because she wears a dress and veil that obscures her vision. It's almost as if it's symbolically telling us who's in control here. It's a little weird that this section then has you playing hide and seek and then stabbing a doll with scissors, but that doesn't even come close to ruining what is my personal favorite section of Resident Evil 8. It's short, roughly the shortest depending on time spent on puzzles, but it's got such a pronounced feeling of horror in it. Less is more, as they say, and somehow the Beneviento house managed to elicit a greater feeling of horror in one room with one enemy than some of the games in this series have spent all game trying to cultivate. Moreau is the third lord and easily the worst of the four. Lady D's castle was a callback to Resident Evil 1, the Beneviento house was terrifying, and Heisenberg's factory is more focused on action and combat. Moreau is just Moreau, I guess. Much of what makes him unique is his arena. While he may look unimposing, he mutates into a giant fish. The objective is to make your way through his domain while being careful to avoid his attacks. Unfortunately, it's an incredibly easy location. Even on a first run, it's a cakewalk. It's pretty much set up for you not to fail, as there are only a few moments where he can actually kill you, and even then it's just mainly a small walkway. Much of the terror is supposed to come from navigating this area. Moreau will only attack on these wooden rafts, which artificially slow down your movement, so you can't just steamroll through the area. There are some horrifying moments like when he jumps out of the water and you assume he's going to eat you, but it's scripted so it's not like you could really do anything here anyway. All of this is meant to lead to a climactic fight, but it's just like any other boss fight, and by now you've gotten plenty of upgrades of weapons to play around with. Overall, it's a really lackluster section and feels just kind of oddly made from start to finish. Ironically though, this actually fits his lore perfectly. Moreau struggles with self-esteem. He sees himself as inferior and not as good as everyone else. So when Mother Miranda called him his child and gave him a Cadao along with a piece of rose, he was elated to say the least. He tried to make himself useful by implanting the Cadao into many test subjects, but he's had little success. He does at least show some hesitancy in his feelings towards Mother Miranda, because he notices how little she cares for him despite her gifts. He also expresses displeasure in regards to her ultimate goal, as that would mean that Moreau will no longer be useful to her. He is intentionally meant to be portrayed as pathetic. He's the only one who doesn't have a strong affinity to control his Cadao, and Ethan literally gets Rose within seconds of meeting him. He has to beg Ethan not to take her instead of fighting. He is clever enough to act scared because he's trying to lure Ethan into a false sense of security so that he could trap him later, but even that is weak. This section is one of those areas where the chase sequences are almost impossible to fail. It's not scripted like Jill's moments are with the Nemesis, but you have to intentionally stop moving in order to fail here. It's obviously a game design choice to inject some tension into the game, but because of how weak it is, it falls flat. But with the context of Moreau in mind, it actually seems kind of appropriate. Not as tension builders created by the devs, but a pathetic attempt by a villain to subdue Ethan. Outside of that though, Moreau is incredibly forgettable. It's another section without any combat, but it doesn't hit any of the same highs that Donna's did. It doesn't seem like it's meant to be a callback to anything specific from the older games in the franchise, nor does it have anything interesting enough within the levels to set it apart from the others. The final lord is Heisenberg, considered to be the strongest of the four. We've already seen his powers on full display when he stabbed Ethan in the beginning. Heisenberg's rather interesting because it gives us a glimpse into the villain's thoughts on Miranda. Lady D liked Miranda, sometimes believing her to be the favorite child. Donna has no comment on her, and Moreau was devoted to pleasing her. Heisenberg is the opposite. He cannot give a shit about Miranda or any of the other lords. Heisenberg actually wants to meet with Ethan. He initially has no plans to kill him, rather he wants to form an alliance. See, Heisenberg, like the other lords, did not come here by choice. Alcina is mentioned in a note as not being from this village, so it's assumed that the others may be the same. We aren't sure of his past life, but Heisenberg certainly did not plan to be here under Miranda's wing. Especially when it seems like her plan is for Ethan to kill all of them, so Ethan could be a part of Miranda's family. He believes all of this to be a test, and so because of this, he's actually been secretly building an army so he could take her down, and he wants Ethan to be among his ranks. Obviously, he's not going to join him, but the mere fact that he's showing feelings of betrayal is interesting. His diary notes how he hates Miranda for taking away his life, also that she could play family. He also seems to have some level of empathy for the villagers, noting how he only got lucky because he was more attuned to its power. It conveys that this is all one grand experiment to Miranda, and if he's really telling the truth about her plan, then all of them are expendable. That's why he wants to kill her before she could do the same to him. If he can't, then he'll never get his life back in order, and he wants his dignity back. It's a nice subversion, especially as he seemed devoted enough to her in the opening. Clearly this was nothing more than an act. Ever since then, he's been hard at work using his newly built factory to mass produce an army. The factory is one of the more striking locations in Resident Evil 8, even the whole franchise really. It's filled with so much machinery and tech and so many twists and turns that I still get lost whenever I go through here. Environmental storytelling is on full display in this section, with wires and operating tables everywhere. It's got the same vibe as seeing an Umbrella lab for the first time. Experimental tubes, test subjects, and notes that document these procedures are all here, but now under a different context. Down here is also detailed notes and recordings of Heisenberg experimenting on people in order to create his perfect army. Those that are deemed insufficient are often just slaves to his work. The devices on their heads presumably keep them in line. The fight with Heisenberg ends in one of the strangest ways ever, and I guess that's saying something given this franchise. Heisenberg uses his powers of electricity to control metal. For some odd reason, he created a weapon that doesn't adhere to these properties, making it the perfect foil for him. Chris is down here not only planting explosives, but also fixing this thing up. Almost as an apology, he lends Ethan this miniature tank, and then for some odd reason tells him to stay under the radar. I think those cigarettes are getting to him. What do you mean, stay under the radar? How is that even possible at this stage? This then leads into a fight between Ethan and Heisenberg as he transforms into a metal monster. This is also that scene I alluded to in part 2, where Heisenberg calls Chris a boulder-punching asshole. Firstly, I find the idea hilarious that either Chris was so proud of this moment or Sheva thought it was so funny that everyone got told about this, because how does some dude in the middle of Romania know about this? Secondly, it is almost too on the nose to include that line given what we are literally doing in the exact fight that line is set in. I mean, seriously, look at this. This is one of the most absurd things in this franchise. Just as absurd as Chris punching that boulder in the volcano. I don't even know what to say about this. Resident Evil 8 is not as scary as the 7th game, and while there has been some horrifying elements, much of it is a lot like Resident Evil 4, where it's got a lot of shooting and a lot of action. I still think Resident Evil 8 is a good horror game, but discussions around the game's horror often have to contend with the fact that at one point you fight a metal wizard in a miniature tank. But that line about the boulder punching is almost an acknowledgement that they are going too far and that they are definitely doing this just for fun. Not for any other reason, just to wow the player and cap the fight off with the lords in an action-packed way. In that sense, it's almost too stupid that it's somehow looped back around to being genius. The four lords of Resident Evil are a mixed bag both in design and presentation, as well as my personal thoughts on them. Village's lords often feel like a greatest hits collection, a group that resonated with fans of all kinds. It's the exact same thing Capcom tried to do with Resident Evil 6. I think pound for pound, Village comes out on top. Narratively speaking, Village has a much better cast. They're all very unique, and their motivation/devotion to Mother Miranda make each area feel fresh, as if you stepped into another game for a few hours. The biggest problem the team would have to contend with, though, was time, as the four lords not only own a fourth of the land, but also a fourth of the game's playtime. Adding more to one villain means either extending the runtime or causing an imbalance. You don't actually get to see either of these villains that much throughout the game. Once more, I think Lady D is the best of them all. She appears in a few cutscenes that solidify her personality almost immediately. You even come to blows with her a few times, both as a required encounter and just by accident as she walks through the halls. She doesn't have nearly as much of a presence in the castle though as Jack Baker did in the house, which can then make her appear distant despite being the owner of the establishment. This is due to her being an underling and not the main villain. She's already limited by that alone, but then her daughters make up a sizable chunk of your encounters, most of which are just combat, so it does tend to feel a bit wasteful after a while. But still, I think Lady D is a great example of a character who could shine even when not the star. Donna Beneviento's house was a great location, but does warrant an acknowledgement between character and location. As an individual, Donna is insignificant. She rarely appears, rarely speaks, and even Angie does little to pull the weight needed to create an interesting character. But when you expand your thinking outward and look at her whole section, from the walk to the house itself as part of her, then that changes things. It's still one of the most memorable parts of Resident Evil 8, but it's the area as a whole that led me to thinking that. Her presence, her context, her backstory, it helps assist the narrative that the house is building, and it's why it's always been considered my favorite part of the game. It's a prime example of why I focus so much on what I call story-adjacent features in these videos, things that are not a part of the script or the lore, because they all contribute to the story in one way or another, like the horror and how not being terrified can make what are supposed to be terrifying moments in the story lose their impact. Moreau is entirely forgettable and not really worth a mention, but I should at least acknowledge how ironically consistent that is with his lore and how the rest of the family treats him. Heisenberg is fantastic and a nice change of pace, but I always wish to see him more. The factory is great and a nice way to show him off without his presence, just like the Beneviento house, but I still feel as though a few more interactions or talks could have been nice. It could have helped provide more insight into his thoughts. While Ethan would likely disagree with whatever Heisenberg is saying, I think getting the player to agree with Heisenberg for even just a bit would be an interesting dynamic. Overall though, I really do like the Lords of Resident Evil 8. This ensemble cast of villains is a trademark of Resident Evil. While not appearing in every game, a good portion of these games do feature more than one. In fact, since Resident Evil 4, every numbered entry has done so. I still think Resident Evil 7 inches out first for me, but this bond they share as a family, albeit a fractured one, makes their dynamics much more interesting. Resident Evil's familial ties were interesting because they were related. Resident Evil 8's is good for the exact opposite reason, that they aren't biologically related, and at any moment, one of them could off the other. This also makes the real mother of these children even more interesting, as we've only seen one side of her story, one shrouded in bias and devotion. But who is Mother Miranda really? Mother Miranda is the ultimate antagonist of not just Resident Evil 8, but the villain of the Ethan Winters duology. While Resident Evil 8 takes place in the 2020s, Miranda's life would take a turn around the early 1900s. She was one of the many victims of the Spanish flu. Assuming the history is the same, while it's not clear where it originated from, it killed at least 25 million people, although reports indicate that even that is on the low side. Miranda's daughter Ava was killed during this time. She was so stricken with grief that she had wandered into a cave hoping to die. But that's when she came across the mold known as the Megamycete. When Miranda reached out and touched the Megamycete, it gave her knowledge against her will. It was then that she learned that the Megamycete absorbs the consciousness of those who perish within its proximity. She assumed then that Ava's consciousness resides within this mold. She would just need to extract it, and Ava could come back to her. And so her quest to bring back her daughter began. Early tests were showing little results. She created the Cadou to hopefully speed this process up, but that too was unsuccessful. Many of those she experimented on turned into lichens. Those, like the Four Lords, were rare breeds. All this testing was that she could just find a suitable vessel. So in some respects, Heisenberg was right. They were all just being used by Miranda. She didn't uplift them out of the kindness of her heart, she wanted to find a worthy specimen for her daughter. Once that was found, they were of no use to her. Still, she wasn't stupid. She understood the ways of the world well. That's why she kept the Four Lords around, despite not being worthy vessels. For a while, this was her story, one that was more focused on Resident Evil 8, but she later came to infect the rest of the series' history when she met with the Connections. Photos around her lab show her with the Connections, even one with Mia in it as well. It's unclear how she came in contact with them, but they made a trade. She would give them some mold in Ava's DNA, and they would make her daughter. This is what led to Evelyn. Evelyn was supposed to be the vessel for which Ava could return to, but she was deemed a failure as well. This explains why all the E-Series bioweapons were all young girls, because Miranda needed a daughter. But this partnership brings us to our current conflict. As we know from the Baker incident report, the Connections were trying to find Ethan and Mia. Somehow they did, which is how Miranda not only learned of the family, but arose. Rose then became her main goal. She was the perfect vessel for her daughter's return. That's why she kidnapped Mia, ran experiments on her, and then transformed into Mia during the opening chapter. She was trying to steal Rose right from under their nose, but Chris and Co. got to her first. But that's not all Miranda did. Long ago, a traveler came to the village. Her research inspired him. Infecting individuals with organisms was visionary. He believed that through this, he could achieve his ultimate goal. He had seen the world wage two powerful wars, and humanity seemed to be on the cusp of another. Miranda wanted to save one person. This man wanted to save the world. So he left the village, but not before thanking her for everything she taught him, ending by saying that he recently found a way to achieve that goal and that he and his associates started a company in order to facilitate this. The man then signed his name at the bottom of the note. One Oswell E. Spencer. It's all because of Miranda that we're even in this mess today. Everything from the outbreaks to Tricell to Umbrella, all of it comes back to his meeting with Miranda. This is the piece, the one singular piece that brings the Ethan Winters games back into the franchise. This also comes 10 minutes before the credits roll, which will eventually time skip 16 years in the future. Thus, we've created a literal umbrella over the franchise, the beginnings and the ends of this timeline for the foreseeable future, all coming from this game. The question remains though, when is it going to be enough? It shouldn't be too hard to see, but obviously this was not planned in advance. Resident Evil 7? Definitely. Anything before that? Not a chance. This is fine, not everyone is supposed to have a 40-year plan for every game they make. Sometimes things like this happen. But when is it going to be enough? This marks roughly the 4th or 5th time we've reinterpreted this origin. Resident Evil 1 had next to no explanation about what was going on. It wasn't until Resident Evil 1 Remake and Code Veronica where we started seeing some details. Code Veronica introduced Edward Ashford and Oswald Spencer, while also claiming that Progenitor existed before the T-Virus. Remake 1 elaborated on these details a bit more. Zero added Dr. Marcus as one of the core pillars of Umbrella and explained that he was the one who actually created the T-Virus. Resident Evil 5 established Oswald Spencer's origins as eugenics and evolution, only for Resident Evil 8 to explain where Spencer got the idea from. Despite being long dead, this company and its legacy continues to infect Resident Evil to this day. It feels as though we are just retreading old ground to make new things seem more interesting. I don't necessarily blame Resident Evil 8 because the Ethan Winters games needed that connective tissue, and what better way to do it than this. I'm just worried that it's going to set a precedent, that Resident Evil is still hung up on the past, and that it's going to continually reinterpret this franchise's origin any chance it gets. I mean, even right here in the notes, we learn that Spencer got the inspiration for the Umbrella logo because of a design they saw in a cave, one that Miranda seems to have enjoyed as well, as that's a logo for the houses. Who's to say that in Resident Evil 9 or beyond we learn that the logo is from another super secret organization, one that's even more ancient than Miranda. There's already another note in this game written by a knight presumably from the old Round Table days, so it's not exactly a completely made up fantasy. But doing this would then just lead them down the very same path they were on in the early era. I don't mind this lore. I don't mind the reveal. I don't mind any of it. I think it's fine. It does make me wonder about the future of this franchise and if we're going to start seeing more and more villains suddenly have more connections to older events, continually tethering us back to those old days as we try to break out in search of something new. Because this not only affects the story it's present in, but all the others before it. If Spencer was really worried about dying of old age, why didn't he reach out to Miranda? She's never mentioned in any of the notes written in Resident Evil 5. Why is Bailey, Spencer's right-hand man, not mentioned in any other material but Resident Evil 8? Wesker's role in the story has changed so much over the years. To the guy who paid the price for his own hubris in Resident Evil 1, to his death being practically planned in a sense in Chronicles, then being a test subject by Oswald Spencer in Resident Evil 5. Then we also have the problems I outlined in Zero. Zero tried to create an origin tale, but rarely did it ever touch upon that origin, and anything it did try to show off, like Dr. Marcus or the leeches or the T-Virus, were either forgotten to time or just changed later. Resident Evil 5 makes no mention of these events and instead flips the script on it being about human evolution, not money, only for Resident Evil 8 to add more weight atop that statement with Miranda. Look, like I said before, we all know that no one can plan for a story like this, so it's understandable why Miranda was never mentioned in the series so far, but it does make you think about the older events in a new light. That's the difficulty with doing storytelling for such a large franchise. Every single morsel of story needs to be considered if you're going to do it right, and that just gets harder and harder as time moves on. I think the intent was to bring Resident Evil 7 and 8 back into the franchise because of how distant Resident Evil 7 was from the rest, so they needed to make the connection be deeply ingrained in not only its own story but the rest of the franchise. It's a fine twist for what it's worth, but it implies that the storytelling is more focused on the here and now, with no recognition or acknowledgement of what it could do to previous games. Because who's to say that this too won't be changed in the future, and that some other group were actually the owners of the Umbrella logo? Or maybe that Raccoon City was orchestrated by someone else who has nothing to do with Birkin or Umbrella. Only time will tell, I suppose. Still, as it pertains to this duology, I think the twists and hints outlined in both games create a wonderful connection between the two, and is why Miranda is the ultimate antagonist for this branch of the franchise. More than anything, the Winters games have been defined by family. Ethan saving his wife, Ethan saving his daughter, Miranda wanting her daughter back, Jack wanting his family back. Then there are the actual families, the Bakers, the Winters, the Dimitrescu's, the Lords, and Mother Miranda. Family has been a huge component to the story of these two games, and it's something none of the other games have had yet. They've all had stories in the most basic definition of the term, but none have so carefully connected all of its pieces together and then established an actual theme. But even then, it not only establishes one, it runs with it. Resident Evil 5 and 6 flirted with the idea of autonomy and having life taken from you, but it rarely does anything with it. These games not only establish a host of families, but also pit them against each other, showing off their faults, their strengths, their bonds, all the parts a family has. The Bakers were a happy family, but their only crime was being too kind to outsiders. Evelyn was just a child looking to find a family, but having never understood compassion and kindness, she made a family the only way she knew how, and used the kind heart of the Bakers as a means to get her way. Miranda lost her daughter, the only family she's ever had. She did make her own family, the four lords of the village, but in her quest to get her real family back, she never cared for the new family she created. This led to neglect and the forced implantation of the Cadal. She took their old lives away from them, and while for some it was for the better, it was not the same for everyone. Like the connections to Evelyn or Evelyn to the Bakers, Miranda merely saw the lords and the people of the village as tools, stepping stones on her way to achieve her true goal. But family is complicated. It's not always nice, but it ain't always bad either. Lady D cares for her daughters a lot, enough to torture staff that open a window to let the cold in, but there's at least some motherly love in there, bloody as it may be. Well, the Winters are two people who love each other, but only because one keeps hiding her secrets from the other. Like I said, family's complicated, because it doesn't just mean blood-related, and it doesn't always mean safety and warmth. It's just as complicated as any other relationship out there, be it with friends or a significant other, because these people are still human. And we as humans are complex people. We all have emotions, feelings, beliefs, values, convictions, and all of that is tested every day. I think more than any game in the series, Resident Evil 7 and 8 show humanity in its purest form. What happens when families fall apart both by choice and not, and how new relationships can lead to paths both rough and smooth. All of this then leads to the final confrontation between two people, Ethan and Miranda, who when you boil it down, are really just two people who want the same thing. After the four lords have been killed, Mother Miranda finally appears before Ethan. She tells him of her plan, but in having united the flasks and dealt with the lords, his purpose has run out. So she disposes of him by ripping out his heart. While this would be the end of Ethan as we know him, he's not exactly normal. He wakes up on the cold winter snow and sees Evelyn. She tells it to him straight. He's dead. He's always been dead. But Mother Miranda never killed him. Jack Baker did. After defeating Mia the night Ethan entered the estate, Jack knocked him out cold. It was assumed that he was dragged to the house and stitched up, but Jack actually killed him. The mold is what saved him. Ethan is, and always has been, a mold monster. Now you could have actually seen this coming a mile away. Firstly, Ethan gets his hand cut off twice, once in Resident Evil 7 by Mia, and another by Lady D. He later remedies this pain by either getting it stapled together or using that first aid juice. It became a kind of community meme within the franchise due to how absurd it was, so you'd be forgiven for just assuming that it was Capcom being absurd again. But this was his mold powers in action. Further, in Resident Evil 8, Heisenberg makes note of Ethan's weird body. Lady D calls his blood stale because it's probably mixed with mold. But you honestly could have figured this out from just Resident Evil 7. The biggest hint was the hallucinations. It was mentioned in a note that Evelyn only manifests to those infected by mold. She starts as a hallucination before taking over their minds. Ethan sees her plenty of times throughout the game, confirming that he's always had mold in him. The game also replays the older scene of Mia cutting his hand off with a chainsaw, except Evelyn is watching. While it does come off as a hallucination, I think this is genuinely what happened, because Mia flips as soon as Evelyn talks to her. So she was likely here the whole time the scene was actually taking place. All of this was supposed to clue you in on the fact that the man's been dead for years, not just a body of black mold. Mia, once again, already knew this, which is interesting because not even Chris knew. This is yet another lie she has never told Ethan, and unfortunately, would be one that she never gets to tell him. As when he wakes up, it's on to the final fight with Miranda. While this is happening, Chris and the Hound Wolf squad have started their operation. They clear out the village and blow up the Mega Mycete down in the cave where Miranda went to die. In the meantime, Ethan fights Miranda. He gets some help from Chris's squad, but Ethan is the one who puts her down in the end. But with Ethan being made of mold and Chris having destroyed the source of the mold, his body starts to crumble like everything else. Capcom then intentionally tries to hide Ethan's face for some reason before he takes the detonator Chris carried with him and blows it all away, taking Miranda and the Mega My seat with him, while Chris, Mia, Rose, and the others all flee to safety. Despite his best efforts, that's another one dead thanks to Chris. Can't imagine how he feels at this point. Worse, I can't imagine how Ethan feels. Ethan went through hell to save his wife, and when he was finally ready to get his life back, he had to step up and save his daughter. His past crept back into his life even when he tried to leave it behind, showing us that he never truly left that day. And now with the new information about his body, technically he never did. This evolution of Ethan's is one of the reasons why he's become one of my favorites. I have to appreciate Capcom's willingness to kill him off. Killing off a main character like this for Capcom is rare. It shows that they're not always keen on giving them plot armor. I have a certain amount of respect for developers who know just when it's time to move on. I think it's all too common to have characters continually survive because they're afraid to kill them off. To be fair, I could see why. You work on these characters for years, you start to grow attached to these characters. They start to take on a life of their own now. It's hard to actually end their story because the devs like the fans want to see more of them, and nobody wants to see them die. I think that's a sign of good fiction, when you can actually feel attached to a character, making them feel real even if they're just pixels on a screen. While Resident Evil 5 was my first attempt at playing Resident Evil, because of how young and scared I was of that game, I never got around to beating it. I drifted away from the series for years until Resident Evil 7. Since then, I went back and played some classics, and then of course for this video I played the other ones I could get my hands on. Resident Evil 7 was my gateway into Resident Evil, and so I was attached to Ethan as a character long before I felt that same attachment with Chris and Leon. So it sucks that I had to see him go so soon, as it felt like we just met, but I recognized that his time was up. He was not only a great protagonist, he even served as a great side character in Chris's journey, as this failure is going to continue to push him deeper into his pits of despair, especially after what he learns right after this. As Chris gets into the chopper, the squad explains some of their findings. During Chris's mission, there was a cutscene that showed us that the BSAA was here and looking to take down the Mega My seat. Chris didn't trust them, and well, now he has ample reason not to, as it was not soldiers they sent in, but BOWs. The organization dedicated to stopping bioterrorism is now using the enemy's weapons against them. With that in mind, Chris rounds up the squad and heads to yet another European HQ, this time the BSAA's. However, while I would love to be proven wrong in the future, if Code Veronica has taught me anything, it's that Chris will never follow up on this. And if Resident Evil has taught me anything, it's that this will never be mentioned again. Resident Evil 8 is just as good of a game to me as Resident Evil 7. I mean, come on. You don't play this game 8, now 9 times, and not come out liking it at least a little bit. I've played this game time and again, and is one of the few Resident Evil games where I've actually completed the challenge shop and the achievements, at least in regards to main story content. While I think Resident Evil 7 is better, I think Resident Evil 8 is good for different reasons. It mimics my feelings on both Resident Evil 1 Remake and RE4. If I ever play Resident Evil 1 again, it'll be for the story, the atmosphere, and the vibe of the mansion. Whenever I pick up Resident Evil 4 these days, it's for the gameplay. The story acts as a way to justify my actions through gameplay. Resident Evil 7 and 8 are much the same to me now. I come to Resident Evil 7 for the Baker House, the environmental storytelling, and the characters. I come to Resident Evil 8 for the gameplay. That's why I've completed the game 9 times now, once even with a knife. Now that isn't to say the story of Resident Evil 8 is bad, not at all, but both games provide different experiences for me now. Ironically, this connection I drew seemed rather intentional. It's no secret that Resident Evil 7 and 8 are modern reimaginings of Resident Evils 1 and 4. You got the Baker Estate and the Spencer Mansion. Both games have enemies that don't drop items, which de-incentivizes killing. Both games are also more focused on horror over action. Inversely, Resident Evil 4 and 8 were more about action. Both games have a merchant that offers up upgrades and rewards, and the iconic village openers in both games. They were clearly inspired by these older games, and given where the franchise was pre-Resident Evil 7, it makes sense where they would try to emulate the success of the two most influential titles in their franchise. But that isn't to say that that's all these games are. While they are cut from the same cloth, they got different brand names on the packaging, enough to make them stand out as their own titles. And a lot of that has to do with Ethan. If I could, I would take 30 years worth of games with just him. But as they say, sometimes in life, if you love something, it's best to let it go. Flowers can be loved from a distance or examined up close, but taking it with you by removing it from the stem would kill it. So in that sense, it's best to let Ethan go, as while the father's story is over, that doesn't necessarily mean that the rest of the family's is, as Ethan's own flower is ready to blossom. Shadow of Rose continues the Winters family saga with, you guessed it, Rose. It takes place 16 years after the events of Resident Evil 8, making it the latest entry in the timeline so far, even past RE9, assuming its date is lined up with its release date like the past two games. I can now see why parents are always so emotional over their kids growing up. You know, it felt like just yesterday I had to reassemble your limbs back together. And look at you now. They grow up so fast, man. But Rose sometimes wishes she never grew up. As a part of her birth, and likely the mold, she got superpowers. She's been under the watchful eye of the government and Chris, who's now turned into her official guardian. Not even Mia sees her much these days. But as a kid, Rose struggled quite a bit in school. Others made fun of her powers because they saw the white lines on her hand and assumed that she was sweating profusely. She's never managed to make any friends because of this, and so she wants the powers gone. When we start the game, she meets with K9, one of the Hound Wolf Squad. She assumes that this meeting is to recruit her to the squad, showing us that even this deep in the timeline, Chris at the ripe age of like 60 is still doing this. K9 actually came here to talk to her because he has something to show her, something that could remove her powers. Inside his lab is a fragment of the Megamycete they took from the village for study. As we know, the Megamycete is a collective consciousness that absorbs the memories of those it affects. If Rose can somehow tap into this, she may be able to enter and find an item called the Purifying Crystal, which should take away her powers. Of course, everything goes wrong pretty quickly, as she not only finds dozens of copies of herself, but also weird-looking monsters that are out to kill her. So she'll have to work out how to solve the mystery of the Purifying Crystal without becoming another one of her clones. The DLC is quite interesting to say the least. It's in third person this time, which is a nice, albeit familiar twist, but the story is about Rose coming to terms with her powers. It's a very typical story trope, about how someone ends up hating something about themselves only to accept it as a part of them in the end. But it's a trope for a reason, and it's used well here. Something cool about this DLC is how it takes this story beat about Rose's powers and actually shows you that through gameplay. The DLC is really frugal on ammo and items. It's recommended you either pick your shots carefully or not shoot at all. To help balance this, Rose can use her powers. She can use them defensively like we've seen in previous titles, but you can also slow their movements down, giving her a chance to walk past or line up a headshot. I really appreciate the attempt at bridging the gap between story and gameplay here. There are moments where Rose has to use her powers to knock out these nodes in order to progress. These could have been used as a literary tool by saying, see, she couldn't have escaped without using her powers. She does need them. But then there would be that disconnect between how the player feels about them and how Rose does. So by limiting resources, you're forced to rely on those very same powers Rose is here to remove, leaving you to wonder if it's really worth getting rid of them in the end. Like the Beneviento house though, much of the DLC is centered around Rose. Characters and environments are reflective of her life out in the real world, but likely exaggerated to amplify the intended feeling. There is a mannequin of Mia who stalks Rose, meant to represent the watchful eyes of her mother, but I can't really imagine this was actually Mia. So it could either be reflective of the government and how they keep a tight leash on her, or maybe how she thinks her mother sees her, as nearly everyone else sees her this way. This DLC really is at its best when it gets weird. This is supposed to be a collection of memories, so it's not going to make any sense. The castle being just about the same is fine, but the room where Rose is now incredibly tiny, that's the kind of stuff I'm looking for. Interestingly, the DLC even makes the Beneviento house scary again, even though it uses the exact same jump scare. Like Ethan's trip through it, the Beneviento house is a personal hellscape just for Rose. It's not her mother on the table though. Mr. Monkey's got a tummy ache. And well, duh, obviously we're gonna help Mr. Monkey. The house uses stuff from her childhood and younger years to remind her of her old life. As both the method of horror and storytelling, we get a glimpse into Rose's past by way of these doll sets. You have to assemble the other dolls correctly to accurately portray a scene that very likely happened when Rose was little. She'll later have to escape a few living dolls who hurl insults at her. Their sharp words and sharper knives are representative of the kids from her school and how they were mean to her. The most nerve-wracking part though, they save for the end. That very same mannequin of Mia that was previously idly standing in the hallway is now given form. In what is one of my least favorite horror tropes, only because it terrifies me every time it's used, the mannequins of Mia only move when you aren't looking. You need to keep a watchful eye on them, otherwise Mom's gonna grab her. What's even more interesting about this though is figuring out who the perpetrator is. For Ethan, it was Donna. Well, what about Rose? Well, that would be her lesser sister, Evelyn. Evelyn's mind is obviously a part of the mold too, and she's pissed at Rose. Evelyn was the one who was supposed to have a family. She not only lost them, but Rose was considered a better successor to Evelyn because of her powers. One of the government agents even jokes about this in the ending. So safe to say Evelyn's not too happy to see her better half walking around here. But as you can tell, this is clearly no place for a 16-year-old girl, especially one who likely has no combat training and is just trying to live a normal life. So to help her out, Rose ends up being saved by a literal guardian angel named Michael. Now it really shouldn't come as a surprise to learn that Michael is Ethan. Ethan was part mold, so his memories are here too. Ethan here serves as a helping hand, guiding Rose towards new objectives, summoning new items, or just being there to talk. This creates such an interesting dynamic for the DLC. Ethan never got to see his daughter grow up, and Rose never saw her father, so the two are learning about each other at the same time, although she is still unaware this is her father. The game then cleverly takes the opportunity to establish this bond between them by having Rose sink further into the consciousness of the Mega Mycete, landing her right inside the home of the Winters. Within the houses are memories of Ethan, not only letting her hear her dad's voice for the first time, but also hear his thoughts on her when she was a baby. Understandably, it gets pretty emotional here, especially when she reads Ethan's note, which he wrote to her on her first half birthday. It was a promise from him to her that he would be there for her forever to make sure she's safe and loved every day of her life. Well, clearly that never came to pass. Ethan died before he could ever make good on those promises. That note contains within it an alternate reality, one where the Winters became the happy family they wanted to be, not pawns in someone else's game. And unfortunately, this game still has yet to finish. As when Rose finally gets the crystal, she's greeted by none other than Mother Miranda. According to the notes left behind by her, she's been in here the whole time plotting this. So because of how the Mega Mycete works, it's not entirely clear if this is the Miranda, like the one from the base game, or just another Mother Miranda with her same memories, thus making her technically the same. Like how Alex Wesker and the Wesker in the mind of Natalia are technically the same person, but not the same Wesker. But before we start having to dig up Aristotle for the answer to this philosophical question, I'll just continue on. Miranda will inside the Mega Mycete begin to document this new world as it too has its own laws. She learned that the memories here are not necessarily reality, and that those who are attuned to the mold's power can retain their faculties, thus why she is able to move around. Alive and back in action, she then gets back to work, as Ava's memories are still in here. So she's been experimenting with reviving the consciousnesses of individuals stored within the Mega Mycete. Through some testing, she was able to literally birth someone from within this realm. Using this, she looked into duplicating Rose, assuming that if she can't get the real one, she can always just make her own. That's why there are hundreds of Rose copies in this place. The reason why they keep getting killed and why the Duke is here is because despite being copies, they were not good enough. But through testing, she found that certain stimuli, mainly fear, could provoke a reaction, enough to manifest her powers. So she created the Duke as a way to stress test the Roses in order to get more data and hopefully find a suitable host for Ava. Having failed in this too, she was left with no other choice. She was able to manifest outside the Mega Mycete. How is unclear, but she played the role of Kay and lured Rose into coming to her by connecting with the Mega Mycete fragment. That purifying crystal was not technically a way to get rid of her powers. It is, but it was also so Miranda could subdue Rose easier. But Miranda's arch-nemesis is here to save the day once again. While Ethan holds off Mother Miranda, he instructs her to leave and live the normal life she wanted. Not wanting to see her father die and so desperately wanting to talk to him again, she smashes the crystal and gains them back. Oh yeah, it's a fight to the death between two BOWs. You even get a sick dodge to go with it. But powers be damned, and nothing can beat the raw strength of a gun. The Founding Fathers are definitely smiling right now as Rose peppers Miranda with bullets and kills her just like her old man did. She then gets one final talk with her father as Capcom continually insists on never showing his face. I'm almost inclined to say that this actually ruins the scene if it wasn't so damn emotional. With renewed purpose and a deeper understanding and love for her father, Rose carries on with her powers intact, while she wears her dad's ring and jacket, knowing that he will always be with her wherever she goes. Shadow Rose is actually a pretty good DLC. It jumps the shark with some of its fantastical elements, but you learn to roll with the punches sometimes after playing so many of these games. Plus, it's a DLC that's meant to get weird, so at least the warning was on the box. Still, it's a nice DLC and a nice way to close out this part of the story. The main game ended with this final scene at the cemetery as well, which was a nice touch, but with it being so far in the future, it was unclear what would happen next here. Because Resident Evil 8 ended with the idea that the father's story was over, implying that the daughter's was soon to come. We saw that in this DLC. But not only does it seem like this was supposed to close the book on the Winters family saga for good, even if it isn't finished, we likely won't see Rose for quite some time. So it's good that we got this in here while we had the chance. You probably noticed by now that this video has been rather split between remake and original work, but that's just how this era goes. Create something new, remake something old. While fatigue is certainly something that could be argued, you cannot deny the quality. Despite some criticisms here and there, this era of Resident Evil has been a great success. All of the games so far being considered commercially and critically successful, not something that could be said for the previous era, especially as we got deeper into it. While its status as a era-defining horror game was already re-established games ago, Capcom wanted to make sure it never had a chance to fall atop its high balcony again. So it was on a regular day in 2021 when Capcom said, let's make a few $100 million. And so development on Resident Evil 4 Remake began. 4 Remake borrows a lot of its systems and style from the previous remakes, but as is often the case, lots of changes were made. And when it comes to Resident Evil 4's story, well, let's just say change is most definitely welcome. It's apparent right from the get-go that Capcom wants to tell a much more serious game this time. The intro of the original was used as a way to break down the events of the past games to get the players up to speed. 4 Remake does the same, but it tells it from a much more personal perspective, where Leon talks about the hardships of that night and how the cop and him died that day. Now that we've got like 20 years of hindsight, the remake also makes sure to mention that Leon was asked, in quotes, to join a government program, something we got confirmation of in the Chronicles games. It's a great example of these remakes simplifying the timeline a bit so as to not make a mess of things by just outright mentioning stuff. Unlike the original games, where info is found in all kinds of different supplemental material, thus making it hard to piece everything together. Case in point, the following scene shows Leon and Krauser training, already making an attempt to establish their bond and tease Operation Javier. It then ends with Leon talking about people like Ada, Kendo, and Marvin, people who died that day and never got to see tomorrow. He laments on how things need to be different, referring to his own actions, so it's clear that the guilt and horror of that night haunt him, a stark contrast to one-liner Leon from 2 decades ago. Now that isn't to say cocky Leon is gone for good, he's just as cheesy as he was before. Some of his classics have been removed, especially my favorite one, but in its wake we do have a few new ones. His single greatest moment is when he backflips off a wall to avoid some chainsaws. So it's clear that the team wanted to keep some of that old identity of his, but they didn't want it to overshadow the dramatic and heartfelt story. In doing so, the script is taking itself a lot more serious this time. The intro was one such example. As Leon arrives back in the village, one of the officers disappears and never comes back. You get a brief investigative sequence where you search the house, meet the locals, kill them, find the corpse of the officer, only to then be attacked by the very same guy Leon head-kicked into oblivion minutes earlier. Keeping in line with some of the games in this entry, Resident Evil 4 Remake also has stealth again. Interestingly though, you can actually get through numerous areas in this game purely through stealth. I think the intent was to not just deliver something fresh and exciting for the franchise, but also connect it well to Leon's mission. He is outnumbered in a village he knows nothing about. Walking in guns blazing would not be the right approach here. In this environment, he'll have to take every advantage he can get. Stealth, though, is a natural extension of horror, seen in almost every facet of its design, even something as simple as the lump in your throat rising as you get closer to an enemy, hoping that it doesn't turn around. Horror is the key focus here, and it's something Resident Evil 4 didn't exactly lack, but there was much more focus on action back in those days, so the scales are weighed differently. 4 Remake keeps the action that made the game great in the first place, but also ramps up the horror in small but incredibly impactful ways. The very first scene before we even get to Leon's monologue is of a woman being sacrificed. It establishes the ferocity of the cult right from go. Another notable moment was during Krauser's fight. After he mutates, you're sent into this small cave area. It's got tight walls and no light. It not only emphasizes the battlefield aesthetic the fight is designed around, but also makes for a rather terrifying section. There are also little things the remake has changed that aren't exactly large sweeping changes like the atmosphere or the gameplay, but are essential pieces to the puzzle. Codec calls are now in-game and no longer stop the flow of gameplay. The merchant not only has more dialogue, but he also offers up more missions for the player to reap rewards from. The original, by contrast, only had those blue medallions. It's emblematic of the kind of design ethos that Capcom has when it comes to their remakes. Remedy the issues while simultaneously augmenting what worked in the first place. But as is often the case with these remakes, the biggest change comes not from the gameplay, but from the story. The cast of Resident Evil 4 has seen quite the overhaul now that Capcom is focused on telling more deeply personal stories filled with lots of lore files. Although Ada is still Ada, unfortunately. Her role as a spy who refused to answer questions is still alive and well even 20 years later. We'll have much more to say about her when we return to separate ways. Similarly, Leon and Ashley's relationship is not so different when compared to the original. Leon still saves Ashley from time to time while Ashley herself plays the damsel, but the remake does go to great lengths to actually expand on this more. Firstly, she no longer needs to be caught when jumping off small heights. Ashley is now fully capable of moving on her own and operating in a self-preserving way. While most of the original Ashley's dialogue was screaming or crying for help, remake Ashley actually converses with Leon. A symptom of modern games these days is how the characters will always have something to say for every single action they take. Even something as simple as noting how a door is locked after having clearly pushed up against it, as if it could be anything else. But a benefit of this is that Ashley talks more. She'll comment about Leon's combat, ask to be warned next time he throws a grenade, and she'll make remarks about the villagers. Speaking more specifically, one of the stranger moments within the original was when Ashley started to cough, a symptom of the Plaga parasite inside her. Leon goes to console her, but she gets angry and runs away, putting her back perfectly next to a trap that takes her away. It felt so out of place and was so clearly designed to be an excuse to just get the player to find Ashley again. Remake handles this in a much more realistic and believable way. In 4 Remake, Sadler actually uses his mind control powers on Ashley and Leon by directly speaking to them. Later, as the Plaga progresses, Sadler briefly overtakes Ashley, stabs Leon, and then threatens to kill her if Leon makes a move. After she regains control, Ashley panics and takes off. He finds her later after the maze section, where she is terrified of what will happen if she loses control again. She obviously does not want Leon to die, especially by her hands, which is why she ran. It's a much more believable scenario. Another key part of her overhaul is also making Ashley pull her weight more by changing the context of established scenarios. Luis and Leon are ambushed at the village again and prepare defenses inside the house. Originally, Ashley was locked inside a closet so the boys could do their work. The idea here is the same, but the fight ends not from the villagers giving up, but by having Ashley find them a way out. Later during Ashley's section, rather than have her navigate to Leon on her own by unlocking a door, this time she works to unlock Leon's cage when it falls on him. It's the same premise, but the context here changes the feeling of the scene. Her playable section is also just better in every way, and it really plays into this new level of horror the franchise has had recently. Resident Evil 4 created a nice bond between the player and Ashley through the use of gameplay, and the many encounters you would get up to. Remake takes this a step further. When Leon jumps out of the burning barn after fighting Chief Mendez, she pats away the embers and helps him up. Later she'll also somehow get Leon on this chair after he passes out from the Plaga. This, coupled with the numerous heights that can't be reached without her, or the levers that have to be held by her while Leon circles around, gives her much more agency in the plot, making her feel less like a liability and more like a partner. While the bond was always there, it felt deeper here in Remake. It also shows just how much Leon cares about her, more than he even did before. Ashley coughs occasionally during the game, even when just exploring, a constant reminder that you are on a timer, but he periodically asks her how she's feeling, a nice way to show that he's still looking out for her. When you first fight the Garrador, Ashley makes a comment about the noise down in the dungeon, asking if they keep animals down there. And what I assume is in an effort to not scare her, he mentions after the fight that they do indeed keep animals down there, likely because the truth would be way too scary to explain. After escaping a brief encounter with the Big Cheese, Leon tells Ashley to run no matter what. Chief Mendez is here for Ashley, so she needs to get away from him, while Leon stays back and takes him out, thus putting his life before hers. When found on the island, Leon also injects her with some of the suppressant fluid to quell the effects of the Plaga. He not only gave this to her instead of himself, but he also sits next to her the whole time until she wakes up. Speaking of putting her life first though, Ashley is actually the one to get the parasite removed as opposed to the original, though context is important. The parasite was growing and time was running out, but they were both capable of basic movement, and the equipment was so older that the procedure may have killed them. So Leon went first just in case it failed. In the remake, they are so far gone that Ashley is barely conscious and Leon is seeing things, so they have little time to waste, which is why Ashley goes first. Leon putting her before himself is consistent across both iterations, it's just the context that's changed. This moment also harkens back to a comment he made during the beginning of the game. His past with Raccoon City still haunts him. Seeing all the people he failed to save weighs on him deeply. Seeing her almost die before his eyes, he yells out, "This has to be different." Leon is a deeply traumatized individual who has seen hell on earth time and again. You recall our discussion on Resident Evil 6 where one of the notes mentions his frequent thoughts of death. He was a heavy drinker even before Raccoon City, and I believe some of the animated movies carry that over too. Hell even still carries Marvin's knife with him to this day. As great as it is to play as the original Leon, the remake iteration makes much more sense when looking towards the future, and it's a characterization that I think best suits him. But Leon's bond with Ashley wasn't the only thing the team enhanced, they also deepened his bond with Luis as well. Firstly, they call him Luis in this game, so that's a start. Only Wesker calls him Louis, but given he's an asshole, I actually say that's rather in character for him. He meets Luis in much the same way as before. Leon wanted some answers from Luis, but he escaped before he could ask. Huntington then ran a background check on Luis to see if he could find something for him. This is when the remake establishes new lore, which that Luis was a former researcher for Umbrella. In fact, he was not just an Umbrella researcher, but a part of European Labs Team 6. They are notable for helping create the Nemesis, which explains why the Nemesis was able to create Plaga like Infected. After Umbrella went under, the staff was rounded up by the government, but it seems as though Luis had escaped back to his hometown. As he is former Umbrella though, Luis has much to answer for. He has little time to explain given the ambush, nor does he actually want to explain, but it's a nice way that makes it believable, unlike his original appearance. His extensive knowledge though also gives Capcom a way to explain some lore through him, such as the existence of the Lost Plagas. Like before, he'll disappear for a while before returning with the medicine, but he doesn't actually lose it this time. There's also a whole section where Luis and Leon travel together. The dual El Gigante fight, the mines and the minecart ride, all sections that used to be done by Leon now have Luis in them. It strengthens the bond between the player and Luis by giving him more screen time since they only have so much before he goes. It's during this time where Luis also admits why he's doing all this in the first place, which, as we know, was to make amends for the research he did. But given his new and improved personality and his backstory as ex-Umbrella, it makes his reasoning feel more believable. I actually felt something when he died this time, even though I knew it was coming. Leon also lighting his last cig was the cherry on top to the whole scene, especially since he made a comment on his smoking when they first met. I think what serves to heighten this feeling of loss here with Luis is that rather than be put down by Sadler, he was unexpectedly killed by Krauser. So it serves as both a closing and an introduction within the act itself, being how we transition from one character to the next. 4 Remake starts by immediately establishing the seniority and respect that Krauser has. An iconic line of Leon's in both games is when he uses a knife on Ada, claiming that it's better for close encounters. Remake reminds Leon of this when facing Krauser, who pulled out his knife faster than Leon could wield his gun. As this is the 2020s, QTEs are also a thing of the past, and thanks to the evolution of the knife in this game, Leon's initial fight with Krauser is much more interactive. While the QTEs of the time made it much more cinematic, there is something about letting the player do it themselves that's lost in translation there. All the mistakes and successes are entirely your own, thus making each fight personal. And frankly, this is just one of the many changes Krauser's received. While a single piece of info in this remake would put him light years ahead of his original iteration, the team went above and beyond and actually established who the hell he is. Rather than work for Wesker as a third party, Krauser is actually on his own. He came to Sadler and the cult for the purposes of power. Operation Javier is not only mentioned via the in-game dialogue, but numerous items like a report about the mission and the many dog tags of his comrades can be found in a tent. 4 Remake reinterprets the events of Operation Javier through the in-game notes, saying that in this timeline, Krauser was with a team of soldiers. All of them had died during the mission except for him. But Krauser was assumed to have died back then, since a chopper was never sent to extract him. The US government left him to die just like his men. Info regarding the event was then kept under wraps, and a journalist was killed trying to expose the truth. So the government clearly does not want their failure to be leaked to the public. Because of their failure to act and willingness to hide the truth, Krauser abandoned all hope in the country and sought his own goals. His pursuit of ultimate power led him to meeting Sadler, who welcomed him to the cult. This new motivation behind joining Sadler also makes his ultimate lust for power far more logical. Getting the Plaga implanted into him was just a way for him to get more power. In-game notes also clarify that he supplied Sadler's people with the guns they used due to his connections. Krauser likely cares very little for the religious side of this whole ordeal, he only really cares about the power, and the Plaga can help him achieve that. All of this serves to make his final fight much more rewarding. As mentioned earlier, while the aesthetic of this being a battleground for 2 warriors to test their mettle against each other was always present, the extra lore details add value to the fight, making it feel more special and important. It also plays on the classic trope of the student surpassing the master. Krauser taught Leon all he knew, from CQC to survival, but now it's time for the student to graduate and carry on these lessons into the future. Krauser was a man deeply burdened by the weight of his comrade's death, disillusioned by the state of the federal government. He lost his way during Operation Javier, and it led him down a path of destruction, where he felt that the only way to honor his men was to take it out on the people who betrayed them. All of this, compared to just a few lines, where Krauser supposedly faked his death, and the claim that he used to be a good guy. So far, the updated story elements have been a net positive for the remake. Not a high bar to cross given the source material, but it's praiseworthy nonetheless. But that isn't to say they pass with flying colors, as what's even more fascinating about these changes to the cast is how they somehow did an inverse on the original, wherein the villains are actually the weakest of the bunch. Chief Mendez gets the least amount of attention in-game, just like in the original. In fact, his presence is about as same as before, so not much to discuss there. Salazar and Sadler on the other end have some changes, but not in the way I think benefits them. Salazar shows up right on cue as Ashley and Leon enter the castle. He'll then reappear a second time as Salazar gets ready for her ritual. This is when Leon would fall through the hole and eventually fight the Verdugo just like before. Then next we meet Salazar, it's his boss fight. His presence is just lacking, rarely ever showing up and then not doing anything of note within those cutscenes. He's just a villainous guy now, with nothing that makes him notable. Sadler is also by far the worst defender of this. Sadler no longer makes appearances in person, not until the very end when Ashley and Leon meet with him near the Amber. For context, in about an hour from now, the game is going to end, so a little late to be doing this for your main villain. They circumvented this issue by using those aforementioned mind control powers. Now Sadler can just randomly appear in Leon's head to talk to him, but it's mainly just cult gibberish and nothing substantial. This is a part of a larger effort to twist Sadler's motives. In the original, I made note of how Sadler had a deep hatred for the United States that ran deeper than it seemed. I also noted how such a thing was untouched by Capcom, likely given its political nature. Seeing as Capcom didn't want to go down that route with their games, they opted to remove the mention of this entirely. The only mention of the US comes from Salazar, who mentions it in the same way most villains would, in the sense that it's Leon's home country, not some place they have a particular beef with. Krauser is arguably the one who has an actual genuine hatred for the country given his backstory. While I would have liked to see part of this backstory developed and examined, I can also understand that this was the best choice for Capcom given how they write their stories. So rather than make Sadler be someone who uses his power on his enemies, the remake has now made him a religious zealot. A man who fully believes in the faith of the Los Illuminados and the Las Plagas. Personally, I think it's a fine direction to take him, but with him having finally been introduced in the 11th hour, and having a motivation that is simply just to spread the Plaga, it makes me question how much Capcom has learned from its past eras. Makes me long for the days when beauty was still the #1 priority. For all of its advancements in storytelling, we're still falling back on tired old tropes of ruling the world being a villain's main motivator. The other issue that affects both Salazar and Sadler is that they've also lost the ability to contact Leon. Partway through, the comms were jacked, which lets both villains talk to Leon. I found that they were always at their strongest here with how many insults and quips they threw out. In the remake, they no longer call as they're replaced by Ada and Luis. Even then, I wouldn't have minded the change either had the screen time been utilized better in this game. I still think about how Salazar called Leon to talk about his garden. It really wasn't much, just a compliment turned threat, as he claimed that Leon would never escape from it alive, but it was something. Something that these new remake iterations are missing. And yet, once again, I still find myself drawn to them, not because they're in-game appearances, but by the lore that surrounds them. Many new notes have been added into the remake which showcase the before and afters of the village, providing a sense of humanity to a place untouched by the original. 4 Remake expands on the earlier parts of the timeline by establishing that on top of the Salazar family, Sadler had his own family that spanned generations, whose oldest ancestor was Adam Sadler. Adam was the first of their line and was the one who discovered the Las Plagas. As we know though, Salazar's family forbid them from using it. They sealed away the creature and then also exiled them to the island that you visit in the last chapters. But of course, as the years went on and Osmond Sadler came into power, he would eventually convince Ramon Salazar to unleash the parasite. The story of Salazar seems to be about the same as the original, although the butler's memo makes note of how Salazar was mean and aggressive even from a young age. However, Salazar is often flanked by 2 Verdugo. In the original, they just seemed like unique enemies. Resident Evil Archives 2 is a sequel to the first one we talked about ages ago, which summarized and broke down some of the game's lore in book format. This book later clarified in its section on Resident Evil 4 that the Verdugos were Salazar's butler and then a housemaid. The remake, in a continued effort to stop forcing people to seek out supplemental material, makes a few notes about it in-game. The notes titled Chronicles of Pursuit are written from the perspective of one Isidro, the butler of Ramon Salazar. It was the butler who created the Novistadors, known as U2. Sometime in the future, the housemaid would also offer herself up to the experiments. The transformation would become a success, and she was then given the name U3, although her presence was not seen much in this game. Isidro, meanwhile, would then infect himself with a vial of black liquid, the same one he had been slowly crafting over the years, which gave rise to U2 and U3. Now that it is finally complete, he was ready to use it on himself and become Salazar's Verdugo, who we are to assume is the one in the red robe and the one Leon kills in the basement. Interestingly, the remake also adds that there are different species of the Plaga. The notes make mention of a superior and a dominant strain. Now, technically there was a mention of the dominant strain in the original game, that's the sample that Ada stole, but it wasn't really explained all that well. The remake makes sure to be clear about this distinction. The superior strain seems to be in the lower ranks like Krauser, although not as low as the Ganados, while Sadler seems to contain the dominant Plaga. The game also introduces this thing called the Amber, which is the remake's take on the sample. This amber seems to be incredibly unique. According to the research, this amber contains within it a dominant Plaga, but it's still in its infancy. If it grows and evolves like it should, it could even rival Sadler's own dominant Plaga. That's why he wants it, why Wesker wants to steal it, and why Leon refuses to let them both have it. The folks down below the castle, though, have also seen some expansion. A few of the notes around the village, specifically those belonging to Chief Mendez, show the downfall of the village, and how the cult used them as their ganados. In his room, Mendez has with him a photo of his father, who is also a priest. Village records detail how the people were showing signs of madness, the first symptoms of the Plaga. A grandfather at some point had instructed Mendez do what must be done, which later led to the grandfather's death. This gentleman has also learned to be Luis's grandfather. While the hardships did come, they went just as fast. The village had thrived, and thanks to the recently built ironworks, their tools were sharper as ever, and through the use of oil, they could use the boat to go out and fish like never before. In the interim, Mendez also found himself teaching the children of the village math and literacy, while ending his nights dining at his home with many of the villagers. All of this was due to his willingness to open the borders of the village to those of the outside. But it wasn't long after that men in black robes came from the castle, descended to the village with their spider-like insignia, claiming to have a cure for their madness. Mendez would then continue to lead the village, but it's clear that his priorities began to shift. His notes detail how a famine has arisen, but it seems as though Sadler was bargaining the villagers' lives for help. They give up some of their folks, he helps them survive their famine. The notes then continue to mention how villagers were given up as the days continue, later remarking how a few outsiders got lost so they were used instead. The rest then, as they say, was history. Something I had thought about when playing Resident Evil 4 was what the village used to be like before all this happened. It's a common question for a game like this because it's interesting to imagine what a peaceful place this could be, as all we've ever seen is death. I've always wanted to know this when playing the original, but given its priorities it's clear that it was never going to elaborate on such a thing, so I'm glad the remake took it upon itself to do so. Providing us with not only more story, but by adding more background to the game, it creates a wonderful timeline of events that gets us from Sadler's arrival to Leon's, connecting things in a way that the original never bothered to. And so despite the shortcomings of the villains in this game, their presence is uplifted purely through the notes, thus leading me right back to my exact thoughts on these villains from the original. With all this out on display, it's clear that the remake was looking to take the story of Resident Evil 4 more seriously this time, and it greatly benefits from it. While the laid-back, carefree style of the original is iconic and incredibly charming, there is something to be said for this kind of dramatic storytelling. The original's design was certainly of its time, a time when the franchise was looking to redefine itself in new ways. This new era recognizes that their place at the top is fickle, and that simply doing what they want and trying to appeal to a mass market by ramping up the action was not the way to go. Returning to what made the franchise great in the first place is what got them the success they needed. That isn't to say action has no place in Resident Evil, quite a few games just in this video have had plenty of action. It's the balancing of these two styles that makes these games excellent though. Resident Evil 4 Remake is far and away my preferred way to play through this setting. Although given the drastic changes, it's not so much that the remake replaces the original, more so it sits alongside it, like Resident Evil 3. As it really does opt to provide players with another option, rather than eliminate its competition so to speak. Because of this, it's led to lots of discussion about which game did it best. While debates about these are often one-sided, like in the case of Resident Evil 1 or 3, 4 is the one I find without a clear answer. The remake is as fantastic and iconic as the original was back in its day, and so that makes it hard to determine which game really did it better. Well, it's actually not that true, because there is one thing the remake does that's universally regarded as being better than the original in nearly every way. 4 Remake's Separate Ways side story is a noticeable upgrade from the original counterpart and might be the best DLC for this franchise to date. Just the first 5 minutes have more personality and thought put into it than the entire length of the original. Like before, it stars Ada Wong, where for the next 7 chapters, we get to see her POV of the game. It first starts with her in the castle as she rescues Luis from some cult members. Their deal, like before, was that he gets to escape and live a free life away from the village, so long as Ada gets the amber. He had to hide it when he was taken though, so they will have to travel there together. Their getaway plans are stopped almost immediately, for they are ambushed by the other robed Verdugo that follows Salazar. Keen-eyed players of Resident Evil 4 would likely recognize that U3 was missing from the original game. Well, the remake has decided to evolve U3's fight and put it in separate ways. Frankly, when I hit credits and realized I never fought U3, I didn't really lose any sleep over it. It's a completely forgettable fight. Sadler introduces it when he gets a call from Leon, he meets it 2 minutes later, and then it dies a few minutes after. Then Leon just goes about his day. The previous fight with the other Verdugo at least had some tension and build-up while it was stalking Leon before approaching. I want to assume the devs knew this, so they decided to make U3 a stalker-style boss who chases Ada during her campaign. U3 operates much more like a nemesis than Mr. X though, what I'm fine with that is there was no expectation set here. And I think for this style, going the nemesis route is much better than having him constantly walk around the village looking for Ada. This is in large part due to the structure of Separate Ways, as it's not a campaign like Leon's, but rather just a brief glimpse into Ada's journey. But it's also because Ada has a few more methods of traversal that would make escape much easier. We saw how her previous appearance in 2 Remake leaned into the spy aesthetic by giving her a bunch of tools that would not be out of place in an Inspector Gadget film. Separate Ways adds to this arsenal by giving the player much more choice over her grapple hooks rather than it being restricted to specific moments, and on occasion, giving her a scanner in her eye called Iris. Most of the game is still focused on ammo conservation and careful planning though, so the genre hasn't totally flipped, but the side story does give you more opportunities to provide your own flourishes when in combat. For example, there was that moment when Leon and Luis were locked in that house defending against the Ganados. We as Ada have to defend them as they brought out one of their gigantes. While fighting on the ground is viable, it's better if you grapple between the buildings. The game even lets the gigante inflict some damage onto the houses, creating enough structural weakness to topple it over. It creates a unique feeling of tension where you start to notice how little room you have left on the roof, making you wonder if this thing is close to dead or if you're going to take this to the ground soon. And this is on top of the already built-in stealth mechanics, a playstyle that I think fits Ada more than Leon. And that's actually related to a major strength of this DLC, and that's that it makes you feel like you're playing as Ada. In the original, she was just female Leon. Ada in the remake feels like her own person. Being able to take down enemies from range or rip off shields using the grapple hook, these kind of small flourishes made her stand out from Leon's campaign. I actually found myself playing much differently, using stealth and not attacking as often, rather than running through the levels with half an armory in my pocket. All of this circles back to your brief encounters with U3, who shows up a few times, sometimes in more tricks up her sleeve, but eventually culminates in a final fight that you'd be much more familiar with. U3 has seen some development in terms of lore through the in-game notes. It's not much as the main game had already explained everything we needed to know, but a torn page of the Chronicles book implies the housemaid did not willingly choose this and was in a great deal of pain during her transformation process, making the boss fight feel more like a mercy than anything. Some other notes also rationalize its frequent appearances, by explaining that due to some specialized cells, once it implants itself onto its prey, such as how its acid hit Ada, U3 can manipulate its prey's consciousness, trapping them in a nightmare, which also ends up bending their will to hers so that they can never escape her. The only way to escape is to kill U3, but of course that's easier said than done. U3's presence continues to trouble Ada throughout most of her campaign as she starts to feel the plaga symptoms as well, which becomes a secondary element of the story. Separate Ways' narrative is much different this time around. Rather than leave the narratives to the beginnings and endings of a chapter, and, well, also not saying much during those narrative moments, the remake keeps the story front and center. While Ada will run into Leon during moments you have and haven't seen from his perspective, she'll mainly be talking with Luis and Wesker. The first few chapters are about actually finding Luis since they had to split up earlier, and as we know, Luis will get captured soon after. Luis's moments in this DLC mainly serve to reaffirm his personality that we saw from our time with Leon. He still wants to atone for the sins of his past, and we can see how willing he is to do so. When he tells Leon of the medicine he has, which will help suppress his infection, when he goes to his lab, he finds that it's already been burned to the ground. He immediately rushes in to try and save any supplies he can, but it's too late. He was so willing to throw his life away just for a chance of redemption here. It also speaks to Ada's character as well. At this point, Luis thought it was all over for him, that he couldn't save anyone, and that he would not be able to redeem himself. Ada, of all people, tells him that he could simply just make another batch. While I'm sure part of this stems from her own needs as she also needs that suppressant, it's not often we see Ada like this. She's showing more emotion, and for someone like her who's usually so reserved in hiding her feelings, it's a nice change. But of course, Separate Ways would not be complete without Wesker. He's gotten arguably the biggest overhaul, likely on account of his story being the next after this wraps up. In knowing that, the remake wants to make his transition from Resident Evil 4 to 5 a lot stronger. Wesker, as per usual, cares little for any of the issues that Ada runs into. As long as he gets that amber, the rest is irrelevant. But for all his faults, and there are many, he is not one to sit idly by. He is a man of action, and so on brief occasions, Wesker will actually meet with Ada in person. At one point, Ada succumbs to some of the infection from the plaga, but Wesker had arrived to prevent her death. His characterization here is perfect. All he does is inject her with some suppressant, and then leave. No hey, hi, how you doing, you okay? It's just, get the mission done, and don't bother me. As we've seen from Resident Evil 5, Wesker is someone who uses people and cares little for what a person is to him, only what they can do for him. Later it's learned that he was the one who actually destroys the island, and later when Ada asks him what he plans to do with all this, Wesker basically admits that billions of people are going to die. This characterization being said earlier in the timeline provides more continuity to his other appearances in prior games, and his future appearance in Resident Evil 5. You can even see Excella and a few pictures of Africa on his computer. The remake also takes more supplemental info and places it in the main story. We know from both the original and the main story in the remake that Ada is not going to side with Wesker, but as his motto often was, if you can't beat him, steal someone's corpse. So like Steve from Code Veronica, he actually steals Krauser's body, which allowed him to get some samples of the plaga for himself. This info was once again in some supplemental material, but the remakes now make sure to set this up early. There isn't any news as of yet regarding a Resident Evil 5 remake, but just from what we've seen, the ending of Separate Ways and its characterization of Wesker would likely fit both iterations of that tale, allowing for a pleasant transition from game to game, whether that be for those who want to play the story a bit early or for those waiting for the possible remake. This DLC also adds a new section on the island that provides more lore secrets for those willing to read them. It introduces the laser room again, as well as an unkillable test subject that they were working on down here, which might have been an evolution or early attempt at a regenerator, given its not invincible body. It also explains how Krauser got his mutated arm as he volunteered for an experiment, even explaining how the amber can not only react to other plaga, but also how it can in some way strengthen them. It provides a much more deeper analysis into the plaga and why this amber is so sought after. But my favorite moment comes not from this ending, with a promise of things to come, but a scene with little to no fanfare. Late in the game, Leon will ride to the island with Ada, and the two talk about their past and each other. It's a scene from the base game, but with the context of Ada's journey in separate ways, it felt more appropriate here. Kojima famously had a word for all the Metal Gear Solid games that most define them: gene, meme, scene. If I had to do this at Resident Evil 4 Remake, I would put change. Change is a word thrown around a lot in this game. Krauser claims Leon hasn't changed. Leon says that Krauser has, but for the worst. Luis asks with his final breath if people can change, and Ada and Leon here on the boat talk about change within themselves. The world changes people, events, information. We are a culmination of everything that's ever happened to us, whether that be for good or ill, depends on how you view yourself. The theme of Resident Evil 4 Remake is change, both if change is good and whether change occurred at all. For Krauser, his time in Operation Javier jaded him, changing him for the worst, but in a way that still makes you feel sympathetic given all he went through. Luis was a horrible person who worked with Umbrella to create bioweapons that would later kill millions. As he says himself, nothing could ever absolve him of that sin, but helping Leon, Ashley, and Ada still makes him feel better. It's not enough to wash away the guilt he feels, nor the pain he's caused, and he knows that. But I do think it shows a lot about a person if they look themselves in the mirror and tell themselves that they're not only a bad person, but they vow to do better. That takes an immense amount of courage and self-reflection that many do not possess. It's why Luis's death feels more impactful in this game, because the game places such an importance on his lab as his legacy. Even in death, he was able to save Ashley and Leon, thus proving that he was a good person in the end. Leon and Ada are the opposite. Leon claims that he changed after Raccoon City, further saying that the cop in him died that day. That's why he feels so strongly about the deaths of Marvin and Kendo. It's why he wants to protect Ashley. He wants this to be different. He's a lot like Chris in that respect, a man who saw his comrades die, and with each passing day continues to hope that this time it'll be different. Leon does not want to fail. He doesn't want anyone else to be harmed, and that's why he's so determined to save Ashley. Not only to just save a person, but to also save himself in a way, proving that the old him is still in there. It's something Krauser even taunts him for, claiming that Leon cannot save her, nor anyone. Ada though reassures him that he hasn't changed, only that he thinks he has. While this comes off as rude based on her tone, I actually think it's meant to be a compliment. Ada has seen Leon work. His nice guy attitude is what attracted her to him in the first place. His attitude has also given Ada the courage to be more herself, rather than the reserved person she started as. So Leon hasn't changed, but in a way that's good. I can't imagine what his life is like outside these games, but here, whether it's Raccoon City, Valdalobos, or Tall Oaks, the guy's a goddamn hero by my standards. Despite how tough this is on him, despite how many people he's seen die, and how much guilt he still has, he still gets up in the morning and does what's right. The cop in him did not die that day, it just grew up, because if it died, he would not be here. Change can be both good and bad. It all depends on who you are. For Leon, he need not change, for he is right where he needs to be. For Luis, change is what he needed to absolve his soul. And for Resident Evil 4, change was needed to take the original game up to a standard of quality befitting a game once called one of the greatest ever made. But they often say that you cannot outrun your past, and that the ghosts of time forgotten are always there waiting to lure you back. And for both Leon and Resident Evil, those ghosts came a-knocking, ready to drag them back to where they both started, to see if time has truly changed them, or if they're still the same people they were 30 years ago. Resident Evil 9 is the newest game in the franchise, releasing only a week or two before this video's creation, and it takes us back to the place we all know and love, Raccoon City. Well, for part of the story at least. Resident Evil 9 has two playable characters, Leon and newcomer Grace Ashcroft. Grace drew lots of attention from older fans as she was learned to be the daughter of Alyssa Ashcroft from Outbreak. Working as an analyst for the FBI, Grace is reminded of her past when a case of murders bring her back to a time she wished she'd forgot. 8 years before the start of the game, Alyssa and Grace were attacked by a hitman. The hitman had been following them for a few days and decided that today was the day to strike. While they were able to escape, it was only temporary, as Alyssa was killed before they collapsed from their wounds. Like the beginning of Resident Evil 8, it's meant to serve as a tense and shocking introduction. While I don't mind such an introduction, I am puzzled by Alyssa's inclusion. She only appears one more time, a video recording of a past interview she did back when Grace was just a baby. so Alyssa serves very little to this plot as a whole. Now, it makes sense for Alyssa to be involved in some conspiracy. She broke the news on Raccoon City and has done reporting for years, so I understand her presence here. I'm just confused as to why they had to kill her off. I assumed it was because they were going to remaster Outbreak or something, but I still have my doubts about that. The scene is more likely to mean nothing to most people anyway, since Outbreak has drifted from the public perception of Resident Evil. So much so that I doubt most people even knew who she was or that she was present in Resident Evil 7 via that newspaper. It just kinda sucks to see an old character, as small as her roles were back then, to be killed like this without much consideration. It's clear that Capcom also cared very little for her too. The very first trailer for Resident Evil 9 introduced Grace, followed by a comment from the director at her office, as he recalls her mother's death 8 years ago. So many people knew before the game even was released that she was dead. After the flashback ends, we control Grace as she goes through the very same hotel as she analyzes the crime scene there. She ends up getting captured by the big bad at this point, a Dr. Victor Gideon, while we then flip over to Leon, who's investigating some murders. He's joined by Sherry, who now replaces Hunnigan as his coordinator, at least for this mission. His section is about what you would expect, fighting, kicking, and one-liners galore as he chases down Gideon. He won't catch up to him, but Sherry points him towards a clinic that he runs not far from where they are. The intro of RE9 is quick, less than an hour or so, but it does set the tone for each character and what to expect when you start playing, as the game really begins once you get to the clinic. We have an appointment there, and Doctor, it seems like I'm coming down with a case of deja vu. The care center is reminiscent of the classics, Spencer Mansion, Baker Estate. By now you get the point. It's a complex building of many locked doors and puzzles that must be completed to exit. This is Grace's section, and the atmosphere and tone of the clinic fits perfectly with her gameplay style. Much like Ethan and Chris, Grace and Leon are the survival horror and action characters respectively. Resident Evil 9 is yet another example of what we talked about earlier. Leon gets a section all to himself later, but just here in the clinic, Resident Evil 9 conveys the kind of tone Leon sets. In the few minutes you do play as Leon, you run through an entire ward with a chainsaw, creating more of that artistry of blood present in 2 Remake. Later he squares off against a being named Chunk, a small obstacle for Leon, who's a mini-boss for Grace, only to then provide cover from a rooftop and fight another enemy in an enclosed space. Like Chris, Leon cannot be a narratively consistent horror protagonist anymore. He's just too strong for the setting, and so that's why characters like Grace and Ethan are needed to make Resident Evil games scary again. It's a wonderful blend of the two styles, and shows that Capcom 2 understands that this is where these characters are going in the future. I mean, just looking at his kit, Leon's most iconic weapon for this game is his Requiem. Historically, the Magnum was always the strongest weapon in the game, available towards the end with only a handful of rounds given. Leon gets this at the very beginning. Now sure, he'll hand this off to Grace soon where it becomes more consistent with its earlier iterations, but the fact that he starts with it should tell you all you need to know. The only issue that comes from this dual protagonist system is how they are layered. We've seen across these videos how the franchise has continued to evolve the second playable character, either making separate campaigns like Resident Evil 2, or flip-flopping back and forth like Code Veronica, and so on. This isn't an inherent problem, but people do have different preferences. Frankly, there is no right way to do this, but I think Resident Evil 9 chose the best route it could. Grace gets half the game to herself, only for Leon to take over during his section. Then, like the intro, the two flip back and forth at the end. It's almost exactly like how they did it back in Code Veronica. The only difference is that Chris and Claire were not so different back then. Grace and Leon are designed with 2 different styles in mind. So for those who like action, you'll have to wait many hours to get there, and for those who just want survival horror, the second half of the game is going to nosedive in quality. As a fan of both styles, I didn't mind it, and in fact, liked that they made each section one right after the other, rather than intertwined throughout the story. I especially like how they handled this through the clinic. Resident Evil 9 has somehow not only brought back a beloved mechanic, but made it better. The zapping system of the original Resident Evil 2 is one of its most iconic features, a feature missing from its remake. Resident Evil 9 brings this back during Grace's section and even expands upon it. Resident Evil 2 only applied its zap to specific enemies or items. In Resident Evil 9, anything you did as Grace stays. Any item, enemy, locked door, it all remains right where you left them. This acknowledgement of your actions is not only just an inherently great decision, but also allows for careful planning and strategizing. Leon's more equipped to deal with a large number of foes. He has a strong melee attack, a hatchet that never runs out of durability, so long as you sharpen it, and an arsenal of weapons. Grace has knives that break permanently, and a pistol. But if you could tough it out and be frugal as Grace, you'll not only come out with tons of extra resources for her, but you can come back and tackle the more challenging areas as Leon. Resident Evil's zapping system was a unique mechanic, not just for Resident Evil, but for games in general. The remake not adding this is still disappointing, but I'm also very happy to see it return here and in a much more expanded way than in the original. But how your journey ends up either becoming a walk in the park or that church scene from Kingsman fully depends on your actions as Grace. Grace, like Ethan, has quickly become a favorite of mine. I'd love to see her in more games in the future, even if the games just go back to her analyst role. What really made me connect with Grace was her voice actress. Angela Santalbano may be one of the best voice actors to be hired for this franchise. Her work as Grace is incredible. Grace stutters when she talks to people, and she's scared almost all the time, enough to where her fear is believable. There's a moment early on that I always found interesting. It's right here at the beginning of the clinic. When she first meets with Leon, he introduces himself as a DSO agent. Grace, after being seconds away from dying, is understandably terrified and can't think straight. So not only does she stutter, but she also says CSO instead of DSO.
Leon Kennedy, DSO.
CSO. I'm Grace. Ashcroft. FBI.
Grace, despite being FBI, is actually an analyst, not an agent. Hell, her gun is actually something she bought for herself. It's not even government issued. Before this, she was just a hermit who lived at her desk. So we once again have someone with no experience having to fight for their life. The issue with Resident Evil 7's Ethan is that by not having him speak much, that terror he's feeling is not conveyed. This design choice was obviously made so that the game could give the player a chance to give life to Ethan through their screams and their terror. But looking at Grace, we could see what was lost back then. They knew from the start that Grace was meant to be her own person, with a life and past independent of the players. I think Capcom realized that this was best suited for their games around RE8, so it's very likely that we'll be seeing more characters like Grace or Resident Evil 8's Ethan. Another comparison to be made here is also seen in their mannerisms. Ethan's games were in first person only, minus that one post-launch update for Resident Evil 8. Part of the reason Ethan's hands were attacked so much was because his hands were all we could see. They were basically a way for us to connect with Ethan more. With Resident Evil 9's cutscene showing more than just her hands, we could see more of Grace's mannerisms. There is a lovely scene at the very beginning where Grace is on her computer when Alyssa comes home. As soon as she comes home, she holds out her hand to her. It's a very human thing to do, and it shows just how much love and care the two have for each other. Another that is quite memorable is a bit later towards the end of the game. Leon's rather injured at this point and passes out. Grace wakes him up and you can see her rubbing his knee as she does. I understand that these aren't like incredibly impressive things to bring up here, but I think little interactions like this really lower the veil between fiction and reality. It's two very small, insignificant gestures, but they can tell you a lot about Grace and how she cares for people. Further, the game actually provides players with a choice between which perspective they would like to play. While the game initially recommends a first-person perspective, there is an argument to be made for third-person. While that type POV provides more immersion, you miss that feeling of the chase. In first-person, it's almost like Grace is walking. This is due to the game lowering your speed so you can't outrun everything, a very typical design choice for horror games. In third-person, it's more like a sprint. Grace flails her arms around and even trips multiple times. It's frantic and exactly the kind of intensity a chase like this exemplifies. What's nice is that no matter the perspective, the game makes sure the scene isn't ruined by that choice. In the flashback with Alyssa, the same cutscene is directed two different ways so as to keep the scene tense without the camera angle messing things up. This allows you to connect with Grace more, and as I've said many times before, becoming connected with the character you play and the world they inhabit makes you more likely to enjoy the story they're involved in. Grace is going to be on her own for much of her story. She tries to brave the care center just long enough to find a way out of here. On top of the zapping system, the care center is definitely another wonderful location for the franchise, just from a design perspective. Environmental storytelling is once again on full display here. The left half of the care center has lounges and dining tables. It's even got a bar and a roulette table. The other side of the building is where all the tests and exams are run. You have waiting rooms for new patients as well as rehabs and isolation wards. But given this is Resident Evil, it makes you wonder what they're really testing here. This place is supposed to be a legitimate business, but the numerous tests and cordoned off areas convey that there is a much darker side under the surface. Beneath the clinic is a closed off basement. There are jail cells and conveyor belts with infected people everywhere. Notes around the game tell us that the clinic was running experiments in order to transfer minds and memories. Oswald Spencer believed that memories could be transferred to other people. As part of his plan for his forced human evolution, he wanted a way to take the best and brightest and spread that to others, most likely being him and anyone he deemed worthy. So test subjects are either cut up or liquefied so that the machines can extract their blood. Spencer believed that because the T-virus lets of control a person's blood, the mutations of the T-virus could serve to envelop memories. The thing is, they need to somehow find a test subject with enough resilience to not just be a walking corpse and somehow get these memories to pass. Dr. Gideon is an ex-Umbrella researcher who worked on T-virus research, and so because of his connections with Spencer, he wanted to continue his work. When Umbrella went under after Raccoon City, he purchased the care center and tried his best to see his vision through. However, little success has been made. But it seems like success isn't that big of a concern for him, as he sets the place to blow once he got what he really needed. Another lesser-known aspect of the care center is cloning, or at least testing on clones. A little girl named Emily is locked in this cell ready to be examined. There was another girl locked in the cell next door named Marie, but she escaped and became the terrifying creature that chases Grace throughout her level. These girls are believed to be clones of Grace. Gideon claims that Grace was a creation of Oswald Spencer and that she is special, as she's the key to unlocking Elpis. At this moment, it's unclear what any of this means, but as you'd expect, Grace's campaign serves to tease players with these story beats so Leon's campaign could give you some answers. But the reason the place is infected when we arrive is because of Dr. Gideon. He knew that Leon was coming after him, so he issued a Code 6, which seemingly infected all the staff. Now they roam the halls looking for anyone they could get their hands on. Taking from Revelations 1 rather than just mini-bosses, all the zombies in this game speak thoughts they once had when they were human. Some comment on the brightness of the lights, others the sound. Some apologize to Grace and others get angry. I always thought this was a cool addition in Revelations 1, but I wished all the enemies could exhibit those traits, so it's good to see Resident Evil 9 run with this as it provides some personality to the care center. There's a scene in Resident Evil 3 Remake that I'm reminded of, and it's when Marvin was bit by Brad. He hesitates a bit when Brad speaks, almost like he realized that his humanity is still in there. I thought about this a lot when playing Resident Evil 9, that these zombies are actual people not in control of their actions, but they still may retain just enough consciousness to be aware of their actions. When she's not battling the undead though, much of her story comes down to her playing mother to Emily. Emily and Marie were tested on, which gave them both the unintended side effect of blindness. As such, Emily can't see. For the time being, this isn't a concern as she's locked in a cell, but Grace will need to carry her if they're to both make it out of here. Grace's relationship with Emily reminds me of Claire and Sherry. Emily is adorable. She politely sits in her cell reading her book and sits on the couch when you need to put her down. She has some really cute interactions with Grace as well. After being chased by Marie, Grace almost got her leg chopped off. Realizing it's still intact, she breathes a heavy sigh of relief. Emily, being blind, has no idea what happened, so she's worried that Grace was hurt because she's not speaking. She also hugs her right after, and it's just cute, man. I love it. I also like that the game also makes you take her with you. Rare is it for you to actually be with Sherry in-game. It creates an opportunity for more conversations and bonding moments, while also making the gameplay tense, as you'll have to snake through zombies to get to where you need to go. Like anyone, Grace becomes attached to her almost immediately. She knows that this is no place for a child, and so, like Claire, decides to help the little girl who's quickly taken a liking to her. Once they leave, they try to take a helicopter out of there, but being a pilot is the most dangerous job in Resident Evil, so they overnight shipped Harry's death to get that out of the way. You'll notice though by this point that Emily becomes less responsive, implying that something is wrong. This continues as she starts to become more agitated or scared of something, although it's unclear what. This leads to the final part of Grace's campaign where she'll have to kill Marie using direct sunlight. She sets Emily down in a tucked away room so that she won't be harmed, but by the time she comes back, she's dead. She comes back alive only a few minutes later, but only because her body starts convulsing, mutating into another creature, not unlike Marie. Obviously, Grace is terrified. Leon, who had been in the background during this chapter, comes by to help, but he's forced to put her down in front of Grace. Grace comments on this being her fault. She said something earlier when recalling the death of Alyssa. She believes that she was the one who caused this to happen. Personally, I'd hardly say she's at fault here, but it's clear that where she goes, death seems to follow. It's happened to Alyssa, and now Emily, and so it's why she believes that this is her fault for this happening. Besides the entire chapter we'll have soon, I think this moment right here really solidified why Leon was the best protagonist for this tale. He's already went through the exact same thought process. Resident Evil 2 really made him realize how little he helped the people of Raccoon City, and he's carried that weight with him ever since. In Resident Evil 6, I made note of the shared bonds between Sherry and Jake, two people whose fathers stain their name. This pairing of Leon and Grace is much the same. A man who's already beat himself up over his past failures, and a woman who is currently doing that now. Unlike Jake though, Grace refuses to listen. She can't bear to see someone else die because of her, so she leaves. She gives Leon back his gun and walks away. She's then convinced to join Gideon and new character Zeno as they head to Raccoon City and release Elpis. Grace's campaign is fantastic. The survival horror elements, the environmental storytelling of the care center, the zap system, the zombies, and all the lore in between, it's fantastic from start to finish. But this of course is just one part of the story. Leon still needs his time in the spotlight, and I assure you he won't be nearly as terrified as Grace is. But to continue, Leon will have to return to where it all started. A place that Leon left behind many years ago, but in some ways was also a place he never truly left. And if he doesn't get a move on soon, it'll be a place where his body and soul will never leave, even in death. Leon's campaign takes us back to Raccoon City, the beginning of Leon's story and the cause of his current condition. It was mentioned during Grace's section, but both he and Sherry suffer from a new disease now dubbed Raccoon City Syndrome. The idea is that dormant T-virus is resurfacing, causing black bruises along the body. As of now, there is no cure, and all results are fatal. While Raccoon City Syndrome is meant to be the virus of this game, like the many strains we've come to know for the past 30 years, it's also rather symbolic. It takes on a similar form as T-Phobos. Back in Revelations 2, I explained the nature of the virus and how it reacts to fear. Thus, if you overcome that fear, you survive, something Moira did by using a gun to save Claire. T-Phobos was in lore a virus, another infection, but narratively it was symbolic. It tied into the themes of Moira's story and her arc. Raccoon City Syndrome is much the same. Raccoon City left mental scarring on each person who survived, a constant reminder of their past and how they only narrowly escape with their lives. RC Syndrome is basically this mental damage made manifest. It's a physical blemish, a stain on the body to remind them that the city has never left them. Time heals all wounds, as they say, but Raccoon City's damage remains timeless. That's what makes this virus so interesting to me. It's got a deeper underlying theme to its inclusion. It also provides another reason to the argument for why Leon should have been included as the main character. For the first time ever, I think, Leon's got an actual arc. We discussed this back during Resident Evil 6, but something I was confused about was how Capcom refused to do anything with Leon and then keep him on the same path he was on in Resident Evil 2 and 4. Comparing this to Chris again, while he was present in the game's plot, his own arc involving his men in the BSAA were intertwined with the narrative being told. Leon's never had this. He's always been at the site of outbreaks, but they've never made him reflect on it. Resident Evil 6 tried to pull on those strings by making Tall Oaks another Raccoon City, but it just didn't hit the same highs as before. However, now, Capcom has finally managed to change that way of thinking with Resident Evil 9, by actually making him not just a character in this story, but to make the story actually involve him specifically. The narrative makes Leon confront his demons by heading to a place that gave that to him in the first place. A game I could not get out of my mind when playing RE9 was Metal Gear Solid 4. Metal Gear Solid 4 was the latest game in the timeline and starred Solid Snake, a reoccurring character within the franchise. I covered Metal Gear quite a while ago here on the channel already, so be sure to check that out if you want to know more. But an iconic moment from that game was when players were forced to return to Shadow Moses, the setting of the first game. The game has you play through a PS1 version of Shadow Moses just like you did in Metal Gear Solid 1. Oddcon even makes a joke about the game being on Blu-ray this time since you don't need to swap discs like back in the old day. It's a funny meta joke, classic Kojima stuff, but it's also an acknowledgement that time has passed significantly since those old days. In keeping with the other games, Metal Gear Solid 4 also had a unit or squad that Snake must take down. Metal Gear Solid 4's was the Beauty and Beast unit. Each one is an amalgamation of the previous game's groups. Crying Wolf, for example, is based on the Sorrow and the Sniper from Metal Gear Solids 3 and 1, while her weapon is Fortune's Railgun in Metal Gear Solid 2. Not only was the unit a unique enemy for Snake to fight, but for players it was also a reference and callback to past games. There's a quote I often think about by the famous philosopher Heraclitus, and it goes, quote, "No man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river, and he is not the same man." Shadow Moses is abandoned, desolate. It doesn't have the same vibrance it once had. Snake, for his part, is also older, wiser, but more troubled by his past and what it's led to. They are not the same beings they once were. Raccoon City is also abandoned, covered in ash and dust, with only some of its original lights still remaining in the umbrella ads prominently displayed throughout the city. It's a double meaning, an ironic message that the only identity of Raccoon City that largely remains is the company that brought about its downfall, but also the real honest feeling that the city has changed. Leon is much the same. From rookie cop to DSO agent, Leon has fought against BOWs time and again, but he's older now. His own mortality has aged him. He's showing more gray than before, and the stress from every death in BOW has weighed him down. He's not the same man he was before, and Raccoon City is not the same river it used to be. Both have been changed, and now both must meet once more. This is arguably more discussion than we've ever given to Leon. There's been so little for us to grasp on these past few years other than just the basics. It's nice to be able to actually talk about Leon as he relates to the setting. More often than not, Leon is the one who affects the setting. It's been years since we've seen the setting actually affect him. It's one of my favorite characterizations of him in this series, helped by the fact that the recent remakes have also started to take the story he's in more seriously. Resident Evil 2 and 4 Remake pushed the storytelling of their respective games to make Leon a deeply traumatized individual. Resident Evil 4 really created a disconnect with Leon. It does fit his persona in Resident Evil 6 more, but there's also some odd mismatching because of his carefree attitude. The remakes have also created a more consistent timeline of events by having Leon grapple with Raccoon City within Resident Evil 4, as he questioned whether the cop in him truly died that day. It's what makes his return to Raccoon City a much more impactful affair, as you know this was not easy for him. You could see it in his body language when he opens up the doors to the RPD, that long, slow movement he makes before he looks up. There's an acknowledgement here that he needs to look up in order to push forward and do what he came here to do, but a hesitancy in seeing firsthand the place that was ground zero for his current affliction, as all the memories of that night come flooding back to him. For me, I explored the RPD a few years ago, but I also replayed the game 2 months ago, so it's almost like I never really left. Still, seeing how the city has changed that night is a welcome treat. Not every location is available, but quite a few rooms can be explored. Old notes, photos, and items were still there right where they were found, serving as relics and timepieces that show just how long it's been. What's more interesting to me though is not just the RPD, but what it represents. See, Leon will also meet an old friend here, another Mr. X tyrant waiting to give him that classic RPD welcome. This section of the story also introduces Zeno, a guy who reminds me of another cocky sunglass-wearing individual. And one of the more notable reveals is a commander who looks like Hunk. It's all emblematic of the game's own title. The game is titled Resident Evil 9 Requiem. Requiem is mostly used in religious contexts, often as a prayer or a way to honor the dead. Resident Evil 9 is a requiem to separate the old from this newly established saga for the franchise. To kill Marie, you have to activate the shutters to open the roof that she's cooked by sunlight, just like the Leech Queen in Resident Evil 0. Plant 43 here in Raccoon City is derived from Plant 42 in Resident Evil 1. Raccoon City, Mr. X, and Hunk all come from Resident Evil 2. Gideon is later infected by the Nemesis parasite from Resident Evil 3. Zeno is a knockoff of Albert Wesker. Zeno and the Commander potentially being clones of Wesker and Hunk are also related to Resident Evil 6's cloning of Ada. Enemies speaking their thoughts from when they were human is from Revelations 1, and memory transferring technology was introduced in Revelations 2. As you can see, it's a requiem of Umbrella, and everything they represent. A requiem so that we could send the dead off to planes beyond our existence as we make way for newer, more exciting threats. Much of the real story within Resident Evil 9, while teased during Grace's campaign, is explained more in Leon's. Grace is escorted to the center of Raccoon City by Gideon and Zeno as they need her to unlock Elpis. Leon, meanwhile, is trying to work his way towards them so that he could save Grace. Leon is immediately greeted by a massive spider, something we haven't seen in a long time. Concerningly, there's also hundreds of zombies in the city as well. It not only shows the evolution of the city in real time, but also makes you question what's going on here, as wasn't the missile supposed to kill the zombies in the first place? Not necessarily. A group we've come to know from Resident Evil 7 and 8 are the Connections. Me from Part 1 now has egg on his face because of this, as the Connections are now not only mentioned, but they're likely to become the next big corporation that we'll come to blows with, much like Umbrella. While Gideon is ex-Umbrella, Zeno is assumed to be a part of the Connections. According to some of the notes, the Connections have been in the background for quite some time. As we remember from back in the day, Spencer had Dr. Marcus from Resident Evil 0 killed in order to take his research. Well, it's learned that Marcus was in contact with the Connections as far back as the 80s. Spencer, too, had already outlined his plan for life by this time. That included the Wesker plan, the Ark, Elpis, and mind transferring. The Ark was a massive research center underneath Raccoon City covered by an equally massive blast door. Back to Marcus, his protege was one Brandon Bailey. Info from Resident Evil 8 told us that Bailey was the leader of the Connections, but new info recovered from Grace after her report suggests that Bailey wasn't actually the leader. It's very likely that the Connections existed before his time, maybe under a different name. Fast forward to the 90s and we get to Elpis. Elpis, according to Zeno, is the last virus made by Spencer, a virus that has the power to control minds via infection. The issue is that it's been locked behind a password at Ark. If the password is typed in wrong, the whole thing is destroyed. Umbrella back in the day also experimented on the kids at the orphanage. A flashback of a little girl named Chloe is from 1990. They were conducting mind control and mind transfer experiments, but it seems like no result was reached. As time progressed though, Umbrella became too big for its own making. Smaller, lesser-known outbreaks were happening all over their facilities. You'll recall the one that happened in Sheva's village back in Resident Evil 5. Despite it all though, the one thing that did remain secure was Ark and Elpis. The Connections quickly became aware of its existence back in the day, and they saw a unique opportunity during the Raccoon City outbreak. The Connections had lobbied for the US government to launch the missile in order to hide Elpis, as during the outbreak they used their connections to find the Ark and take it over. The missile then destroyed the whole city with them inside the Ark. The later lockdown efforts were made to assist the Connections, as that would give them plenty of time to unlock Elpis. This all seems to be a joint operation between the Connections and the US government, as they were in talks days before the missile launched. The government's recent pivot away from the treaty which prohibits the use of bioweapons is likely in large part due to them seeing the potential in BOWs as weapons of war. But their influence continues to infect more of the established timeline. The Connections had worked with the government to basically throw Umbrella under the bus so they could seize their assets for themselves. During the Raccoon City trials, those legal proceedings we discussed a while ago, Albert Wesker was present, who at the time was likely representing Tricell. It's heavily implied that Tricell was just an extension of the Connections. We also learned that the president in Resident Evil 6 was assassinated for trying to go public about the Raccoon City outbreak. It's assumed that this new info about the connections and the Ark was what Adam Benford was trying to expose. But as we know, Simmons was the one who gave the go-ahead to launch the missile on the US, that's why Ada cut ties with him, and he was the one who had the president killed. He was a part of a group called the Family, and so now it's assumed that the Family is another extension of the connections. And seeing as we're already here, let's add 2 more. There are boxes inside the Ark belonging to the HCF. The HCF worked with the connections back in the 2000s, so they're in cahoots. And to an extent, even the BSAA are influenced by them. According to Sherry, the BSAA had some internal disputes. They're currently seen here in Raccoon City trying to find Elpis. This North American branch of the team seems to be a rogue sect in a sense. Not officially, mind you, but they are doing their own thing at the moment. The government assured the connections that the BSAA is under their thumb, but the connections have the government at their beck and call, since they forced them to launch the missile, meaning that the connections technically also have the BSAA's North American branch under their control too. Alright, so wow, where do we even begin with this? That was certainly a lot of information. Recalling what I said earlier, Resident Evil 9 is trying to set up a conflict between our heroes and the connections. Umbrella's legacy will be gone, a simple footnote in the franchise history now. It's why Gideon calls the RC syndrome Umbrella's curse, and why Leon calls Gideon Umbrella's last skeleton. These are the last few threads of Umbrella still stringing us along, tying us to the narrative. The intention, I think, is for this to be the end of Umbrella, so that we can now focus on the connections. That's why from the info we do learn, little is actually explained about the connections other than just them being a major player in most of the events going on here. It's likely that in a few years' time, Resident Evil 9 will be looked at as a transition piece, a game that bridges the gap between those games of the Umbrella saga and the new ones yet to come with the connections in the driver's seat. That would explain the existence of characters like Zeno and the Commander. Characters that represent Umbrella's past but are likely reflective of the connections' future. I've theorized that these two are actually clones of Wesker and Hunk made by the connections. Or, well, at least Zeno is a clone. While I've had many great conversations with people in the comments about the Commander, some of which were actually quite illuminating, like one comment that pointed out that the Commander actually has RC syndrome, further adding to the Hunk theory, I saw some strange pushback against the possibility of this not being Hunk. Some of it rather rude, actually. I don't like to make definitive statements based on assumptions, as I feel like that's more damning to a discussion about a game's story than a wrong assumption that provides both sides of the argument. So forgive me for not outright wanting to confirm that this guy is Hunk based on the evidence provided. Capcom does not confirm his name is Hunk in-game, so I'm not going to either. Rant aside, if that's not Hunk, I have a belief that they are clones of their respective betters. Gideon will even call Zeno an imitation. Like Capcom does with their remakes, it seems though the connections are taking the good parts of Umbrella, adapting them to this new era, and then throwing away the rest. I believe Zeno and the Commander to just be one part of a long line of clones they're ready to unleash onto the world. Although that does leave me skeptical. It's too early to tell how this will go, so I won't say I definitively hold this position, but if we're going to just clone old characters, are we not making a repeat of Miranda in Resident Evil 8? Well, actually, I shouldn't even ask that question because we already did. Or maybe that Raccoon City was orchestrated by someone else who has nothing to do with Birkin or Umbrella. Only time will tell, I suppose. What did I tell ya? Mind you, I recorded that days before Resident Evil 9, so I had no idea what this story would be. It's not coincidence, it's pattern recognition. Resident Evil's story has changed time and time again, with new villains suddenly being connected to older events so they can add more relevance to the plot. However, I'm willing to acquiesce with this one, since it seems like they're ending this stuff with Umbrella and focusing on the connections, thus we're likely going to see new story beats that involve them. But given that they've also been around since before the 1980s, far before our time at Resident Evil 0, I have my doubts. I wholly expect Resident Evil 10 or even Resident Evil 9's DLC to further retcon old events to make room for this new faction. Hilariously, that's also not even the biggest retcon in this game. Continuing from where we left off, post-Raccoon City, the connections will then stay in the Ark and continue the production of BOWs. They have a catalog of all their merchandise, which is just as absurd as those notes from Resident Evil 5. The connections were trying to unlock Elpis, but they couldn't get it open. Gideon and Zeno then make contact at some point and work together, hoping to pull their research and money into this. As he was ex-Umbrella, Gideon worked under Spencer, so he wanted to continue his master's work. That would explain why Gideon would restart the research at his care center. But as we know, that too was unsuccessful. The only successful part of all of this was Grace and Elpis. Gideon and Zeno believe that Grace knows the password because she was supposedly the original. They claim that Grace was duplicated during their research, leading to Emily, Marie, and Chloe, but that's not possible due to info we learn later. Basically, Zeno and Gideon are operating on wrong information. A lot of this game is just a giant red herring, made to distract the player before it reveals the truth later. They assume that Grace is special because of Spencer, and that's because technically, he's her father. When inside the Ark, Grace inserts an MO disc she found in Alyssa's stuff back in the hotel. In there was an interview with Oswald Spencer prior to his death in Lost in Nightmares. It's assumed that this was only a few years before that because he is rather sickly and close to death. He says straight up that he feels wrong about what he did. He opened Pandora's box, and so now every death from BOWs are his fault. To make amends, he did something he rarely ever does. He took in a small child, just a normal girl, named Grace, and raised her. As Spencer would later die, he wrote in his will that Alyssa was to be Grace's primary caretaker. So Spencer felt genuine remorse over his actions. Further, Zeno and Gideon were wrong. They thought Grace was being cloned. They assumed that Emily, Marie, and Chloe had some genetic tie to Grace, but that's not true. Not only were the experiments during Chloe's time in the 1990s, and Grace was likely born around the early 2000s, all that experimentation was mind transferring, not about Grace. So Grace seems to just be a regular normal girl with no viruses or powers or anything. Spencer's notes were not complete back then, so they had no way of knowing the truth, and thus everything they did has been a complete waste of their time. Okay, there's a lot to break down here. Firstly, Elpis. Elpis has learned to actually be an antiviral agent. It removes infections, not starts them. To be clear, this is not the mind-transferring virus that Zeno thought it was. He was just flat out wrong. However, we know from Lost in Nightmares that Spencer spilled the truth about Wesker to him before his death. One of his last words was how he wanted to become a god, but that plan failed. All of this makes a real headache of a plot to dissect. So from the info in-game, we know that Elpis was made in the mid-90s, very likely before the outbreak in Raccoon City. At this point, Progenitor and the T-Virus are in circulation, and G was being worked on by Birkin. Grace assumes that Elpis was made as a way for Spencer to atone, but the answer could be a bit more complicated than that. Given the date of its completion, it's very likely that Spencer created this as a way to destroy the other companies. He has a note where he writes that the family, HCF, Tricell, and Umbrella will all fall to Elpis. So it's possible that Elpis was just another tool of destruction, a weapon to remove BOWs from the battlefield, a trap card if you will. However, I think Elpis later in his life took on another meaning. Pre-Raccoon City, I find it hard to believe that Spencer had any remorse about anything. So I think Elpis went from being a weapon to a product of atonement. A happy accident that a virus he made to use in a war against BOWs would also be the key to absolving him of his sins. But that also leaves his Resident Evil 5 appearance. This is the last time we ever see Spencer. These are his literal final words. Anyone who played the game could tell you he died with hate in his heart. Hate that he could not become a god and fulfill his vision. Killed not only by his own mortality, but by his own creation. It's led me down two paths. Speaking on what we know, it's possible that he went senile after his interview and wasn't really coherent. Grace even suggests this was the case in her report, that he did want to atone, but after he went senile, he reverted to that older state of mind before his death. Realistically though, I think this is less an answer and more a way for Capcom to not confirm things while they work on the next project. They don't want to show their hands too early here, I assume. And speaking of which, that leads me to my next assumption, and that this testimony is actually part of a new Spencer we have yet to see. All answers are pointing to a Resident Evil 5 remake in the future. RE4 Remake revealed Wesker's plan, which he will enact in Resident Evil 5, and even if Code Veronica gets the game first, it helps connect to Resident Evil 1 and 5. I don't think this is what's happening, but it's worth noting for the future that Spencer's talk of Wesker in a possible Resident Evil 5 remake will be a lot different with this info in mind. Regardless, that does lead us to question the nature of his atonement. Unfortunately, it's a topic I'm actually quite passionate about. I like talking about redemption arcs and atonement stories. God of War, Vinland Saga, Red Dead, all great stories for the same reason. Redemption, not just in stories but in real life, is hard. Everyone has a right to be wary of your new actions, as they have evidence to prove that this is nothing but a phase, or at worst, a ruse. Atonement and bettering yourself is all about acknowledging that you did something wrong and then vowing to do better, not for anyone but yourself. You shouldn't be better because you want people to look at you better, you should be better because you want to. But that's an internal battle, only one that you can see. Only you can really determine if you've truly changed for the better. It requires a lot of time, deep thought, introspection, and self-actualization to really analyze yourself on such a deep level. No one's perfect, neither me, nor you, nor anyone. It's alright to be wrong or to make mistakes, but it's important to note that people don't have to accept your redemption. Sometimes the damage has been done and the bridges are far too burned to repair. Redemption can be hard because I think people not only want to be better, but sometimes people want to be acknowledged for being better. But acknowledgement is a privilege, not a right in this case. I myself have done lots of thinking about this, and it's led me to believe that people deserve second chances, and that if I was in someone else's shoes, I would want to be forgiven too. But I've also not been put in such a situation as this. Spencer killed thousands of people, and those were just test subjects. If he claims ownership of every death, every bioweapons outbreak from the leeches to now is his fault, that's likely millions of people. Is it possible to forgive someone like that? Does the absolution have to fit the crime in this case? That an equally heinous person needs an equally significant atonement, or is that impossible? Again, it depends on the person. I think we as people can sit here and comfortably discuss Spencer's morality because he's a fictional character in a video game. But what about a real-life equivalent? Or what about the people in Resident Evil? I can't imagine any of our heroes would forgive Spencer. It's his fault for making them the way they are now. The man who saw dozens of his men killed. The man who almost took his life after Raccoon City. And the woman who was experimented on by his creation and infected with multiple viruses. It's all Spencer's fault, and I can't imagine them accepting his apology. I want to believe that everyone deserves second chances, but I don't know if any kind of absolution is possible at that stage. I'm always willing to make room for those who show genuine remorse and a need to grow from their past. Everyone makes mistakes in life, but how far is too far? And in the case of Spencer, how much of this is real? That's what makes his atonement all the more difficult to achieve. We've seen him time and again continue to believe in his vision and backstab people to get ahead. He might actually want to atone, but that's quite difficult when all anyone has ever seen is just ruses and backstabs. As such, though, Spencer's new mindset is likely something that will be discussed time and again, as it's one of the biggest retcons in the series. Now, retcon is used in a negative context quite frequently. It's almost like a dirty word that you don't want your story to be associated with. But that isn't really true. By definition, it's just when a story reveals a different interpretation of a plot. Good retcons exist in many games, even Resident Evil. The addition of the Trevor family and Lisa in Resident Evil 1 Remake were great changes across the board. It added more story to a game that historically had very little, and expanded upon the few bits of lore that did exist. It's why it's one of my favorite games in this franchise. This one with Spencer, that depends. It depends on how Capcom writes this going forward. I assume DLC for Resident Evil 9 or maybe a remake of Resident Evil 5 will clarify things and give us a better understanding as to how to move forward with this. Because right now it's a bit hard to tell. We don't know what Spencer wanted to do with Elpis, and while Elpis is described as his atonement, how much of that is purposeful or just coincidence. Overall, I think it's an excellent story beat, but one that I don't think I could give my full thoughts on until we see what the future holds. Elpis rewriting viruses would probably be the only way he could atone for his crimes, by destroying the things he helped create. But that also depends on if Capcom brings this up again, or if it will remain a relic of the past. All of this circles back to our discussion regarding Xeno and Gideon, as they believe that Elpis is a bioweapon made to control minds. At this point in the story, Leon is slowly dying to RC syndrome, and Grace now knows the truth of her birth. It's on her to decide what to do now. Xeno expects Grace to type in the password so that she can unlock Elpis, but you don't have to. If you choose to destroy Elpis, you chose wrong. Destroying Elpis means that Xeno never gets his virus. He still believes that it's a mind control virus, so he's pissed. In his confusion, Leon takes Grace out of there and saves her. He buys her just enough time to escape while he fights Xeno. Chris was at his peak with muscles the size of his head, and he still struggled to kill Wesker. Leon is already on death's door, so it's no wonder that he loses. As Grace watches on, she pleads for Leon to get up. Knowing what's next, he sits down and says that while he couldn't save anyone back in Raccoon City, he's glad that he could at least die knowing that he saved her. Man, that's brutal. It's not canon, obviously, but wow. Firstly, I'd like to commend Capcom for even killing Leon at all. It's just a stark contrast compared to the previous eras where it all felt like they were indestructible. Strangely, I even find this to be a rather fitting ending regarding where the story is going now. If Capcom was to make the connections come off as stronger, better, and more intelligent than Umbrella, it makes sense that they display that strength by killing a series staple. Our heroes were strong enough to defeat Umbrella, but could they truly beat the connections? They're getting stronger, while our heroes are getting older. New threats require newer talent, people like Grace and Ethan, new heroes to replace the old. So while I definitely don't think this is canon, it's at least an interesting way to end things. It also shows that Capcom is willing to kill off any character they want. I won't be totally convinced until one of them dies for real, but just in this era we've seen Ethan, Alyssa, and now Leon killed at some point in the story. It's a very different era this time around, one where the plot armor has eroded, leaving us to wonder how the rest will fare in future conflicts. As for Leon, it's not only a brutal way to die, but it's also a really depressing end to his arc. Raccoon City may be 28 years late, but it always collects its debts. Leon's life changed back in Raccoon City, and now he'll die there, having never escaped its city limits, both in death and in life. That's brutal. He's also passed his grief on to Grace, as now she carries a similar guilt. A guilt that comes from not being able to save Alyssa, Emily, and now Leon. The same guilt that Leon had back in Raccoon City, a perpetual cycle of grief and torment that, given time, could end the very same way for Grace as it did for Leon. If you instead release Elpis, Grace tricks Xeno into taking the virus as it saps away his powers. She also uses it on Leon, who is now cured of his RC syndrome and back to full strength. Gideon also comes to witness the unleashing of the virus. He sees it the way most people would see it, that Elpis is not an atonement, but anarchy. A tool that would destroy BOWs and the companies that create them. A big screw you from Spencer to every company and person that tried to wrong him. As this happens, Gideon kills Zeno and then mutates thanks to his nemesis Parasite. Leon had tried to kill him earlier in a motorcycle chase, which is about as wild as it sounds, but it's the nemesis Parasite, so he's definitely not going to go down easy. This, I guess, then segues into a discussion about Zeno and Gideon. Frankly, I'm not really sure how to feel about them. Zeno feels completely underutilized, a villain trying to play the role of Wesker, but one who's not as cool as him and also has a little backstory. Like the stuff we learned about the connections though, I think it could be something that will be expanded upon in the future. And besides, if he really is anything like Wesker, he'll survive that wound. Gideon similarly gives me mixed opinions. I didn't care for him that much as I think the game wanted me to. Gideon is ex-Umbrella, but only really does what most villains do, and that's just experiment and run tests on people. The Care Center is a cool location, and its history is fairly rich in detail, but it doesn't make me appreciate Gideon more. And Zeno was only interesting because he reminded everyone of an older villain from years past. Other than that, he's irrelevant. And, look, I'm sorry I have to bring this up again, but we're doing the money and power thing again. I expect this to be retconned in the future, but previous Resident Evil games established that the connections are people who are only in it for the money. So what else are we to expect? Another generation's worth of Resident Evil games where the connections continually make new weapons because they're obsessed with money? That was played out decades ago, and I would appreciate not seeing a repeat of that again. But the game then ends with Leon defeating Gideon as he and Grace realize there is no way out. So both of them accept their death and wait for the Ark to collapse on them, before the Hound Wolf Squad comes by to pick them up. Chris is not here, but he does have a message for Leon. Are we to see a future where Chris and Leon finally team up? That would be rather interesting. As the two get patched up, Leon reveals that he didn't shoot Emily in any vital areas, so she's still alive. Sherry would also be later cured of her RC syndrome, with Emily having regained her sight as well. It definitely gives off a very cliche ending, where the good guys always win and the bad guys all lose, but that's just Resident Evil to a T. But naturally, the games leave the story of Resident Evil wide open for the next piece of content to run with. It suggests that the FBI is not only looking into the US government's involvement in Raccoon City, both during and after the outbreak, but that the connections seem to have killed some BSAA who were likely guarding the Ark after the game's events. They are here for something and they're going to grab it before the wolves arrive, implying that we may see Chris very soon. But as it's only been a week or so since the game's release, news about a DLC is non-existent. All in all though, Resident Evil 9 is a very fun game. I really like Leon's new characterization and Grace's debut. I'm also eager to see how this story develops in the future. I do admit that I find it a bit hard to evaluate a game like this because it's so new. We can still judge the game on its merits, but a lot of the story beats seem to have been explicitly made to tease a conflict, not start one. I imagine that in a few years' time we'll see the fruits of its labor and get a few more answers. But it's honestly hard to know with it being so early. Regardless, I do think Resident Evil 9 is another excellent entry in the series, and thus continues to make this era one of the most beloved and successful eras in the franchise. Arguably the worst game, judging by the general community, is Resident Evil 3 Remake. Even then, 3 Remake is still a decent game in its own right, and compared to the previous eras, a single controversial title after being 6 games deep is something to celebrate. Resident Evil in the modern day, in the year 2026, is bigger and more popular than it's ever been. Resident Evil has gone through so many changes in the past 30 years, and we've broken all that down in just about 9 hours if my math is right. In these 30 years, we've seen Resident Evil stagnate, revive itself by reinventing its formula, fall to greed, only to rise from the ashes and come back better and stronger than ever before. It's one of the most complex games I've ever covered, both in terms of lore, analysis, and just overall history. But it's also one of the most glorious rides I've ever taken. I love a lot of these games, and Resident Evil is a franchise I always look forward to playing. Ever since I was a kid, I knew Resident Evil was special. RE5 may have terrified me enough to quit playing it, but never enough to stop entirely. Because of that, I managed to make my way through these games and have finally finished playing all of them for this video. And having played so many of these games though, the only thing I can truly say is that Resident Evil rightfully deserves to be considered one of the best survival horror games in the industry. And more importantly, the game's title never lied. The residents really were evil. Thanks for watching. Thank you all for watching today, and I hope you enjoyed. If you haven't watched parts 1 and 2, then definitely be sure to give those a watch. But now we can finally move on to something else. I haven't quite figured out what to do yet. I'll likely make a community post about it, so feel free to pop by and give me an answer. I hope you all enjoyed these 3 parts though, hopefully as much as I've enjoyed making them. Like the video if you enjoy and subscribe if you're new. Thank you to my returning viewers for coming back to another video, and for the patrons who continue to support the work I do here. Take care everyone. Goodbye.